Hello everyone, my name is That Catholic Guy, and welcome to the ultimate supercut Catholic Saints Iceberg Explained. In this video, we are going to dive deep into the Catholic Saints Iceberg, uncovering the lives of the saints, the mysteries, the miracles, and the obscurities that they hold. This is a supercut edition of all of the parts that I've made in my series. If you would like to watch the parts individually, you can do so. However, this one will be a much more fully realized version, and this is really what I've been building up to for all of these months filming these videos. This video will cover the entire Saints Iceberg, from layer 1 all the way down to layer 15. With over 150 saints on this list, we will get a very good understanding of these people's lives, the ways that they live for God, and some of the crazy mysteries and obscurities that not that many people know about. If you are somehow unfamiliar with what an iceberg chart is, it is basically a chart that organizes all the information about a given topic from the most well-known at the top to the most obscure at the bottom. The most well-known saints that you've probably heard about are at the top, and of course, the most obscure are at the bottom. Now, I guarantee you that there are some you have not heard about on here, so stay tuned to the end as we uncover how deep the iceberg truly goes. I do want to clarify, these are all saints who have been canonized by the Catholic Church themselves. So while other traditions may have saints, those will not be included on this iceberg. Additionally, this is not all of the Catholic saints in existence. There are thousands of canonized saints in Catholicism. However, these are some of the most popular, and I feel like this is a good general baseline for how we can understand the lives of the Catholic saints by understanding some of the most popular. Now, if you're wondering what a Catholic saint is basically someone who is in heaven. According to the Catechism, the Church recognizes the power of the Spirit of holiness within her and sustains the hope of believers by promising the saints to them as models and intercessors. The saints are role models that we can use to grow closer to Christ. As Catholics, we believe that they are in heaven right now and they can pray for us, guiding us closer to the person of Jesus Christ. However, even if you're not Catholic, these are still incredible examples of people who live for Christ in the Bible, throughout history, and even in modern times. And I think, if anything, it just shows the witness that a lot of people have had to the faith throughout history, and I hope you enjoy this deep dive into it. But if you've watched the previous parts of this iceberg up to this point, I also want to make it worth your time, so I'm going to throw in some bonus entries on there. Obviously, I don't want to keep you waiting any further, so please put this video on in the background while you work, game, go to sleep, whatever. I know I like to listen to these things while I go to sleep. Maybe I'm a little weird like that. Real quick, please like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. If this is your first time here, welcome. If not, welcome back. If you would like to support me financially, please check out my Patreon, where for only $2 a month, you can get early access to all of my videos. You can get your name listed in the credits, you can get merch drops, and you can even request your own video ideas that you would like me to make. Check out my merch, link will be in the description down below. And without further ado, let's jump right into layer 1. Alright, to start off this iceberg at layer 1, we have both the most popular and the most powerful saint in all of Catholicism, who is of course the Virgin Mary. Born in Nazareth to her parents Saint Anne and Saint Joachim, she was chosen by God at the age of 15 to be the mother of Jesus, through the power of the Holy Spirit. We celebrate this moment as the Annunciation, and it is one of the most important moments in the entire Bible. As Catholics, we believe that Mary remained sinless and a virgin throughout her entire life. Through the grace of God, she was conceived without sin in a moment called the Immaculate Conception. Because of this, we view her as the highest of all the saints in heaven, given the special rule of the Queen of Heaven, as described in Revelation. While there's a major difference between the veneration that's given to saints and the worship that's given to God, known as latria for God and dulia for saints, the veneration we give to Mary is called hyperdulia, as it is the highest form of reverence you can give to a created being. Jesus is not a created being. Jesus is eternal. Fun fact, that's actually called Arianism, if you believe that. This is not worship, of course. Latria is reserved only for God. But in John 19:27, when Jesus gives his mother to John, he is entrusting all of us to her protection. Sacred tradition teaches that she was raised body and soul into heaven in an event called the Assumption. And the evidence for this is, while we have relics of all the other saints, the body of Mary has never been found. This ancient belief is supported by saints such as Gregory the Great and Saint John of Damascus, and was later established as infallible doctrine by Venerable Pope Pius XII in 1950. Numerous prayers and devotions to Mary exist to ask the intercession of Mary, including the Hail Mary, the Rosary, the Memorare, and the Angelus. Many miracles and apparitions have also been attributed to Mary, and many of these miracles are scientifically proven, showing the immense power that the Virgin Mary has when we entrust ourselves to her. Saint Joseph was the foster father of Jesus and one of the most important saints in the entire Bible. He is viewed as the patron saint of fathers, workers, and families, as well as a protector of the entire church. Compared to the other saints in the Gospels, not much is mentioned about about him. Not much is known about his early life, but we know that he was born in Bethlehem to his father Jacob according to Matthew 1:16, then moved to Nazareth later in his life to work as a carpenter. He became betrothed to Mary shortly after the Annunciation, and even though Mary could have been stoned to death for infidelity, he remained with her, journeying with her to Bethlehem and then Egypt, respecting her vows of chastity and raising Jesus as his own son. Sometime before the beginning of Jesus' ministry, Joseph died, leaving Jesus to continue his trade as a carpenter. Joseph is given many titles in Catholicism, including the foster father of Jesus and Saint Joseph, terror of demons, which is, pretty badass. Many saints have also been extremely devoted to him. Father Don Calloway's consecration to Saint Joseph is an extremely powerful and popular modern devotion. I've done it myself and I'd highly recommend it. Saint Joseph's masculinity serves as a role model for all men and women across the world, making him one of the most important saints to devote yourself to. Saint Peter the Apostle is one of the most important historical figures mentioned in the Gospels. Originally born with the name Simon in the town of Bethsaida, Galilee, to his father John, he and his brother Andrew were trained as fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, where they worked for the majority of their lives. In Matthew 4:19, Jesus gets into a boat with Simon and tells him to put down his nets. The nets become full of fish, and Jesus says to him, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." From this moment onward, Simon began following Jesus as a disciple. Known for his choleric personality and strong sense of justice, Peter often quarreled with the other apostles. Despite this, however, Christ saw him as a leader of his people, renaming him Cephas, or Peter, saying, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," in Matthew 16:18. After the death of Jesus, Peter became an important leader and the first bishop of Rome, who presided over the Council of Jerusalem. He also wrote 2 epistles, 1st and 2nd Peter, in the New Testament. His position as Bishop of Rome would later become the Pope after his death. And as Catholics, we believe that this lineage has continued all the way from Peter to Pope Leo XIV. In around 64 AD, Peter was arrested by Emperor Nero's forces and crucified. According to early church writings, rather than be crucified in the same way as Jesus was, Peter believed he was unworthy and asked to be crucified upside down instead. His body was then buried in the spot that would later become St. Peter's Basilica, a poetic symbol of the papacy and the power that Christ had given him. St. Peter is the patron saint of the papacy, those who struggle with faith and forgiveness, and all fishermen. St. Paul is a fundamental saint whose writings and epistles helped convert the entire world to Christianity. He was born as Saul of Tarsus and was trained as a Pharisee in Mosaic law and Jewish tradition by Rabbi Gamaliel, a leading member of the Sanhedrin. Originally, Saul persecuted early church Christians, viewing them as a threat to the Jewish covenant. He was actually on his way to Damascus when he encountered the risen Lord and became a Christian in Acts chapter 9, 1-5. The Lord blinded him for 3 days, and when he regained his sight, he pledged to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. Paul spent the remainder of his life preaching around the world, writing 13 epistles and becoming the most prolific writer of the early church. Because of this, St. Paul was beheaded due to his faith in about 67 AD in Rome under Emperor Nero, sealing his witness with his blood. His life and writings serve as a testament to the depth of divine mercy and the strength of grace, not only to forgive, but also to elevate and transform, drawing the soul into communion with God himself. St. John the Evangelist was one of the first 12 apostles and the author of the book of John. While the other gospels are believed to be based on multiple testimonies throughout the years after the life of Christ, John's gospel is written based on his own testimonies and experiences of Jesus. St. John was born at Bethsaida to his father Zebedee and his mother Salome. He and his older brother James worked for his father as fishermen. They eventually became close friends with Simon and Andrew. For a time, John became a disciple of John the Baptist, and after witnessing the baptism of Jesus, decided to follow him, eventually convincing James, Peter, and Andrew to do so as well. John served as one of the most important apostles in the Gospels, even being described in the book of John as the disciple whom Jesus loved, which, is kind of funny considering that he wrote it. He had an incredibly close relationship to Christ as well, and was the only apostle who was present at the crucifixion of Christ. He and Peter were the ones who discovered Jesus' empty tomb on Easter Sunday. It's very important to mention that John ran faster than Peter. After the death of Jesus, Mary was entrusted into the care of John, and he took care of her until her ascension into heaven. Towards the end of his life, John moved to Asia Minor and began writing his gospel. John also wrote 3 epistles and in 95 AD received special visions from God, which he compiled into the book of Revelation. Shortly after this, he passed away from natural causes, making him likely the only apostle who was not martyred for his faith. St. John is the patron saint of love, friendship, and writers, and is one of the most important saints of the New Testament. St. James the Greater, also known as James, son of Zebedee, was the older brother of St. John and one of the first apostles of Christ. Just like his brother John, he was a fisherman by trade, and he eventually became a disciple of John the Baptist. He likely likely encountered Jesus for the first time along with Peter fishing in the Sea of Galilee. Following this, he decided to become a disciple of Christ, being present in key moments such as the Transfiguration and the agony of the garden. He is called James the Greater in the Bible, not because he was somehow spiritually better than the other James, although that would be really funny, but rather just because he was taller and greater of stature. Saint James was killed about 14 years after the death of Jesus in 44 AD by King Herod, who was a descendant of the other King Herod who is in the Bible. It's a little bit confusing, I get it, and was beheaded in Jerusalem, making him the first apostle to be martyred. After this, his body was likely buried in Spain, leading to many legends of how Saint James defended the Spanish against Muslim invaders, with the title of Saint James the Moor Slayer. Saint James is the patron saint of Spain, pilgrims, equestrian, veterinarians, and pharmacists for some reason. He's also one of the most important apostles in the entire Bible. St. Andrew is one of the most underrated apostles and arguably the church's first recruiter. Born in Bethsaida, he was the brother of St. Peter and worked as a fisherman before following Christ. St. Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist, already searching for the Messiah. According to the Gospel of John, Andrew was among the first to follow Jesus Christ and introduced Jesus to his brother Simon, telling him, "We have found the Messiah." So in a very real way, Andrew is the reason that Peter even enters into the story, quietly setting up one of the most important figures in all of Christianity. Andrew consistently brings people to Christ, like the boy with the loaves and the fishes before the feeding of the 5,000. While others doubted, Andrew was always one who trusted the Lord. After Pentecost, he preached across Greece and Asia Minor, and he was eventually martyred on an X-shaped cross, now called the St. Andrew's Cross, reportedly preaching even as he was crucified, which is insane. St. Andrew is the patron saint of missionaries and evangelists, and the guy who changes everything without needing the spotlight. In some sense, St. Matthew was the original finance bro who converted to Christianity. Born to his father Alphaeus in Galilee, his skill in numbers and intelligence allowed him to work as a tax collector for the Romans in Capernaum, which was an extremely hated profession by the local Jews at the time. Many of Christ's followers, including St. Peter, viewed him as a traitor to the Jewish faith. However, despite this, Christ called him to be an apostle. In Matthew 9:9, Jesus walked up to his collection booth and simply says, "Follow me." Matthew got up and invited Christ into his own home, which shocked the other disciples. From then on, Matthew became one of the most important of the 12 apostles, and it is generally believed that Matthew the apostle is the same author who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, based on his own personal accounts traveling with Christ, writing it shortly after Jesus' death in 45 AD. He then fled to Persia and Ethiopia to avoid persecution from the Romans. While the exact details of Matthew's death are unknown, it is traditionally believed that Matthew was martyred in Ethiopia circa 70 AD, being stabbed by the local king's forces while preaching, after refusing to marry the daughter of the king. However, this is not written in scripture, so it's possible that this story is a legend, but it's still pretty cool to think about. St. Matthew is also the patron saint of tax collectors, finance, and bankers, and serves as a very powerful example of how Jesus can transform our lives if we choose to follow him. St. Michael the Archangel is one of only 3 archangels who are considered saints, and probably one of the most important figures in all of the Bible. A warrior angel who is known as the Prince of the Heavenly Hosts, in Revelation 12, Michael leads the angelic army against Satan, defeating him and casting him down into hell with the rest of the demons. He serves as a spiritual protector of the entire world, appearing multiple times in the scripture, including Daniel, Jude, and Revelation. His name literally means "who is like God," a question to Satan that stands in direct opposition to his arrogance. His role as commander of the heavenly army makes him an extremely powerful force, so powerful that Pope Leo XIII wrote the St. Michael prayer as a response to a vision he received in 1884 to protect the entire church during the 20th century going forward. In many churches throughout the world, the St. Michael prayer is said following every mass to invoke his protection against evil. St. Michael is the patron saint of basically everyone who deals with danger, including soldiers, police officers, paramedics, and even grocers, because yes, apparently dealing with customers is spiritual warfare. Basically, if spiritual life had an "I've fallen and I can't get up" button, St. Michael is the one that you need to call on. St. Michael is an incredibly powerful ally in our spiritual battle, and we should call upon his name every time we need him, because he defeated Satan one time and he can defeat him again just like that. Alright, starting off tier 2, we have St. John the Baptist. St. John the Baptist was the last prophet to clear the way for Jesus, and one of, if not the holiest man ever according to the Bible, other than Jesus, of course. The first cousin of Jesus, John was miraculously conceived to his mother Elizabeth in her old age. This message was given to Mary at the Annunciation by the angel Gabriel, and when Mary came to visit her in Luke chapter 1, he leapt for joy within his mother's womb. As an adult before Jesus even began his ministry, St. John the Baptist was in the wild, eating bugs, drugs and yelling at people to repent. Probably John's biggest moment in the Bible was baptizing Jesus in the Jordan, purifying the waters of the entire world and beginning Jesus' public ministry. Shortly afterwards, John was captured by Herod, whom he had spoken out against publicly due to his marriage to Herodias, Herod's sister-in-law, which violated Jewish laws. During a party, Herodias' daughter, Salome, danced for Herod. Herod enjoyed the dance so much that he told her that she could have anything that she wanted. She pleaded for Herod to give her St. John the Baptist's head on a silver platter, and so Herod gave it to her. And this is actually where the phrase head on a silver plate comes from. In the early church, he was actually given instant sainthood because God literally called him to prepare the way for our Lord. He was the last prophet before Christ. St. John the Baptist is the patron saint of baptisms, converts, preachers, and everyone who's trying to figure their stuff out. He is also the patron saint for prisoners and prophets because, you know, speaking the truth can get you in trouble sometimes. In short, St. John the Baptist was kind of Jesus's wild cousin who told you the truth, pointed to Christ, and then died courageously for his beliefs. St. Philip is one of those apostles who reminds us that we don't need to have a perfect understanding of God's plan to follow him. When Jesus called Philip to follow him, Philip didn't overthink it. He immediately followed and then went straight to his best friend Nathaniel and said, "We found the Messiah. Trust me on this one." Literally the first trust me bro of the Bible, which must have made for a very interesting conversation. Like the other apostles, Philip was honored as a saint due to his witness of the faith and his martyrdom. Church tradition says that St. Philip the Apostle died in Hierapolis, Phrygia, which is now known as modern-day Turkey, in about 80 AD. Try saying that 10 times fast. Tradition holds that St. Philip was crucified upside down and was stoned as well while on the cross, which is insane, and his tomb can actually be viewed to this day in Turkey. St. Philip is the patron saint of hat makers, pastry chefs for some reason, and fishermen. St. Nathaniel, known as Bartholomew, is the definition of first impressions not determining holiness. While the details of Nathaniel's early life are largely unknown, he's believed to have been a skilled craftsman with very extensive knowledge of the Torah. When he first hears about Jesus, he says to himself, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" But he still chose to go see for himself. And in that moment, everything changed. Jesus greeted him, calling him a man without deceit, which was a compliment, but also a subtle way of saying, "I heard what you said." It was at that moment that Nathaniel became a believer. Sacred tradition holds that Nathaniel was sent to preach the gospel as far as Armenia or India, and it was on this missionary trip to India that St. Nathaniel left behind a copy of the Gospel of Matthew. It is believed that St. Nathaniel was martyred in Albanopolis, Armenia, circa 69 AD. He was flayed alive and then ultimately beheaded, marking the end of his ministry. Nathaniel is the patron saint of tanners, leather workers, and bookbinders, making him one of the most important of the 12 apostles. St. Mary Magdalene is one of the greatest examples of how an encounter with Christ can change the trajectory of your life. In the Gospels, she first appears to us as a woman who is possessed by 7 demons, whom Jesus frees. From that moment on, she becomes a devout follower, but she doesn't always watch from a distance either. While she is not listed as one of the 12 apostles, she often traveled with Jesus, witnessing his ministry and preaching the gospel. At the end of Jesus' life, she was one of the few disciples at the foot of the cross, when all of the other disciples had fled. She was also the first person to bear witness to the resurrection, and announced it to the others. And because of this, she is the patron saint of all converts. And by God's grace, Mary Magdalene did not die a martyr's death. She traveled to France, where she spent her final years preaching the gospel. And you can actually see her skull to this day at Basilique Sainte Marie Madeleine, probably butchered that pronunciation, in southern France. St. Mark, the first church documentarian and the author of the Gospel of Mark, he didn't walk around in the spotlight. What he did give to the world was monumental. The Gospel according to Mark is one of the earliest and most direct accounts of the life of Jesus. Tradition holds that Mark was closely connected to Peter, serving as his translator and scribe while Peter preached in Rome. Within the Gospel itself, in Mark 14:51-52, the man in the linen cloth is traditionally believed to be St. Mark. St. Mark also shows up briefly in Acts, where he travels with St. Paul and Barnabas on missionary journeys. St. Mark traveled to Alexandria, where he established the church in Egypt, and it was there that he would be martyred in 68 AD. St. Mark is the patron saint of writers, scribes, and notaries. Mark's gospel also served as the foundation for the other gospel writers, making him one of the most important saints in the history of the church. If I asked you who you think that the most well-known saint in the world is, who would you guess? Probably Mary, Joseph, Peter, Paul, or one of the other apostles. But believe it or not, there's one saint who appears more frequently in contemporary movies, music, art, and popular culture than all of the other saints put together. And in fact, many non-Catholics and non-Christians claim to believe in him. Still stumped? It's St. Nicholas. First of all, he obviously never lived in the North Pole. He was the bishop of Myra in modern-day Turkey in the 4th century. He also never traveled the world with flying reindeer, although a wooden carving of him did sail halfway around the world as the figurehead of the first ship to land in what is now New York City, which is pretty cool. And then they used the wood from that boat to build a church in New York, which was, then torn down in 1947 and replaced with a corporate skyscraper. forever, which is pretty similar to what has happened with St. Nicholas being replaced by Santa Claus, but I digress. The real St. Nicholas, though, is remembered for his generosity to the poor, his courage during the Roman persecution, and for punching out a heretic at the Council of Nicaea. Yeah, you really don't want to end up on his naughty list. Either way, though, St. Nicholas is a really powerful saint who is very influential to the early church and continues to inspire millions of people to this day. St. James the Lesser, not to be confused with St. James the Greater, was part of the original 12 apostles called by Jesus in his earthly ministry and the first bishop of the church in Jerusalem. Holy Scripture does not give that many accounts of him, but his silence speaks for itself. His epistle in the New Testament highlights that works are required along with faith. Tradition also holds that St. James the Lesser was martyred in 62 AD in Jerusalem, then stoned and beaten with a club for refusing to denounce Christ. He became the patron saint of pharmacists and hat makers, which is pretty cool. St. Gabriel the Archangel is basically heaven's top messenger. When God has something big to say, he asks St. Gabriel to deliver it, no matter how unexpected or life-changing that message is. Most famously, Scripture tells us that St. Gabriel is the one to deliver the news of Christ's birth to the Blessed Mother in the Annunciation. He doesn't show up casually either. He arrives with the message that will change history forever. Gabriel also shows up in the Old Testament, interpreting visions for the prophet Daniel. Because of this, he is the patron saint of messengers, communication workers, broadcasters, and diplomats. St. Luke is best known for writing both the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. Luke's Gospel gives us one of the most detailed accounts of Jesus' life, and the Book of Acts gives us a clear, concise beginning to the early church. St. Luke was thought to be a physician in Antioch, converted by St. Paul on one of his many missionary trips. Luke often accompanied Paul on his trips, which are described in the Book of Acts. Because of this, the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts are seen by secular historians as an accurate retelling of the life of Jesus and the early church. There are conflicting traditions as to how St. Luke died. In Eastern traditions, it's traditionally believed that St. Luke was hanged from an olive tree in 68 AD. The Coptic tradition has St. Luke being beheaded by Emperor Nero. St. Luke is also attributed with beginning the art of Christian iconography, and for this reason, he is the patron saint of artists, students, writers, and doctors. St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis is an extremely influential saint whose life inspired entire religious orders and thousands of other saints. St. Francis is basically the saint who looked at a life of wealth and comfort and said, double it and give it to the next person. St. Francis was born as Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone in 1183 to a wealthy Italian family. Francis originally lived a life of luxury, spending money lavishly, going to parties, and becoming a wealthy textile merchant. One day, however, when he was selling clothes in the market, a beggar approached him and asked him for money. He said no, but in a sudden conversion, he decided to follow the beggar and give him all of the money that was in his wallet. This began a journey in his life, in which he would give away all his wealth so that he could follow Christ as simply and as literally as possible. He is famous for preaching to animals, and tradition says that they actually listened, especially birds, who apparently got a full sermon on gratitude. He also shared the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, which is one of the most profound experiences in Christianity. St. Francis founded the Franciscan order of monks that focuses on poverty, humility, and service to the poor. Unfortunately, though, St. Francis died on October 3rd, 1226. He was canonized on July 16th, 1228, only 2 years after his death, by Pope Gregory IX. And to this day, St. Francis is the patron saint of animals, the environment, and the entire country of Italy. St. Jude was one of the original disciples called by Christ. St. Judas Thaddeus, also known as Thaddeus, was a problem for early translators of the New Testament because they wanted to differentiate him from Judas Iscariot, which is probably why St. Jude became the patron saint of lost causes. After Pentecost, tradition holds that he traveled widely preaching the gospel, often with St. Simon. It is then believed that St. Jude was martyred for his faith in Beirut in 65 AD. His fate is commonly associated with that of St. Simon. St. Jude was beheaded, and his remains are housed at the Vatican underneath St. Joseph's altar. Next up, we have every autistic person's favorite saint, Thomas Aquinas, best known for his seminal, unfinished masterpiece of straw, the Summa Theologica, and being best friends with the patron saint of bowel movements, which is pretty funny. St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the greatest minds that God ever fashioned. He was born in Aquino, Italy, and was the youngest of 4 boys. His older brothers were soldiers, but he was destined for the Dominican order. His family of nobles, wanting him to be an abbot, locked him in their castle and tried tempting Thomas with women and power, but Thomas was super chaste and super humble, and eventually, like always, the Lord got in his way, and Thomas became a Dominican, where he would celebrate multiple masses a day and write with utmost devotion. He mainly took inspiration from both Augustine but also Aristotle, applying logic and reasoning to theological writing in a way that was never seen before. In his lifetime, Thomas wrote over 8 million words and over 60 books, including several commentaries, such as his commentary on the Our Father, the Hail Mary, and the Nicene Creed. After Aquinas had a mystic encounter with Jesus at the foot of the cross, he proclaimed that his work was nothing but straw. While he was with Jesus, he was asked what he wanted among all his desires, and St. Thomas said, "Nothing but you, Lord." Thomas Aquinas died shortly before he could serve at the Second Council of Lyon, where he no doubt would have solved the Great Schism. His legacy is the patron saint of teachers, philosophers, and theologians, as well as his title of Angelic Doctor of the Church, makes him one of the most important saints of Catholicism and also one of my personal favorites. favorites. St. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland who demonstrates one of history's greatest before and after stories into a life of faith, resilience, and of course, aura farming. St. Patrick was born in Roman-occupied Britain in the 4th century. As a teenager, he was enslaved by Irish raiders and then taken to Ireland as a slave. Those years transformed him and would deepen his faith in Jesus Christ through deep prayer and contemplation. After St. Patrick escaped from Ireland and returned to Britain, he had a vision. The same land that had enslaved him was now calling him back, this time with the wisdom of a missionary bishop. He spent his time preaching in Ireland, using simple metaphors and engaging sermons to convert the pagan population to Christianity. St. Patrick was such a force to be reckoned with. The tradition holds he had a duel with a pagan druid and won, which is pretty awesome. He also allegedly chased all the snakes out of Ireland, although this is probably fictional, but it's still really cool. For this reason, today he is the patron saint of missionaries, engineers, and all of Ireland. And to this day, his feast day is celebrated by millions on March 17th, celebrating his life and the heritage of Irish Catholicism. Okay guys, starting off layer 3, we have Saint Therese of Lisieux. Saint Therese of Lisieux is a powerful saint who proves that you don't have to do big dramatic things to become holy. You just have to do small things with extraordinary love. Known as the Little Flower, she followed Jesus Christ through what she called her little way, a path of humility, trust, and finding God in everyday moments. Saint Therese of Lisieux was raised devoutly Catholic by her parents, who were actually saints too, funnily enough, but when she was 4 years old, her mother died, and Therese became ill shortly afterwards. Her friends and family believed that she was going to die, but one day, as she began to pray to the Blessed Mother, a statue of Mary in the room turned to look at her, and she was miraculously healed. 10 years later, at the age of 14, she experienced a major conversion after coming home from Christmas Eve Mass, feeling Jesus calling her into the religious life. Since she was so young, she was not allowed by her priest or her bishop, so she went to ask the Pope directly and had to be dragged out by Vatican guards, which is pretty funny. However, the Vatican was impressed by her courage and granted her request to become a religious sister. Therese then entered the Carmelite Covenant at the age of just 15, not to escape the world, but to love God more deeply within it. Through quiet prayer, hidden sacrifice, and intense devotion, she lived a life that was pleasing to God. Therese suffered greatly from spiritual dryness and scrupulosity throughout her time as a religious sister, but documented her struggles through writings and letters, which would eventually make up her autobiography, Story of a Soul. One day in 1896, she began to cough up blood, but continued to work and didn't tell any of the other sisters. She began to feel depressed and wished for her time to come, but on September 30th, 1897, she died at 24 years old. Her life was extremely short and extremely ordinary, but she was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1925, less than 28 years after her death. Despite never going on a mission trip, she is considered the patron saint of missions, due to her special devotion to God and her love for the missionary vocation. Saint Simon, who is not to be confused with Saint Peter, who is also called Simon, it's confusing, I get it, is one of the more obscure apostles of the 12. We know very little about him compared to the other apostles, but before joining Jesus as an apostle, he likely worked as a leather worker before becoming a member of the Zealots, a radical militant Jewish group that sought to overthrow the Roman government and establish God as the true ruler of Israel. After leaving his violent ways and following Jesus in Matthew 10:4, he served Christ as an apostle, preaching the gospel and performing miracles in his name. Later in his life, he traveled to Egypt, where he preached the gospel before journeying with St. Jude to Persia, where they were both martyred. He now serves as the patron saint of leatherworkers, woodworkers, and tanners. Saint Pope John Paul II was one of the most important saints in recent modern history. Born in Poland in 1920 as Karol Wojtyła, he witnessed the atrocities of World War II and the following Russian occupation of his home country. By his 21st birthday, he had lost his father, mother, and his oldest brother. Despite the Russian occupation of Poland at the time, Wojtyła enrolled in an underground seminary, becoming ordained in 1946. After a short time in Rome pursuing his doctorate, he went back to Poland and ministered to the people, and in 1958 was given approval by communist officials of Russia to become a bishop of Krakow, because he was supposedly intellectually harmless. As bishop, he contributed greatly to the Second Vatican Council and was appointed as Pope in 1978, as the first non-Italian Pope in over 455 years. As Pope, he focused on fostering peaceful dialogue between other faiths and religion, establishing diplomatic relationships between Islam and Judaism, and repairing centuries-old conflicts. In 1981, he experienced an assassination attempt from radical Medhet Ali Agha. He was shot twice and suffered severe blood loss, but he ended up surviving. Following the assassination attempt, Pope John Paul II forgave Agha in his prison cell. In 2002, 2005, after suffering years from Parkinson's disease, John Paul II passed away peacefully in his apartment. He was then canonized by Pope Francis in 2014, and to this day, he is the patron saint of World Youth Day, a major international event that he himself established. Saint Maximilian Kolbe. Saint Maximilian Kolbe is one of the most popular modern saints, and for a very good reason. He was born in 1894 in Poland under Russian rule. Early in his life, he developed a deep reverence for the Virgin Mary, receiving a vision when he was 12 years old, where Mary appeared to him holding two crowns, one in each hand. One of the crowns was white, representing purity, and the other was red, representing martyrdom. She asked Maximilian which one he wished to accept, and he said both, which, is literally the both is good meme. After receiving this vision, Maximilian created the Order of the Militia Immaculata, which aimed to convert all people through the intercession of Mary, specifically the Freemasons and the Jews. In 1918, he was ordained as a priest and began to publish his writings on social issues and politics, being criticized by many for his anti-Semitic rhetoric. Kolbe also founded monasteries in Poland and Japan, but after the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, he refused to sign papers to become a German citizen and hid over 2,000 Jewish people in his monastery. He then used his publishing press, which he specifically had permission from the Germans to use, to spread anti-Nazi propaganda, which led to his arrest by the Gestapo in 1941. Because of this, he was sent to Auschwitz concentration camp, where he was beaten severely and harassed for months. When a man was forced to starve to death by the Gestapo, Kolbe volunteered to take his place, as the man had a family. He was then sentenced to death, and Kolbe spent the last 2 weeks of his life in a prison cell with no food or water, leading his cellmates in prayer until one by one he was the only one left. When 2 Gestapo guards came into his cell, he raised his arm calmly and accepted the lethal injection. Kolbe was then canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1982, and he is the patron saint of drug addicts, prisoners, and the pro-life movement. Maximilian Kolbe was an absolutely incredible man who lived an incredible life, and he's one of my own personal favorite saints. Saint Joan of Arc. There's this cultural trend lately among Catholics to reclaim Catholic femininity as defined by motherhood, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with pursuing that if that's your vocation. But some women are called to be wives and mothers, some people are called to become religious sisters, and some women are called to lead a cavalry charge that turns the tide in a century-long war, striking down grown men with a sword and making veteran soldiers flee in terror from the wrath of God. Girl stuff. Since the 15th century, Joan of Arc's life and miracles have really become legendary, probably because she was such an unlikely hero, an illiterate 17-year-old peasant girl from the middle of nowhere in France who started hearing the voices of saints telling her to take up her sword and liberate her country from English occupation. After convincing her king to let her join the 100 Years' War, Joan managed to almost immediately break the siege of Orleans and put the French back on the offensive. Her comrades called her La Pucelle, the warrior maiden of Orleans, and the English thought that she was possessed by demons. Despite her lack of education or training, Joan showed incredible skill with lance fighting, horsemanship, and especially with artillery tactics. In fact, Joan's strategy deploying cannons revolutionized the use of artillery by inventing tactics like concentrated fire, anti-material attacks and fortifications, and preliminary barrages, concepts that were the gold standard until Napoleon came around and improved them. However, even after she was captured and put on trial by the English, Joan showed incredible courage and sagacity. Inquisitors tried to lure her into saying something heretical through torture and trickery, but this teenage girl, who couldn't even spell her own name, managed to outsmart priests and theologians and refused to be tricked into heresy. Eventually, they could only burn her on charges of cross-dressing, since, she had worn a man's armor into battle. However, despite getting on the church's bad side in England, Joan was canonized in 1920 by Benedict XV, proving that staying true to God sometimes leads to persecution, even if it leads to persecution from the church itself. Joan is the patron saint of France and an incredibly powerful role model for young women in this modern age, because, I'm not a girl, but I feel like all girls kind of have this desire to take down hundreds of men on a battlefield. I feel like that's a completely normal thing. Saint Teresa of Calcutta is an incredibly famous modern saint whose compassion touched thousands of people and led them closer to God. Born in Albania as Agnes Ganya Boyajibu, she moved to Ireland in 1928 to become a religious sister with the Loreto Institute. She then moved to Calcutta, India on a mission, where she ministered to the children as a teacher. When she made her vows, she took the name Teresa after Therese of Lisieux, before founding her own order, the Missionaries of Charity, in 1948. Throughout her time in India, she ministered to the poorest of the poor and even the untouchable members of the Hindu religion. She established hospitals, orphanages, and centers to treat people with blindness, disabilities, and even leprosy, just as Jesus did in the Gospels. She felt an extreme calling to service and fulfilled it every day with her life, even winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, which she promptly took and put in a shoebox which she stored under her bed. Towards the end of her life, she testified to the United Nations and in many countries around the world, speaking out against divorce, contraception, and abortion. This made her a pretty unpopular figure, with many groups casting shade on her and accusing her of mistreating the people in her institutions. But she continued to serve God in everything. Just like her namesake, Therese of Lisieux, she struggled with great spiritual darkness, writing her book The Dark Night of the Soul. But she continued to serve cheerfully cheerfully and diligently till the very end. In 1997, Mother Teresa died of a heart attack at the age of 87 and was canonized very shortly afterwards by Pope Francis in 2016. By the time of her death, the Missionaries of Charity had established hundreds of centers in 90 countries and included over 4,000 sisters. Her example of charity in the face of adversity is a beautiful example of how to live as a follower of Christ in the modern world. Saint Catherine of Siena. Saint Catherine was born in 1347 during the height of the Black Plague to very humble parents in Siena, Italy. After her sister's death, she was pressured to marry her sister's widower, but refused, even cutting her hair short to make herself appear ugly, which, you know, that's a pretty big girl boss move. Eventually, her family accepted her decision, and Catherine joined the Third Order of St. Dominic, which allowed her to stay at home with her family as a religious sister. By the time she was 21 years old, she experienced what she described as a mystical marriage to Christ, even receiving a ring from him spiritually, which only she could see. After this, she felt inspired to go out into the world in service of the Lord, which she did. Over the years, her influence shifted from the quiet of her own home to the world stage, as she began to speak about politics, world issues, and even had influence in the Vatican. She was actually instrumental in restoring the papacy to Rome from Avignon and establishing peace throughout the country of Italy. During this time, she also composed over 400 letters, eventually being named as a doctor of the church after her death in 1380. Her short life, when devoted to Christ, had immense influence on the world and the church, showing what is possible when you unite yourself to Christ. To this day, she is the patron saint against fires in the United States, people who struggle with sexual temptation, and nurses. Saint Anthony of Padua was born in Lisbon, Portugal in 1195 to a very wealthy family, but was raised as a very devout Catholic. He was ordained at a young age and joined the Franciscans in 1220, taking the name Anthony in honor of Saint Anthony of Egypt. He planned to travel back to Morocco to minister to the people and preach the gospel, but then he became seriously ill, and his ship back home was blown off course, leaving him in Sicily. He began to teach in Sicily and eventually made his way to Padua, where he founded a monastery. During this time, he lived a quiet life of scholarship, teaching the people of the monastery, but over time, his sermons began gaining more attention, even earning the attention of Saint Francis himself. His sermons were profound and educational, and he even preached to the Pope himself, being described by Vatican officials as a jewel case of the Bible. In 1231, Anthony developed ergotism and died on his way back to Padua at the young age of 35. When his body was exhumed after 30 years, his tongue was still intact while his body had turned to dust, emphasizing his holy gift of preaching. In 1946, he was declared a doctor of the church by Venerable Pope Pius XII, and he serves as the patron saint of lost things and people. Saint Teresa of Avila was born to a devout Spanish family in 1515. Teresa grew up with a strong desire to imitate the saints and follow Christ, and at the age of 7, she and her brother even ran away from home, wishing to become martyrs and to be killed for their faith. When Teresa was 14, however, her mother passed away, which led her to become even more devoted to the Blessed Mother. When she was 20, she entered the Carmelite Order of Avila, but still struggled to find balance between religious life and worldly pleasures. She described her heart as being divided between God and the world, but after being bedridden with a serious illness and reading many spiritual writings, she realized that suffering was the pathway to Jesus. After her recovery, she became extremely devoted to Christ, practicing mental prayer and being granted mystical experiences, even experiencing an angel piercing her heart with a spear of divine love. In 1562, she established the convent of St. Joseph in Avila in an effort to reform the Carmelite order back to its roots of poverty and silence. She spent the rest of her life traveling throughout Spain, establishing 17 monasteries and writing many spiritual works, earning her the title of Doctor of the Church in 1970. After years of physical weakness, she passed away in 1582, with her last words being, "My Lord, it is time to move on." Saint Teresa of Avila serves as the patron saint of people with headaches and Spanish writers, and she's just a really incredible example of how God can make a difference whenever you devote yourself to him. Saint Matthias was one of the 12 apostles, although he was not actually appointed until after Jesus' death. After the betrayal and the death of Judas, Matthias was selected to replace him as one of the 12 apostles in Acts 1:26, as he had been with them ever since the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. After this, he preached the gospel throughout Judea, before traveling to Ethiopia and Jerusalem, where his death is largely unknown. However, despite being an obscure apostle, he is still a very important biblical figure who helped spread the gospel in the early church. Saint Mary, Saint Martha, and Saint Lazarus were very important figures in the New Testament, serving as siblings, some of the closest friends to Jesus himself, as a powerful example of service, hospitality, and faith in Christ. Born sometime in the 1st century, likely in Bethany near Jerusalem, the exact details of their early lives are unknown, but scripture presents the family as devoutly Jewish, welcoming Christ into their home. Mary and Martha are often remembered in the gospel for the scene where Martha busily serves Jesus while her sister Mary listens at his feet, leading Jesus to gently remind her that Mary had chosen the better part, showing that being present with the people in your home is often the best form of hospitality. However, Mary and Martha's faith is shown most clearly after the death of their brother Lazarus, where Martha boldly professes that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, before Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Later tradition said that Mary and Martha helped to spread the gospel after Christ's resurrection, with some legends claiming that she traveled to northern France, where she defeated a dragon-like creature called the Tarasque, although this is largely fictional and probably didn't happen. Although the exact details of their deaths are unknown, Saint Martha served as a strong witness that active service and deep prayer both have a place in Christian life, and today Saint Martha serves as the patron saint of cooks, homemakers, and hospitality workers. Saint Mary serves as the patron saint of spiritual studies, and Saint Lazarus serves as the patron saint of leprosy and, very fittingly, grave diggers. Saint Dominic is a very important saint who looked at confusion, bad teaching, and spiritual chaos, and basically said, alright, somebody has to explain this properly. Founder of the Dominican order, which, you know, is based off of his name, Dominic, I'm sure you could guess that, he dedicated his life to preaching truth clearly, intelligently, and with deep compassion. Dominic lived during a time where heresies were spreading quickly, and instead of responding with anger or force, he fought error through preaching, education, debate, and personal holiness. He believed that you could win hearts through truth, with humility, and probably a lot of walking, because this man traveled constantly. He is also usually credited as the creator of the Rosary, as the Rosary is a devotion that is pretty much inherently connected to him. Tradition holds that the Virgin Mary actually appeared to Dominic and gave him the Rosary as a prayer, and considering the fact that the Rosary is probably the most popular devotion in Catholicism of all time, his legacy is extremely important. So St. Thomas the Apostle is the disciple who accidentally became history's patron saint of the source meme. Thomas, much like the other apostles, grew up in a very unassuming family where not much is known about his early life. However, in the Gospels, he became one of Christ's apostles, following him through his ministry. However, most famously, after the resurrection of Christ, Thomas refused to believe that the other apostles had seen him. Since he wasn't present at his first apparition, he questioned the apostles extensively and even asked to see the wounds of Christ because he was a skeptic. But honestly, in my opinion, that makes him pretty relatable. Because of this, he's often remembered as Doubting Thomas, but I feel like that nickname misses the bigger picture. Thomas wasn't rejecting faith, he was wrestling with it honestly. And when Jesus appeared to him and Thomas placed his hands into the wounds of Christ, as he had said, Thomas's doubt disappeared completely, and he said very simply, "My Lord and my God." After this encounter with Christ, tradition says that he traveled farther than almost any other apostle, preaching the gospel as far as India, where ancient Christian communities still trace their roots back to him. Much like the other 12 apostles, his faith ultimately led to martyrdom, and he was reportedly killed with spears for refusing to stop preaching Christ. To this day, he is the patron saint of architects, builders, and those struggling with doubt. In short, St. Thomas is proof that honest questions and wrestling with your faith do have a place in life, and in the right context, they can actually lead us closer to Christ. You know, I probably should have put this one into the first part of the iceberg, but to anyone who doubted that he would be on here, don't be like Thomas. Okay, moving on to St. Padre Pio. St. Padre Pio is the saint that makes you realize holiness can be both deeply compassionate and slightly intimidating at the same time. A Capuchin friar from Italy, he became known for his intense prayer, spiritual wisdom, and an almost supernatural ability to read souls. People would travel for hours just to go to confession with him, though many also feared it because Padre Pio had a reputation for calling people out when they weren't being honest, because he actually knew what sins people had committed through the grace of God somehow. He also famously received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, which he carried with him for decades. Reports of miracles, healing, and even biolocation surrounded him through his life, making him one of the most talked about modern saints in the church's history, due to his extreme supernatural powers and the insane number of miracles that he performed. Throughout his life, Padre Pio also wrestled physically with the devil, which is pretty insane. However, despite all of this attention, St. Padre Pio constantly emphasized humility, confession, and perseverance in suffering. He once said, "Pray, hope, and don't worry," which is easier to put on a coffee mug than to actually live out. In 2002, he was canonized by Pope John Paul II, and he serves as the patron saint of civil defense volunteers, adolescents, and stress relief. In short, St. Padre Pio is a reminder that the sainthood is not always softness, but it's radical love, radical honesty, and radical trust in God. St. Juan Diego is the humble farmer who woke up one day expecting it to be a normal day, but instead became one of the most important figures in the history of Catholicism and of Mexico. In 1531, while walking near Tepeyac Hill in Mexico, he encountered the Virgin Mary, who appeared to him as Our Lady of Guadalupe and asked that a church be built where she stood. At first, local bishops were understandably skeptical, so Juan Diego returned to Mary, who told him to gather roses in his tilma, completely out of season. So of course, he listened to her and he put all the flowers in his tilma and carried them back to the bishop. When he reached town, the roses fell out of his tilma, and a miraculous image of Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared on the fabric, changing history forever. What makes Juan Diego remarkable is that he wasn't a powerful leader or a famous theologian. He was just an ordinary man, and actually a convert to Christianity from paganism, who was chosen for an extraordinary mission, and through his simple obedience was responsible for the entire conversion of Mexico to Catholicism. In 2002, he was canonized by Pope John Paul II and serves as the patron saint of indigenous peoples and America. In short, Saint Juan Diego is proof that holiness doesn't require fame or influence. Sometimes it just requires a simple yes and following God even when something seems impossible. Saint Augustine of Hippo is a saint for everyone who ever said, "I'll get serious about God later, but right now I'm going to live it up in the moment." Before becoming one of Christianity's greatest theologians, Augustine spent years chasing success, pleasure, and intellectual pride, living a life that he later admitted left him restless and empty. His famous line, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you," basically summarizes his entire spiritual journey. What makes Augustine's story so powerful is that conversion didn't happen overnight. His mother, Saint Monica, prayed for him relentlessly for years, while he argued philosophy, avoided commitment, and searched everywhere for meaning besides God. Eventually, after hearing a child say, "Take this and read it," Augustine opened up scripture and experienced a profound conversion to Jesus Christ. He later became a bishop, a theologian, and one of the most influential thinkers in all of Christianity, writing classics such as the Confessions of St. Augustine and the City of God. His ideas shaped Western philosophy and Western Christianity, and later he was even declared one of the very first doctors of the church. Today, St. Augustine serves as the patron saint of theologians, printers, and those who are seeking conversion. In short, St. Augustine is proof that God can take a restless, stubborn heart and give it rest, turning it into something extraordinary. Saint Stephen is remembered as the first martyr in all of Christianity, who somehow managed to preach one of the boldest sermons in all of Scripture while literally being attacked. Chosen as one of the first deacons in the early church, Stephen was known for his wisdom, charity, and fearless preaching about Jesus Christ. The problem, however, was that not everyone appreciated being called out by him. After giving a powerful defense of the faith before many religious leaders, Stephen openly proclaimed that he saw heaven opened and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. The crowd responded to this in the worst way possible by dragging him outside the city and stoning him to death. Even while being murdered, Saint Stephen prayed for his persecutors, echoing Christ's own words of forgiveness. One of the witnesses to his martyrdom was actually Saul, who would later go on to become Saint Paul, of course, making Stephen's death part of a much larger story of conversion and grace. He wasn't formally canonized because he's mentioned in the New Testament, but the church honored him as a saint from the very beginning because of his witness and his powerful martyrdom. To this day, he serves as the patron saint of deacons, stonemasons, and those falsely accused. In short, Saint Stephen is a reminder that courage and faith sometimes comes at a cost, but that the truth, when spoken with love, can echo far beyond one's lifetime. Saint Ignatius of Loyola is best known for forming the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, along with Saint Francis Xavier and Peter Faber. Before giving his life to Christ, Ignatius was actually an officer in the Spanish army, and during the Battle of Pamplona, a cannonball struck his leg, rendering him bedridden for the preceding year. While he was in recovery inside of his ancestral home, the Castle of Loyola, he requested books on chivalry, as this was his preferred reading topic of choice. Fortunately, though, they didn't have any books on that topic, so he had to read about the life of Christ and the lives of the saints. Little did Ignatius know that that one leg injury would be a major stepping stone towards his sainthood. Eventually, when Ignatius was well enough, he gave up the life of a noble soldier and lived an impoverished life in a cave outside of Manresa. During this time in Manresa, he wrote the Spiritual Exercises, which is a compilation of meditations, prayers, and contemplative practices. While documenting the emotions that he felt while encountering the scriptures, eventually Ignatius felt a calling to the priesthood and went to school once again to learn Latin in order to fulfill the educational requirements to be a priest. He then continued his education at the University of Paris, where Ignatius, alongside Francis Xavier and Peter Faber, formed the Society of Jesus. For 15 years, Ignatius led the Jesuits, and he oversaw the founding of many schools and churches under the Jesuit order, including missionary work as far west as Brazil and as far east as Japan. Despite the responsibility, he continued to serve the poor and the sick in Rome, and eventually Ignatius succumbed to a stomach illness on July 31st, 1556. In 1622, he was canonized as a saint by Pope Gregory XV, and today he serves as the patron saint of education, retreats, soldiers, and the Society of Jesus. St. Francis Xavier was a close friend of St. Ignatius of Loyola and the co-founder of the Jesuit order, who is also considered by many to be one of the greatest missionaries in Christian history, credited with baptizing as many as 100,000 people. Born into a wealthy family in 1506, his origins were quite similar to that of his friend St. Ignatius. At the age of 19, he left his family permanently for the University of Paris and eventually obtained a master's degree in philosophy. Ignatius played a major role in Xavier's life, and he was also very influential in him joining the priesthood, with them pronouncing their vows together in August of 1534 alongside 4 other people. Eventually, Xavier and Ignatius were ordained priests in 1537, and in 1538 they officially created the Jesuits. Xavier would serve as a secretary for the society, with notable tasks including missionary work, which led him to many places such as India, Rome, Lisbon, Mozambique, modern-day Kenya, Socotra, and Goa. He also established the first Christian mission in Japan in 1549, served there on the island for 2 years. In 1552, he traveled to China, but unfortunately wasn't allowed to disembark to the mainland and was forced to wait 3 months on the island of Canton to await clearance by the government. He died on the island from illness and was canonized as a saint alongside Ignatius of Loyola by Pope Gregory XV in 1622. His feast day is celebrated on December 3rd, and he serves as a patron saint of all foreign missions and is also known as the Apostle of the Indies and the Apostle of Japan. Saint Benedict of Nursia was born in the 5th century into a Christian noble family alongside his twin sister, Saint Scholastica. Not much is known about his early life, but after spending years as a student in Rome, he quit due to finding it unfulfilling and also unchristian. He spent time living as a hermit, residing in a cave where monks of a local monastery in the area asked Benedict to become their abbot due to his reputation as a very holy man. He would eventually be viewed with disdain by the community, though, for his insistence on proper monastic discipline, which would lead to an assassination attempt on his life through poisoning. He miraculously survived the poisoning and returned to Sacro Speco afterwards. He then continued his mission from God, establishing over 12 monasteries across all of Italy. During this time, he would write the Rule of Saint Benedict, as it's referred to today, because, he obviously wasn't a saint when he wrote it. That would be crazy, which outlines the lives of the Benedictine monks and the lifestyle of ora et labora, prayer and work. This piece wouldn't only be influential for monastics, but also the lives of many Christians. He would serve as the abbot of the monastery and unfortunately passed away on March 21st in 547 AD. He was canonized by Pope Honorius III in 1220, and his feast day is on July 11th, although it's also celebrated on March 21st by many Benedictine monks. Saint Benedict serves as the patron saint of students in all of Europe, and his devotion, the Saint Benedict medal, which wasn't actually started by him but was attributed to him, is a very popular devotion worn by millions across the world. Saint Raphael the Archangel is one of the 3 archangels specifically named in the Bible, and serves as the patron saint of travelers, the blind, bodily ills, happy marriages, and young love. He is mentioned by name in the book of Tobit, where he is disguised as a human and travels alongside Tobiah, healing him from his blindness and delivering his wife Sarah to him. Raphael is also believed to be mentioned in chapter 5 of the Gospel of John. At the pool of Bethesda near Bethany, John describes an angel descending into the pool at certain times, causing a ripple in the water which would heal any ill person who reached it first. Because of the pool of Bethesda's healing power, it is often attributed to Saint Raphael as well, although this is an interpretation and not a doctrine. While not nearly as much is known about Raphael compared to the other archangels, although there could be more archangels, there's only 3 mentioned in the Bible, he is still an incredibly powerful force who has interacted with prophets in the Old Testament throughout Scripture, as well as with many saints who have received visions of him. Just like the other archangels, he serves God directly, carrying out his commands in very important ways, and it's all the more reason to devote yourself to him, in my opinion. Alright gang, starting off layer 5, we have St. Carlo Acutis. St. Carlo Acutis is one of the most well-known modern saints, known for being the first millennial saint as well as the patron saint of the internet. Canonized in September of 2025, he is one of the most recent saints to be canonized actually, and many people, including myself, have felt a real connection to his life and legacy. Born in 1991 to his parents Andrea and Antonio Salzano, Acutis developed a very strong interest in the faith early in life, and while his parents were only nominally Catholic, Catholic beforehand, Carlo began attending daily mass at the age of 7, and this eventually brought his mother Antonia back into the faith as well. Along with being interested in the lives of the saints and of the Eucharist, Carlo was extremely talented in computer programming and graphic design, which he taught himself. Rather than reject technology as a temptation to sin, as many Catholics did at the time, Carlo sought to reconcile them with his faith. For example, he loved video games, however he limited himself to 1 hour of video games per week as a form of penance. When Carlo was 11 years old, however, he began researching the validity of Eucharistic miracles and began documenting them on his website miracolieucharistici.org. However, in October of 2006, at the age of 15, Carlo Acutis was tragically diagnosed with leukemia. Despite his constant suffering, he offered it up for the sake of the Pope and the Church as a whole. On October 12th, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, going into a coma and being pronounced dead shortly afterwards. His extremely short life, while tragic, had touched thousands of people, and by the time of his death, his website had documented over 150 Eucharistic miracles. In September of 2025, he was canonized by Pope Leo XIV as one of the most recent saints to this day, and he continues to serve as an inspiration for Catholics on the internet and is a powerful example of using modern technology to spread the gospel. Saint Rita of Cascia is the patron saint of impossible causes and desperate situations, which makes it very relatable to any of my viewers who are single. Just joking, of course, but she's also the patron saint of victims of abuse and widows, for those who are in relationships. Born in Roccaporena, Italy in 1381, she originally wanted to become a religious sister, however at a young age was pressured by her parents into getting married to a very cruel husband, who abused her for over 18 years. In this marriage, she also had 2 sons, however tragically, her husband was left dead from a conflict in a family feud, when her children were still very young. Rather than seeking revenge, however, she forgave her husband's killers publicly, and even though her family sought to bring her sons into the family feud that had taken her husband's life, she made a prayer to the Lord that it would be better for her sons to be taken from her, rather than for them to fall into the mortal sin of murder and revenge. Which is pretty intense, honestly, but also very admirable for her to realize that as a mother. 1 year later, tragically, her sons died of dysentery. Once again, rather than perpetuate this cycle of revenge, Rita used this opportunity to become a religious sister. However, before she could enter into the monastery, she was given the penance of resolving the conflict that had caused her family so much pain. Eventually, after ending the family feud completely, she was able to enter into the monastery at the age of 36. She spent the next 40 years of her life in quiet prayer and service, eventually dying of tuberculosis in 1457. She was canonized in 1900 by Pope Leo XIII and serves as a powerful sign that abuse is not the end, and that God is with us within all things and can make any situation into a good one. Saint Bernadette of Lourdes is a powerful example of how simple and ordinary devotion to the Blessed Mother can have extraordinary consequences. Born in Lourdes, France in 1844 to a very poor family of 9 children, as a child, Bernadette became extremely ill from cholera. She recovered but still suffered major health issues later in her life. At the age of 14, Bernadette and her younger sister left their home to gather firewood when a beautiful woman appeared to her in a grotto. The woman was holding a rosary and made the sign of a cross. However, Bernadette realized that she was the only one out of her and her sister who could see her. She fell to her knees and began to pray. A few days later, while walking along the same path, the woman appeared to her again, and it was then that she realized that this was no ordinary woman. The apparition continued to appear to her throughout the next few months, and even though her parents tried to get her to stop visiting it, they were unsuccessful. One day, the apparition told Bernadette to drink the water of the spring nearby the grotto, and even though the water was very muddy and dirty, the next day it became completely clear. After this, she asked the woman what her name was, and she replied with, "I am the Immaculate Conception." While the church was skeptical of this miracle at first, the water of Lourdes began to miraculously cure the people that visited, with over 69 medically verified cures to this day. The sanctuary of Our Lady of Lourdes was built at the site and continues to be an important pilgrimage site. Disliking the newfound attention that the miracles brought to her and her family, however, Bernadette became a religious sister with the Sisters of Charity, working as an infirmary assistant. But unfortunately, she passed away from tuberculosis at the very young age of 35 in 1879. She was canonized as a saint in 1933 by Pope Pius XI and continues to serve as the patron saint of illnesses, poverty, and Lourdes, France. Saint Faustina Kowalska was a Polish religious sister and mystic who received multiple visions of Jesus Christ, creating one of the most popular devotions of all time, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, based on her encounters with Jesus Christ in her visions. Born Helena Kowalska in Lodz, Poland in 1905, to a very religious family, she felt the call to become a religious sister at the age of 7 years old. Initially, her parents, who were very poor, did not give her permission to do this. However, when Kowalska was 18 years old, she attended a party with her sister. During this party, she was just dancing and going about her business cross when suddenly a vision of Jesus appeared to her, suffering and wounded. Jesus said to her, "How long should I put up with you putting me off?" And after this experience, she immediately got on a train to Warsaw without telling her parents and became a religious sister, taking the name Faustina of the Blessed Sacrament. In 1930, Faustina became very ill, and Christ appeared to Faustina dressed in a white garment with red and white rays emanating from his heart. He told Faustina to paint the image of him exactly as he appeared in this vision, and after 3 years, she was finally able to commission an artist to create the now famous Divine Mercy image. Over the years, Christ continued to appear to her in many apparitions, which she documented in her diary, Divine Mercy in My Soul. Christ told her that the Sunday after Easter each year was to become known as Divine Mercy Sunday, and that the image that she created would be venerated throughout the entire world. Based on the visions she received, she also created the Divine Mercy Chaplet, with a real promise from Christ that anyone who prayed it at the hour of their death would not meet God as a judge, but rather as a merciful savior. Faustina's battle with tuberculosis unfortunately continued, and she passed away in 1938 at the age of only 33 years old. After her death, her diary was discovered and investigated, and in 2000, Divine Mercy Sunday was established by Pope John Paul II, and Faustina was canonized as a saint on April 30th. Saint Bonaventure was born in 1221 in central Italy, born originally with the name John. The reason why he's known as Bonaventure today is because that as a child he was diagnosed with a very serious illness. The one and only Saint Francis of Assisi miraculously healed Bonaventure from this sickness, and furthermore also prophesied Bonaventure's greatness. When Saint Francis healed him, he said, "O Bonaventura," which means good fortune. This name would stick with John as he grew older, and eventually it just became the thing that people called him. Saint Bonaventure joined the Franciscan order when he was only 22 years old, and moved to Paris to complete his studies before becoming a teacher. During this time, he actually became close friends with Thomas Aquinas, but then he was elected by his fellow friars to serve as the general minister of the entire Franciscan order. His 17 years of leading the Franciscans were tumultuous and filled with controversy over the interpretation of Francis's various teachings, but regardless, Bonaventure remained steadfast, and in 1273, he was granted the role of cardinal by Pope Gregory X. As a cardinal, he participated in the Second Council of Lyon, but died suddenly during the council, with many people believing that he had been poisoned. His legacy as a writer and a leader of the Franciscans earned him the title of Doctor of the Church in 1588 by Pope Sixtus V, and he is the patron saint of bowel movements and disorders. Yes, Saint Bonaventure is the patron saint of taking a Saint Thomas More was born on February 7th, 1478 in London, to a very wealthy family. Due to his father being a very prominent lawyer and judge during King Edward IX's reign, Thomas gained his education in one of the best schools in London at the time, St. Anthony's, and would eventually become friends with the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, John Morton. He would inspire Thomas to continue pursuing his education, which led to him entering Oxford University in 1492, where he would learn Latin and Greek. After this time in Oxford, he began to train as a lawyer, living next to a Carthusian monastery for a couple of years, which would be very influential in both his spiritual life and his education. Although he never became a monk and remained in the secular world for his entire career, the spiritual exercises and simple lifestyle that he participated in brought him closer to Christ in a very real way, and instilled in him a deep devotion to the church. During this time as a lawyer, he became very close to King Henry VIII, serving as the Lord Chancellor and prosecuting those who were accused of heresy by the Catholic Church in England. 1530 would serve as a turning point in his life, as King Henry VIII wanted an annulment from his wife at the time, Catherine, and you can probably see where this is going, but Henry pressured More into signing an annulment request to the Pope to invalidate their marriage. However, More refused. Over the years, Henry would grow more aggressive to the Pope, leading to More's eventual resignation as Grand Chancellor. More refused to attend the 1533 coronation of Anne Boleyn, which greatly offended Henry VIII and led to Henry charging More with many charges such as accepting bribes and conspiracy against the king. However, due to More's reputation and integrity, it was impossible to properly charge him with these crimes. However, Henry still imprisoned More in the Tower of London on the basis of not recognizing Henry as the head of the church and refusing his annulment from Catherine. On July 1st, Thomas More was put on trial, in which the jury consisted of Anne Boleyn's father, brother, and uncle, so yeah, you can imagine how that went. More was then sentenced to be beheaded on July 6th, 1535, and his last words were, "The king's good servant, but God's first." He was canonized in 1935 by Pope Pius XI, and his feast day is celebrated on June 22nd. Today, he is the patron saint of attorneys, civil servants, public service, lawyers, and politicians, as well as a powerful example of someone who faced political corruption with both dignity and strength. Saint Clare of Assisi was born in 1194 to a very rich family of nobles. However, despite this, she was still raised devoutly and experienced a passionate love for the Lord even at a young age. Renowned for her beauty, she refused her family's proposal for marriage at the age of 18, instead wanting to follow the Lord. When she was 18 years old, she experienced a sermon from St. Francis of Assisi and in a moment of sudden inspiration, asked him to help her live a life of holiness. In 1212, she left her home and followed Francis fully, cutting off her hair and exchanging her expensive dresses for a simple robe, joining the Benedictine monks of San Paulo. Her father became angry at this and tried to force her to come back and enter into an arranged marriage, but she refused, saying that her only spouse was Jesus Christ. She requested a life of solitude to St. Francis, and she and her sister began what would later be called the Order of the Poor Ladies of San Damiano, in silent seclusion and poverty. Claire became close friends with Francis during this time, and he would even live in the monastery with her. Over the years, she began to be referred to by the other sisters as another Francis, due to her piety and devotion to the Lord. As Francis got older, she began to care for him, seeing him as almost a father figure. After Francis passed away, she fought to maintain the asceticism of her order, as her ministry and lifestyle was viewed as radical even by the Pope himself. In 1224, when soldiers attacked Assisi, Claire brought a consecrated host in the monstrance out to them and held it high, praying to the Lord. Tradition holds that the soldiers fled in terror from the Eucharist, as if a divine power was chasing them away. As Claire grew older, she became very sick, but believed that no pain could bring her away from the Lord. In 1235, Claire passed away, and her order was renamed to the Order of St. Clare shortly afterwards in 1263. In 1253, she was canonized by Pope Innocent IV and serves as the patron saint of eye diseases, goldsmiths, and television for some reason. Saint Cecilia of Rome was a very early Christian martyr who was traditionally honored as the patron saint of music. Born in the 2nd century, she was born to a noble family in Rome, but converted to Christianity as a teenager, making a vow of virginity unbeknownst to her pagan family. She was arranged into marriage with a man named Valerian, and the two married against her will. On their wedding day, while the music was playing loud at the ceremony, she prayed to God, asking God to protect her purity. She then told Valerian about her faith in Christ, and that if he ever did anything to her, that she was protected by her guardian angel. He asked to see the angel, but Cecilia told him that he first needed to be baptized, which he did, becoming a Christian with his brother Tiberius. The three of them eventually began to secretly give burials to Christian martyrs of Rome, which was highly illegal at the time. Eventually, they were arrested by Roman authorities and killed for their faith. Tradition holds that the Romans first tried to suffocate her, then behead her, but they couldn't due to the power of God. After her execution, she continued to live on for 3 days, preaching to the Romans and giving away her possessions until eventually she died. After her death, she became the patron saint of music, and though not much is known about her life, she still remains one of the most popular saints to this day. Saint Barnabas, also known as Barabbas or Barsabbas, was a member of the early church mentioned in the New Testament, basically being as close as you can get to an apostle without actually being one. Barabbas' early life is largely unknown, besides the fact that he was born in Cyprus, and was most likely the cousin of Saint Mark the Evangelist. After the death of Christ, he became a member of one of the earliest convents in Jerusalem, and became close friends with Saint Paul during this time. He was actually able to persuade the Christians in Jerusalem to accept Paul as one of them, even being the one to introduce Paul to Peter in the first place. Throughout his life, he would travel with Paul, being mentioned frequently throughout his epistles, and helping to mediate in many early church conflicts between the Jews and the Gentiles. Barnabas also served as a representative of the church in Antioch to help incorporate the early church community into the Church of Jerusalem. While unconfirmed, many scholars believe Barnabas to be the author of the letter to the Hebrews, as his travels with St. Paul and his skill in writing and diplomacy make him a very likely candidate for an otherwise unknown book. He continued to serve as a disciple of Christ until his death in around 61 AD, where it is traditionally believed that he was stoned to death in the city of Salamis, Cyprus, while preaching in the synagogue. Barnabas is known as the patron saint of Cyprus, Antioch, and all peacemakers, making him one of the most important early saints in the church's history. Saint Valentine was a 3rd century saint. Despite his legacy, however, not much is reliably known about his life, just because it was so early on into the history of Christianity that not much is documented about him. Whether or not much of his life is legend is actually unknown, as it's just impossible to determine whether or not it's real, to the point where his feast day was officially removed from the liturgical calendar in 1969. However, during his life, he served as a bishop of Terni and suffered great persecution from the Romans at the time. He was arrested and called by a judge to test his faith, and the judge commanded Valentine to heal his blind daughter, which he did by placing his hands on her. The judge was then humbled and converted to Christianity soon afterwards. Later in life, Valentine was sent before the Emperor Claudius II and was imprisoned for performing marriages and preaching the gospel. While imprisoned, Valentine began to develop a friendship with the emperor actually, until eventually Valentine asked him if he was open to the idea of converting to Christianity. Claudius realized what was happening immediately and sentenced Valentine to death unless he renounced his faith. Valentine obviously refused and passed away in around 269 AD. While much of his life is largely unknown, his legacy as the patron saint of lovers and marriages, as well as the story of his martyrdom, continues to inspire millions of people every year on Valentine's Day. And then starting off layer 6, we have Saint Christopher, who, very similar to Saint Valentine, was another early church martyr whose life has really become something of legend over thousands of years. Born sometime in the 2nd century in Canaan, as an adult he became a follower of Christ. Very little is actually known about his life, however, to the point where many early church depictions of him actually claimed that he had the head of a dog, which, I don't know, I'm no expert in history, but I can assume that that wasn't the case. However, he was described as a man of great stature, or a giant, depending on which story you read. However, his story traditionally goes that he spent his early life on a mission to serve the greatest king that he could, until eventually he realized that the greatest king on the earth was the devil. Eventually, he encountered a band of thieves on his travels, whose leader claimed to be the devil himself, and then he followed this leader of a band of thieves because apparently this man was the most powerful man in the entire world. It's pretty funny, I don't know. However, eventually, while traveling with this band of thieves and the man who claimed that he was the devil, he encountered a hermit who said that Christ was the greatest king of all, the King of Kings, and Christopher began to follow this hermit, spending his time helping travelers cross the nearby river and telling them about the gospel. One day, a child asked for Christopher's help to cross the river, and he obliged. When he had crossed the river, the child revealed himself to be the child Jesus himself, and that when Christopher had carried him, he had actually been carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. The child then disappeared, which led to his name of Christopher, or Christ-bearer. He spent the rest of his years traveling and preaching until he was eventually killed as a martyr by Emperor Decius in 251 AD. Despite his extremely legendary persona, he still serves as the patron saint of bachelors, transportation, and those struggling with epilepsy. Saint George. If you thought that Saint Christopher was legendary, just wait until we get to Saint George. Saint George was likely born in the late 2nd century in Cappadocia, Greece, and served as a Roman military officer despite his Christian beliefs. Throughout his time as an officer, many legends developed around him, including probably the most famous of Saint George and the Dragon. In the story, Saint George saved a city from a literal dragon, killing it and then rescuing the princess in the castle. Now, this is probably a legend and didn't actually happen, although I do think that it would be funny if it was just like a Greek dude who killed a big lizard and then there were legends about him and then it became this. However, as he got older, during the persecution of Christians under Emperor Diocletian, George was arrested for his beliefs and forced to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. He refused and was beheaded in around 303 AD. During the Middle Ages, especially during the Crusades, he became a very popular figure among knights, soldiers, and crusaders, leading to his largely legendary status today. Saint George serves as the patron saint of England, Georgia, and many other countries throughout the world, and is a really powerful example of how serving Christ in simple ways can have extraordinary effects on the world. Saint Irenaeus was one of the most important early church fathers and a major defender of the Christian faith. Born sometime in the 2nd century, not much is known about him, besides the fact that he learned from his teacher Saint Polycarp, who had been a disciple of John the Apostle. Irenaeus later became the Bishop of Lyons and was known for his work fighting against Gnosticism, an ancient heresy that believed in multiple gods below the Christian God, as well as in uncovering secret esoteric knowledge about the universe, or gnosis. His major work against heresies helped preserve apostolic teaching and shaped Catholic theology for centuries to come. Much like the rest of his life, the details about his death are largely unknown, but he is believed to have been martyred in around 202 AD. Despite his impact on the church, it wasn't until 2022 that he was actually declared as a doctor of the church by Pope Francis. Saint Agnes was a very young Roman virgin and martyr, and a powerful example of Christian purity in the face of death. Born in 291 to a Roman noble family, she was raised as a Christian by her parents. A beautiful young girl at the age of 13, she refused an arranged marriage because she had consecrated herself to Christ alone and had made a vow of virginity. After being rejected by Agnes, one of her suitors, who had discovered that she was a Christian, submitted her name to Roman authorities as a follower of Christ. After this, a Roman official named Sempronius commanded that Agnes be dragged naked through the streets and handed over to a brothel. The story goes that Agnes prayed to the Lord while being dragged through the street, and immediately her hair began to grow, covering her entire body. After this, many men attempted to assault her, but they were immediately struck blind. Angry at this, Sempronius attempted to burn her, but the wood would not catch on fire. The guard then drew his sword and beheaded her, finally ending her life. Despite her young age, her perseverance led the early church to honor her, and she has been honored as a saint since ancient times, as a powerful example of courage, innocence, and devotion to God. Today, she serves as the patron saint of young girls, chastity, and victims of abuse. Saint Jerome was one of the greatest biblical scholars in all of church history, known not only for his incredible contributions to the church, but also for his bad temper. Born around 340 AD in Dalmatia, he studied deeply, lived as a monk, and devoted his life to scripture. His greatest achievement was probably translating the Bible into Latin, in a version known today as the Vulgate, which became one of the most important biblical translations in the history of Christianity. Later in life, Jerome would travel throughout Palestine, retracing the steps of Christ and praying with desert scholars, before settling in Bethlehem in 420 AD, where Jerome died peacefully. Jerome was known for his sharp personality, intense scholarship, and deep love for the Word of God. Today, Jerome serves as the patron saint of translators, librarians, and biblical scholars, and was declared a doctor of the church by Pope Boniface XIII. Saint Timothy was a very close disciple and missionary companion of Saint Paul, as well as the subject of the epistles to Timothy in the New Testament. He was born in Lystra, Asia Minor, with a Jewish mother and a Greek father. However, when Paul visited Lystra with Barnabas, healing a person who was crippled from birth, Timothy decided to follow Paul as a disciple. Paul trusted him deeply in the work of spreading the gospel, and Timothy helped lead early Christian communities as the bishop of Ephesus. Two New Testament letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, written by St. Paul, are addressed to him and show his role as a young Christian leader in the early church. His death is largely unknown, but it is believed that he was stoned to death in 97 AD after attempting to halt a procession to the Greek goddess Diana. He is remembered as a model of faithful leadership, courage, and loyalty to the apostolic mission, as well as the patron saint of stomach and intestinal disorders. Saint Maria Goretti. Just a warning for this one is pretty graphic and disturbing, so you might want to skip this one. The story of Maria Teresa Goretti is a very profound story that, similar to Saint Agnes, displays the sanctity and the purity of martyrdom. Born in Ancona, Italy, she grew up in a very poor but very faithful home. While her siblings and parents worked in the fields, Maria, even though she was very young, cleaned, cooked for the family, and cared for her younger siblings. In a state of extreme poverty, her family eventually moved to a farm with another family, the Serenellis, and began working for the Serenelli family in exchange for housing. In 1902, when Maria was only 11 years old, the Serenelli's 20-year-old son, Alessandro, attempted to assault Maria. When Maria refused his advances, he threatened to end her life. However, Maria stayed firm in her faith, claiming that she would rather die than commit a mortal sin. Alessandro then brutally unalives Maria, piercing her 14 times with an awl. After this, Alessandro was immediately arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison, narrowly escaping the death penalty due to mental illness. However, this story does have a happy ending. In prison, Alessandro had a dream in which Maria appeared to him and gave him a bundle of lilies, which burned immediately when he touched them. Inspired by this vision, he went to Maria's mother, Assunta, and begged for forgiveness. His mother forgave him, and he began praying for Maria daily for forgiveness, referring to her as my little saint. Alessandro eventually became a friar of the Capuchin order until he passed away in 1970. Now, this story is extremely disturbing and very tragic, but I think that it's ultimately a very powerful example of how God can take an absolutely terrible situation and make something good out of it. And even though what Alessandro did is absolutely terrible, he spent the rest of his life atoning for it and making up with God. And I think that that is a beautiful story of conversion. Maria Goretti was canonized in 1950 and serves as the patron saint of victims of sexual assault, teenage girls, chastity, and forgiveness. On a little bit of a lighter note, Saint Francis de Sales is the patron saint of the deaf, journalists, authors, and writers. Francis de Sales is known to many Catholics as the author of the Philotea, a must-read if you want to strengthen your faith and your devotion to understand what it really means. Born in August of 1567, he served as the Bishop of Ginebra from 1602 to 1622. And funnily enough, this was the same city that John Calvin was acting in just years after the Protestant Reformation had taken place. He is not only known for his excellent deeds and writing, but also for his docility. Francis de Sales was highly educated by the Jesuits in Padua, but by around the age of 18, after having a theological discussion on predestination, he lost his faith in salvation and believed that he was destined to hell. Due to this belief, he even remained bedridden for a time because it had physical consequences on his health. He believed it that strongly. However, he consecrated himself himself to the Virgin Mary after praying the Memorare by a statue of Our Lady of Good Deliverance, and then things started to change. After reading the first epistle of John, he understood what it meant to love as God had loved, and he started to change his life around that. Unfortunately, he passed away, and despite his docility after his death, they discovered scratches on his desk that had been made by his fingernails when he was in agony and angry at a situation, which is pretty funny, I don't know. His legacy is best characterized by his well-fought deeds against the Protestants, mainly Calvinists. Take that, Redeemed Zoomer. And fun fact, he was actually the first saint ever to be canonized in St. Peter's Basilica, and was eventually declared a doctor of the church. Now, I feel like this is a real struggle that a lot of people have in a world that's very much influenced by Protestantism, and if you ever have problems believing that you can't be saved, St. Francis de Sales is a very powerful role model. St. Ambrose was born in 340 AD and originally was a Roman governor. However, later in his life, in 374 AD, he dedicated his life to God, got baptized, and became the Bishop of Milan. When St. Ambrose became a bishop, he wrote letters to Valentinian II and Theodosius I, who were Roman emperors at the time. He dedicated his life to Christ by donating his money to the poor and giving everything that he had in service of the church. Eventually, the Roman Emperor Theodosius converted to Christianity. However, St. Ambrose did not let Theodosius take First Communion until he repented for the massacre he had committed in Thessalonica, and Theodosius publicly repented. And after he repented, Theodosius made a law that there would be a 1-month waiting period before the death sentence that would allow him to change his mind in case he had made a mistake, which, you know, props to him. At least that's good, I guess. There's also a legend that during his childhood, a swarm of bees landed on his face while he was sleeping, and they left honey on his lips, which is why he was known as the honey-tongued doctor, which actually led to him being the patron saint of beekeepers. However, after serving for years as the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose passed away from natural causes at the age of 57 years old in 347 AD. St. John Henry Newman was a very important modern theologian, cardinal, and convert, best known for his role in the Oxford movement, becoming one of the most influential Catholic thinkers of the 19th century. Born on February 21st, 1801 in London, England, Newman was raised in a religious Anglican family and was known at a young age for his intelligence, seriousness, and deep interest in theology. He studied at Oxford and eventually became an Anglican priest, where he helped lead the Oxford movement, which tried to recover the ancient Catholic roots of Anglicanism. However, as Newman studied the early church fathers and the development of Catholic doctrine, he became convinced that the fullness of Christian faith found in the Catholic Church. In 1845, he converted to Catholicism, which cost him many of his friends, his status, and much of his former life in England. He later became a Catholic priest, founding the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in England, and wrote major works defending Catholic doctrine, conscience, education, and the relationship between faith and reason. Newman was made a cardinal by Pope Leo XIII in 1879 and unfortunately passed away in 1890. St. John Henry Newman was canonized by Pope Francis in 2019, serving as a strong witness to follow God even when it costs everything. And today he serves as the patron saint of converts, students, and universities. And then finally, finishing off, we have St. Vincent de Paul, who serves as the patron saint of charity and has had a lasting legacy that has probably affected millions of people. From seeking priesthood for financial stability to a true conversion within the soul after he was captured and kept as a slave by Muslim pirates, his story and his conversion makes him a really powerful role model for how charity can transform your life. Born in southern France in 1581, Vincent was raised by a family of peasants in the city of Puy, which is, funnily enough, now called St. Vincent de Paul. Raised as a Catholic within his family, he was educated by the Franciscans and ordained as a priest around the age of 20, and then went to study at the University of Toulouse, where he graduated in 1604. Before St. Vincent de Paul went to Paris, where he remained for the rest of his life, he also spent a year in Rome after escaping slavery. In Paris, by the year 1625, he founded the Congregation of the Mission, also known as the Lazarists or the Vincentians, where he built up a reputation for his charity and compassion to the poor. He also founded the Confraternities of Charity, an association of laywomen who visited, fed, and nursed the sick and the poor. Additionally, he also played a role in the Catholic Counter-Reformation in the 17th century in France, and was an important early opponent of Jansenism. St. Vincent de Paul was so deeply marked by his devotion to God through charity that his history survived centuries, with St. Vincent de Paul centers across the world today serving millions as a very prominent charitable organization to help the poor. We can only imagine the multitude of grace this man had in his life, and today he serves as the patron saint of charitable societies, hospitals, volunteers, and prisoners. Alright guys, starting off layer 7, we have two saints, St. Anne and St. Joachim, who are best known for being the parents of the Blessed Virgin Mary, raising her with dignity, guiding her through the intense process of her pregnancy with Jesus, and even serving as Jesus' own grandparents when he was growing up. Even though they are incredibly important and popular figures within Catholicism today, not much is actually known about them, as barely anything is mentioned about them in Scripture. In fact, their names, Anne and Joachim, come directly from the apocryphal texts, such as the Proto-Evangelium of James, and are not mentioned in Scripture directly. So we don't even know what their real names are. However, they did raise Mary, who, as Catholics, we believe she was perfect, so they must have been pretty good parents. It is believed that Joachim died around the time of Jesus' birth. However, the death of Anne is largely unknown. Although there isn't much reliable information about their lives, they were venerated as early as the 4th century by early Christians, and their legacy as the parents of the Blessed Virgin Mary makes them very powerful and popular saints to this day. Saints Anne and Joachim together serve as the patron saints of all grandparents, and Saint Anne serves as the patron saint of childbirth. This was kind of a weird one to rank on this list, because while they are very widely known and popular, there's almost nothing known about their lives, which makes them a little bit obscure and mysterious actually. So I felt like this was a good place to put it on the iceberg list. Saint Athanasius of Alexandria is one of the greatest church fathers of all of history, writing many great pieces defending the Trinity and the deity of Christ, such as the Athanasian Creed, which, comes from his name. Who would have thought? Athanasius' best work in serving Christ would be through his fight against the heresy of Arianism, which was a very early church heresy that basically believed that Jesus Christ the Son was secondary to the Father and created by him. Athanasius' service to God eventually earned him the title of Doctor of the Church. However, he didn't start that way. Born in 296 AD in Alexandria, Egypt, Athanasius' rise to fame would begin with his classical education, which would lead him to becoming the secretary to the Bishop of Alexandria at the time. Within a few years, Athanasius would enter the priesthood and become a bishop. While the former Bishop of Alexandria was very adamant in his fight against Arianism, Athanasius would do his best to continue this fight. However, it would not be an easy battle. Athanasius was exiled multiple times for defending Christ's divinity, and he essentially went on a Batman-type arc where literally all of his dogmatic writings were directly against Arius and Arianism. Unfortunately, he did pass away in about 373 AD, but his work would be crucial at the Council of Constantinople in 380 AD, where the heresy of Arianism was formally condemned in no small part due to Athanasius' writings. Athanasius was declared as a doctor of the church by Pope Pius V, and he serves as a patron saint of theologians. Saint Athanasius shows that truth isn't always meant to be popular, and that you should fight for the truth at all costs, even if it means being ostracized by your own country and bishops. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton is best known for being the first saint born in the United States, and also for starting the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's, which was the first community for religious women within the United States. Born as Elizabeth Ann Bailey in New York City on August 28, 1774, she was born into a prominent and wealthy Episcopal family and married her husband William Seton, a wealthy businessman at the time, at the age of 19. The couple had 5 children together, but unfortunately, her husband tragically passed away from tuberculosis in 1803 while the family was visiting Italy. Seton's time in Italy would be very influential on her, since she would discover Catholicism and end up converting whenever she returned to the United States in 1805. After being confirmed, she moved from New York to Emmitsburg, Maryland, where she would reside for the rest of her life. In 1809, Elizabeth became a religious sister, becoming a teacher, founding multiple schools, and the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's, eventually becoming known by her peers as Mother Seton. However, unfortunately, just as her husband did, she ended up passing away from tuberculosis in 1821. Throughout her life, she founded many Catholic schools, orphanages, boarding schools, and hospitals throughout the United States, and her work served as the foundation for the American Catholic school system today. She was canonized in 1975 by Pope Paul VI, and she serves as the patron saint of Catholic schools, teachers, and widows. Fun little bit of that Catholic guy lore, I guess. I used to go to an elementary school called St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, and I kind of always grew up hearing about her, but it was really cool to research this because literally every Catholic school in America can be attributed back to her, and I think that's really cool. Saint Rose of Lima is best known for being the first canonized saint of the New World. Rose was born on April 20th, 1586 in modern-day Lima, Peru, which was a part of the Spanish Empire at the time, to a Spaniard father, Gaspar de Flores, and an Incan woman named Maria de Oliva. Originally born with the name of Isabel, she was known for her beauty and eventually nicknamed Rose because of this. Despite this, however, she would actually rub pepper into her face and put lime on her hands to prevent herself from committing the sin of vanity society due to her beauty, which, you know, that's pretty intense. As she got older, her family desired her to be married, but you can probably see where this is going based on every other female saint on this list. But Rose's true desire was for the religious life. After many arguments with her family, she would join the Third Order of Saint Dominic and would take a vow of perpetual virginity. She would then spend the rest of her life as a recluse, living just outside of her family's garden in a hut, which she would use as her oratory. She would induce Christ-like suffering on herself by wearing a circlet of silver on her head that was studded with sharp points on the inside, acting in memory of the Lord's crown of thorns. She would also flog herself up to 3 times a day, wear a shirt made of hair, drag around a wooden cross throughout the garden, rub her lips with gall, and chew bitter herbs, all as acts of mortifications, which unfortunately would take a toll on her health later in life. This didn't affect her though, and she would actually bear these sufferings without complaint. Rose witnessed visions, revelations, visitations, and voices, which would be judged by priests and physicians of the time as spiritual experiences. Throughout all of this though, she never forgot about her life outside of the oratory, and she would dedicate herself in service to the poor and the natives who were being exploited by the empire. She would speak out against the oppression by the Spanish fearlessly, and she would often go sick and hungry in her home so that she could care for them. She would eventually pass away in 1617, but her last prayer was, "Lord, increase my sufferings, and with them increase thy love in my heart." Her death was mourned practically by the entire city, as her body was displayed in the cathedral due to her intense holiness. She was canonized by Pope Clement in 1671, with her feast day being celebrated on August 30th. Today she serves as the patron saint of the Americas, florists, Latin America, Peru, the Philippines, and South America as a whole. So, you know, Pope Leo XIV is cool and all, but the OG Leo, well, he's a saint. Leo I was actually the first pope to be called the Great, and one of only 3 popes who were ever officially given that title. And interestingly enough, Leo was actually a deacon when he was elected pope in 440 AD, which technically you don't have to be a cardinal, a bishop, or even a priest to get elected pope, which makes him one of the biggest papal anomalies in history, honestly. Throughout his life, he helped to explicate Christ's fully human and divine nature, which helped define the role of pope as the supreme head of the church and the preeminent teacher of faith and morals. However, probably most famously, in 452 AD, Attila the Hun was sweeping through Europe with a massive army of barbarians and eventually camped outside of Rome, with every apparent intention of conquering the city. Rather than fleeing or trying to raise his own army, Pope Leo personally rode out unarmed to meet Attila in the plains of Mantua, and ordered the most powerful military leader in the entire world to depart in the name of Christ. And to this day, historians still can't explain why, but Attila listened and left immediately. After writing over 100 letters and sermons as one of the greatest popes in history, see what I did there? Leo passed away in 449 AD and was later declared a doctor of the church in 754 by Pope Benedict XIV, one of only 3 popes who have ever been named doctor of the church. Pope Leo the Great serves as a dramatic reminder that God's protection is more powerful than any human army. Gregory the Great, not to be confused with Leo the Great, was another one of the greatest popes of all time and one of only 3 popes with that title. Born in 540 AD into Roman nobility, his father was a prefect of the city. However, he was immediately surrounded by devout Christians in his childhood, with his mother and aunt even being saints. However, only a couple of years after Gregory was born, the plague struck Italy, wiping out a third of the population. This became even more complicated when barbarians spread through Italy, attacking local villages. However, despite all of this, Gregory would prove to be a bright mind and would eventually be elected to be the prefect of the city just as his father had been. However, ultimately, this life was not fulfilling for him, and God came to Gregory directly, telling him, "Go and sell all that you have and give to the poor." Without hesitation, Gregory would follow the voice that would penetrate his own heart. He would convert his entire family's villa into a monastery and step down from his position as prefect, and eventually he became known for his intense devotion and love of poverty. Eventually, in 579 AD, Pope Pelagius II made him a papal ambassador to the emperor in Constantinople, which Gregory would reluctantly accept. 6 years later, the desperate people of Rome then elected Gregory as pope, and he was their only hope. Gregory would first address the plague by organizing pilgrimages throughout the city to implore the help of the Blessed Mother. These prayers would be answered when reportedly Gregory had joined other people on the foot of Castel San Angelo, when he saw a vision of Saint Michael the Archangel sheathing his sword, which served as a sign that God had seen the people's affliction and that as a result of their devotion the plague would end. However, despite this, famine continued, and Gregory became known for his generosity, serving the people of Rome and caring for the poor by distributing the materials of the church to all people, even giving to noble families who were too embarrassed to beg for food but needed to due to their desperate situations. Gregory was also the first to send Christian missionaries to Britain after noticing the condition of British refugees in Rome. Saint Gregory passed away in 604 AD, and today he serves as the patron saint of England, epilepsy, musicians, and teachers. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, not to be confused with Saint Ignatius of Loyola, is one of the most important early church fathers, who was also a very early martyr who suffered persecution under the Roman Empire in the early days of the church. Although this is not confirmed by scripture, tradition says that Ignatius was one of the children who came to Jesus when he said, "Let the children come to me," in Matthew 19:14. After this, Ignatius grew up to be a pupil of Saint John, and eventually was named Bishop of Antioch by Saints Peter and Paul themselves. Ignatius lived through rampant Christian persecution under the Roman Empire Trajan, who persecuted Christians due to their refusal to worship the Roman gods. During his reign of terror, Ignatius would be arrested and, according to tradition, was cross-examined by Trajan himself and sentenced to death. However, despite this, Ignatius remained brave and asked that nobody intervene in his eventual martyrdom, seeing it as an honor to die for Christ. During his transport to Rome to be executed by being fed to lions, he and his captors would make many stops along the southern and western coasts of the Mediterranean Sea, in which Ignatius would address the growing Christian church in the area. Whenever the ship landed in a port, many Christians would flock over to hear his preaching and be blessed by him. The ship eventually arrived to Rome, and he was fed to the lions, with only his bones remaining. Even though he lived months in anticipation to his brutal death, he would write about himself in a letter to the church in Rome, saying, "I am God's wheat, and shall be grounded by the lion's teeth, so that I might become Christ's pure bread." These beautiful words represent his intense devotion to Christ, and they give a profound significance to his martyrdom. Today, Saint Ignatius of Antioch's feast day is celebrated on October 17th, and he serves as the patron saint of the church in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. Saint Titus, whom the letter of Saint Paul to Titus is named after, is a very powerful example of Christian conversion and one of the most important early church figures mentioned in the New Testament. Although not much is known about him, like many other early church figures, he was born a pagan and then converted to Christianity after meeting Saint Paul. Early in his life, Titus studied philosophy and the ancient poets, but at the age of 20 years old, he heard a voice in his dream that would tell him to leave Hellenistic wisdom and that nobody would save him besides God. However, just like everyone else that God appears to in a dream, Titus did not listen at first and continued living his pagan lifestyle. Eventually, however, about a year later, Saint Titus saw Jesus himself preaching in Jerusalem, and when he heard Jesus speak, he truly believed that Jesus was the Son of God. After witnessing the crucifixion of Christ, Titus became an early follower of Jesus and eventually became close friends with Saint Paul, becoming the Bishop of Crete in 65 AD. He brought the light of the faith to the surrounding regions of Crete. However, at the age of 97, he peacefully passed away, with people even claiming that his face glowed like the sun when he died. Today he serves as the patron saint of Crete and is an important example of Christian conversion and serves as one of the most influential early church figures in the New Testament. Saint John Chrysostom. You've probably heard of Saint John Chrysostom based on like Instagram edits that people see one time and then quote randomly when it comes to theological debates. But the real life of Saint John Chrysostom was much more interesting, and he had a very profound impact on the church as a whole. Born in 347 AD in Antioch, he became a Christian as he got older. He eventually developed a reputation as the golden-mouthed preacher because his words were like gold, which were full of God's light even when he was openly condemning people. In 397 AD, he became the Bishop of Constantinople and lived out the rest of his life serving God as a bishop. Unfortunately, when he passed away, his last words were, "Glory be to God for all things." He was officially canonized as a saint in 438 AD, and he's even recognized as a father of the church by many Orthodox communities to this day. Today, Saint John Chrysostom serves as the patron saint of public speakers, lecturers, and preachers. Saint John Chrysostom's wisdom and the way that it glorified God through his letters is a very powerful symbol of devotion to the Lord. Saint Monica is best known for being the mother of the absolute legend that was Saint Augustine of Hippo. Mothers serve a very powerful example in raising children and helping to guide their children up in the faith. And Saint Monica is probably the best example of this, besides Mary, of course. Originally marrying a pagan man named Patricius, would have 3 children together, of whom Augustine was one of. Although she did her best to bring her family to Christ, unfortunately her efforts were somewhat unsuccessful, as Augustine began to live a life of debauchery and paganism, finding meaning in everything else besides God. Saint Monica famously shed many tears for her son Augustine and prayed for him daily, as she was confident that God would lead her son back to the Lord, and eventually her prayers would be answered. Saint Augustine would write about Saint Monica within his Confessions. Her greatest joy in life was seeing Augustine be baptized, because that was something that she prayed tirelessly for years over, and eventually her prayers were answered. In 387 AD, Monica would pass away due to illness, but before her death, she told Augustine, "All of my hopes in this world are now fulfilled." To this day, Saint Monica serves as the patron saint of alcoholics, mothers, wives, and conversion. And honestly, I think she's the best example that praying for people and praying for their conversion sometimes can have amazing effects. Saint John Bosco is a very popular modern saint and a powerful example of how Christ can affect one's life. also known as Don Bosco. Bosco was born on August 16, 1815, in modern-day Castelnuovo. As a young child, he developed a powerful devotion to the Lord, wanting to dedicate his life to guiding the youth to God. He would repeat sermons that he had heard from his priests, tell his friends the stories he read, and lead his peers in the rosary. Born in a family that participated in a circus, he would host his own shows for free, but with a catch. Admission would only be granted to the circus if the attendees agreed to join him in the recitation of the rosary. As Bosco got older, he would be ordained as a priest, but his outreach to the youth did not end there. During his priesthood in Turin, Italy, many young men came to Turin looking for work, whether it was in the factories or in construction. Many of them were orphans, seasonal workers, and people with family issues. Bosco cared for these young men, and eventually founded the oratory of St. Francis de Sales. This was much more than a place of prayer, though. It would also be a place of employment, schooling, a home for many people, and a powerful brotherhood of young people. Every Sunday and feast day, Bosco would gather the youth together and celebrate Mass with them, hear confession, and preach in the way that was catered directly to them. As the mission grew, Bosco eventually established hospitals, night schools, trade schools, and would even help young men in search for jobs. Unfortunately, Bosco passed away on January 31st, 1888, from a severe fever, and he would be canonized in 1934 by Pope Pius XI, shortly after his beatification. His feast day is celebrated on January 31st, and he is the patron saint of boys, editors, educators, and the youth, and a very powerful example of how service to young people and having a childlike relationship with Jesus can make a real difference in the world. Alright guys, starting off layer 8, we have St. Josephine Bakhita. St. Josephine Bakhita is famous for being the first black woman to ever be canonized as a saint, and a very powerful example of how the Lord can bring someone out of a bad situation and into a new life with Christ. Josephine was born in 1869 in Sudan, but was sold into slavery at the age of 7 to Arabic slave traders. Throughout her time as a slave, she was given the nickname Bakhita, which is Arabic for fortunate one. However, in 1885, she eventually made her way to Italy, where she would become a babysitter, where she was drawn in by the Catholic Church, was baptized and confirmed in 1890, and eventually she took on the name Josephine to mark her conversion. In 1885, slavery was officially outlawed in Italy, but in 1890 she was finally set free, which allowed her to become a nun at the Institute of St. Magdalene of Canossa, where she made her first profession of faith and would later move to the city of Schio. She spent the rest of her life as a religious sister in intense devotion to God, and really serves as a powerful example of how bad situations are not the end, and God can even take a situation as terrible as slavery and make it into something beautiful. She eventually passed away on February 8th, 1947, and was canonized in the year 2000 by Pope John Paul II, and today she serves as the patron saint of victims of human trafficking. Saint Sebastian was a very early church martyr who, very similar to the other martyrs of his time, not much is known about. However, we do know that he was a high-ranking soldier in the Roman Empire, using his position in the military to protect believers under persecution, and even converting many Roman officers and soldiers himself. However, Saint Sebastian is most famous for his death, where he was tied to a tree and shot with arrows. However, despite being shot with a dozen arrows like Boromir, he survived, and even confronted the Emperor Diocletian himself and condemned him for his cruel actions against Christianity. Emperor Diocletian was, of course, furious with this, and Sebastian was then clubbed to death, where he finally, after a very long and tedious process, passed away. Saint Sebastian serves as the patron saint of athletes, archers, and soldiers, and serves as one of the most powerful examples of martyrdom within the early church. Saint Martin de Porres is famous, similar to Saint Josephine Bakhita, for being the first black saint to ever be canonized. Born in Peru in 1579, Martin was half African and half Spanish, which led to pretty intense discrimination from his peers. Despite his desire to serve in the religious life, he would not be allowed to, and would serve as the apprentice to a doctor and would eventually become a barber. However, despite all of this discrimination, Martin's dreams continued, and in 1603 he would eventually become a brother with the Dominican order. This was of course very challenging for him, since many racial stereotypes and even Peruvian law prevented this from being allowed. However, he worked with dignity and respect and was just happy to have the opportunity to be a brother in the first place. He received the nickname the Saint of the Broom because he often performed manual jobs for the monastery, specifically cleaning the rooms of his fellow brothers. However, his devotion to the Lord remained intense, with his brothers even witnessing him levitating while praying. He served the rest of his life in the monastery and gained somewhat of a reputation for someone with miraculous capabilities, with many legends even including bilocation, claiming that Martin could be in multiple places at once, even as far away as Japan. However, unfortunately, Martin de Porres passed away due to illness in 1639, and over 300 years later, in 1962, Pope John XXIII would canonize him, making him historically the first black man to ever be canonized. Today, St. Martin de Porres serves as the patron saint of racial harmony, mixed-race people, and social justice. justice, and serves as one of the most powerful examples of serving God even in the face of racial discrimination and adversity. Saint Philemon was an early Christian in the 1st century, best known for the letter to Philemon from St. Paul in the New Testament. Even though we do not know much about him, we know that he was a wealthy Christian who gave to the church, as well as being one of the original disciples of Christ. Most of what we know from him comes directly from the letter of Philemon, in which Philemon's runaway slave, a man named Onesimus, is afraid of returning to him due to fear of retribution from him. Paul then wrote to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus, asking him to forgive him for running away, and serving as a powerful lesson for having mercy on people who have wronged you. While much is unknown about the later life of Philemon, it is believed that he was stoned to death in 68 AD by an anti-Christian mob. Today, Philemon serves as the patron saint of actors and dancers, and a very powerful example of the importance of forgiveness. Saint Blaise was born in around 280 AD in Cappadocia. Not much is known about him, however, as a child he was raised Christian by his parents before becoming a physician. In a sudden conversion, however, he decided to become a priest and eventually served as the bishop of Sebaste in Armenia, where he ministered to the people both as a bishop and a physician. Famously, he would heal people with throat illnesses, placing candles across their throats and miraculously healing them. At one point, even miraculously healing a boy with a fish bone stuck in his throat. However, as the Roman Emperor Licinius began persecuting Christians, Blaise received a message from God to go out into the wilderness and become a hermit, which he did, even healing wild animals that came to him injured. But eventually he was found and captured by hunters and imprisoned by the governor of Cappadocia himself. Blaise obviously refused to renounce his faith and was tortured severely with the iron comb, which was a device that was used to shear sheep of their wool, which you can imagine how gruesome that was, and then beheaded in 316 AD. Although much of his life is largely unknown, and it is possible that some of it is fictional, the tradition of the blessing of the throats is still celebrated on his feast day, February 3rd each year, and he serves as the patron saint of wool, throat illnesses, and wild animals to this day. You know, we often hear about rags to riches stories about how lower class people climbed their way up the social ladder and ended up making a lot of money, but Elizabeth of Hungary is basically the opposite in the best possible way. Born into Hungarian nobility in 1207 to King Andrew II and Queen Gertrude of Presburg, from an early age her parents had given Elizabeth's hand in marriage to Louis, the son of Hermann I of Thuringen, Germany. Hermann had intense military and political power, and the marriage served as an agreement that was beneficial to both Hungary and Thuringen militaristically and politically. At the age of only 4 years old, Elizabeth would be sent to Germany to live with Hermann and his family in Wartburg Castle in Thuringen when Louis was 11. However, Hermann I passed away when Louis was 16 years old. When Louis was 21 and Elizabeth was 14 years old, the two married and had 3 children together. And funnily enough, this would actually be the beginning of Elizabeth's path to sainthood. As king, Louis constantly traveled on business, and during this time, rather than sitting alone in her castle, Elizabeth would go out into the streets and serve people, giving away everything to the poor and serving God intensely. She would feed people with supplies from the castle, pay debts, and provide clothing for those in need. She would even go out to those with leprosy and give them attention. One time, even bringing a leper into her house and letting him sleep on her husband's bed. And when Louis walked in, you'd think he'd be angry, but no, he saw Christ crucified lying on his bed, which is pretty insane. However, when famine hit the entire country of Germany, Wartburg Castle still had plenty of resources, and Elizabeth donated the grain that the castle had to the needy, which angered the other residents of the castle. She would even give away her valuable possessions, such as her jewels and royal garments, and use the money to help feed the poor. Elizabeth was intensely devoted to the Lord, even asking her own servant to wake her up in the middle of the night and whip her as a form of mortification, which is pretty intense. One eyewitness testimony says that while she was praying, she caught on fire but remained completely unfazed. When one of her servants eventually put out the flame, she acted as though nothing had happened. Unfortunately, however, in 1127, tragedy struck when her husband Louis fell ill and died while preparing for the Sixth Crusade, which led Elizabeth to make a vow of chastity to the Lord. Louis's brother Henry prevented Elizabeth from helping the poor, which would eventually lead her to move out of Wartburg Castle. It wouldn't prevent her from serving God though, as she joined the Third Order of the Franciscans to help her live an even more penitent and impoverished lifestyle. Elizabeth would spend the rest of her days serving the sick and would die of poor health on November 17, 1231, at the young age of 24 years old. She would then be canonized by Pope Gregory IX on May 28, 1235, and she serves as the patron saint of patients, widows, the homeless, and people who are in exile. Saint Cyprian of Carthage was likely born in around 200 AD in North Africa. Raised as a pagan, he was originally wealthy and worked as a teacher of rhetoric before converting to Christianity around 246 AD. Soon after this, he became the Bishop of Carthage and served as one of the most important Christian leaders in the Western Roman Empire. Cyprian lived during major Roman persecutions, specifically under Emperor Decius and later the Roman Emperor Valerian, who, if you've been watching this Iceberg, you know about. He wrote extensively about loving your enemy, and when a plague hit Carthage, Cyprian said that Christians should help everyone, emphasizing the importance of kindness and serving even your enemy. Eventually, Cyprian was arrested by Emperor Valerian and beheaded on September 14th, 258 AD. Today, he serves as the patron saint of North Africa, Algeria, and all bishops, and his legacy as an important early church father and martyr makes him one of the most important Catholic saints to this day. St. Lawrence was an early church martyr who, while being burned alive, said, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side," which, you know, that is one of the lines of all time, I gotta say. Lawrence was likely born in 225 AD in Spain, and just like everyone else who was born during this time, much of his early life is unknown. However, it is believed that he studied at Zaragoza, where he met future Pope Sixtus II, and eventually he would serve as one of the 7 deacons of Rome under Pope Sixtus II. Known for his wit and sense of humor, he served his role as deacon diligently. But when Emperor Valerian began persecuting Christians, he was forced by Valerian to hand over all of the treasures of the church. In response to this, Lawrence brought Valerian the poor and the sick. And when Valerian rightfully asked why he did this, because he was told to bring the treasures of Rome, Lawrence said that the poor and the sick were the true treasures of Rome, which that is really funny. Valerian was obviously not amused by this and ordered Lawrence to be burned alive, where the now famous line comes from, "Turn me over on this side." However, despite all of his humor, Lawrence had a deep love and affection for the poor that really reflected Jesus' life in the best way possible. And to this day, he serves as the patron saint of comedians and chefs, which is hilarious, I have to admit. Saint John of the Cross was a Spanish Catholic priest who is known as the patron saint of poets because of his famous poem, The Dark Night of the Soul, characterized by its feelings of abandonment and its honest representation of spiritual and psychological crisis. Born to a very poor family in 1542, he experienced the death of his father and his brother very early in life, living with only his mother. He developed a devotion to Christ very young, and in 1567, St. John of the Cross would become a priest and a major figure of the Counter-Reformation within Spain. His writings, such as The Dark Night of the Soul, made him very influential within the church. However, at the age of 49, he unfortunately passed away and was canonized as a saint in 1726. Was eventually recognized as a doctor of the church. St. John of the Cross's life and writings were very influential into the church, and he serves as a powerful example of dealing honestly with the feelings of abandonment and psychological crisis. St. Basil the Great was born in Caesarea, Cappadocia in 329 AD to a very holy family, with actually a lot of his family being saints, including his mother, his grandmother, and some of his siblings, who included St. Gregory of Nyssa. Considering the fact that most of his family was saints, it was only natural for him to live as one as well. And don't worry, we will get to some of them later down on the iceberg. Stay tuned. Basil would study philosophy in Constantinople and eventually in Athens, where he would meet his good friend Saint Gregory the theologian, who is not the same as Gregory the Great or Gregory of Nyssa. Basil would then pursue the ascetic life through the influence of his sister Macrina and abandon his worldly life. He would travel through West Asia, visiting monks in Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia, would eventually return to Caesarea and depart for his hermitage on the Iris River in Pontus, in which his mother and sister already resided. Eventually, in 370, Basil would become Bishop of Caesarea. He would serve as one of the many church fathers who lived during the time when Arianism was a widespread heresy, which would lead to much controversy for him, as his opinions against Arianism were very controversial at the time. Eventually, the emperor at the time decided to banish Basil, but his pen would break 3 times while he was writing it, and he just got so angry that he gave up. Basil would continue to live out the rest of his life serving the Lord, but would eventually pass away in 379 AD. Today he serves as the patron saint of Russia, Cappadocia, which is now modern-day Turkey, hospitals, church reformers, and monks. Saint Cyril of Alexandria. Saint Cyril of Alexandria's life is very unknown, just like the rest of the saints on this list pretty much. It's kind of a trend that I'm noticing, but he was likely born in around 378 AD in Alexandria, Egypt. An important figure in his life would be his uncle, who was the Patriarch of Alexandria at the time. Cyril had a strong education, studying Greek and Latin, was trained in biblical studies, rhetoric, and grammar. His knowledge of Latin would be of great benefit to him, as it allowed him to access St. Jerome's commentaries. He would then spend 5 years studying the Desert Fathers such as Macarius, Seraphim, and Isidore, who we will get to later, I promise. After completion of his studies, he would be a disciple of his uncle, who was the patriarch Theophilus, and in 403 AD, his uncle would ordain him as a reader in the Church of Alexandria, which would begin Cyril's formal ministry. He then became the 24th patriarch of Alexandria on October 17, 412 AD, after his uncle's departure. He would deal with many heresies and controversies during this time. He would also be instrumental in the fight against Nestorianism. However, he eventually passed away in 444 AD, and today he serves as the patron saint of theologians, bishops, and the city of Alexandria. Saint Andrew Kim Taegon is the first saint to come out of Korea and was a key figure in spreading Catholicism to the Korean people, being the first Korean-born priest in all of history. Born into Korea's ruling class on August 21st, 1821, his parents decided to convert to Christianity, which was extremely dangerous at the time. If it was discovered that they had converted, due to the strict Confucian rules that were in place, his father and his mother would have been martyred for their faith. After being baptized in secret at the age of 15, Andrew would travel to seminary in the Portuguese colony of Macau and would travel throughout the Philippines, going to Lolomboy, Bakawe, and Bulacan. He was then ordained in Shanghai in 1844 and would then return to Korea to evangelize. He spent his time in Korea evangelizing the gospel, which, as I said earlier, was highly legal at the time. In 1846, he and many other Catholics would be arrested and executed for their efforts in spreading the gospel. He was eventually beheaded by the Korean government, and he was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1984, where he, along with his companions, are celebrated on September 20th. Saint Andrew Kim Taegon is the patron saint of Korea and one of the most important saints to come out of Asia. Saint Gianna Beretta Molla is the patron saint of mothers, physicians, and unborn children. Gianna was born in Magenta, Italy on October 4th, 1922. She was actually the 10th of 13 children, and she grew up surrounded by devout Catholics, with many priests in her extended and immediate family. However, in 1942, despite poor health, Gianna began her studies in Milan, where she received her medical diploma, and in 1950, she opened an office specializing in pediatrics in Massaro, close to her hometown. Gianna's brother, Father Giuseppe, was in charge of a mission in Brazil, and Gianna hoped to travel there to help him, where she could offer gynecological services to women, but unfortunately, due to her chronic health issues, this was not possible. Instead, she continued her medical and pediatric practice at the University of Milan. In December of 1945, she met Pietro Molla, and the two would fall in love. They married in 1946 and shared a very passionate marriage, writing about each other in their gratitude journals. The couple had 4 children together, 3 of whom are actually still alive today. But during the second month of Gianna's 4th pregnancy, she developed a fibroma on her uterus. The doctors gave her the choice of an abortion, a hysterectomy, or the removal of the fibroma. Essentially, the decision came down to choosing between her own life or the life of her child. Gianna, wanting to preserve her child's life, chose the third option. She told the doctor that her child's life was far more important than her own, and in 1962, her child Gianna Emanuela was successfully delivered via C-section, but Gianna continued to have severe pain after her birth and died soon afterwards. Since her mother's death, Gianna Emanuela, who is now a geriatric doctor, has spread her mother's story throughout the world, and she was canonized in 2004 by Pope John Paul II. Funnily enough, this is actually the first time in history where a saint's husband and children attended her canonization. In a world that deals with a lot of issues with the pro-life movement and abortion, and a culture that struggles to recognize the sanctity of life, Saint Gianna Molla is a powerful example of choosing life and the power and outcomes that can have on the lives of your children and the church as a whole. Saint Katari Tekakwitha was the very first Native American saint to be canonized, as well as a very powerful example of living out the faith in the face of adversity. Born in New York in 1656, near the Mohawk village of Ascendanon, the city was occupied by French Jesuit missionaries throughout her childhood, and due to a peace treaty between the Mohawk tribe and the French government, the missionaries were protected by law and could not be harmed. This is due to a few years prior in 1642, when 2 early Jesuit missionaries, who are also saints by the way, were enslaved and then killed by the Mohawk tribe, leading to a tense relationship between the two, to put it lightly. When Kateri was only 4 years old, however, her entire family became ill with smallpox, leading to the death of her mother and brother. Katari survived, but had massive scars on her face and impaired eyesight due to it. Because of this, she was taken in by her uncle, who was the Mohawk chief of the Turtle Clan. Although Katari's mother had been baptized as a Catholic, her uncle was very hostile to the idea of Christianity. However, at 11 years old, she encountered Jesuit missionaries who greatly impressed her and her family, and much of the tribe became softened to the idea of Christianity. At 19, Kateri refused the tribe's propositions to marry. Instead, instead converting to Catholicism and taking a vow of chastity, which was a very unpopular decision among the tribe, to put it lightly. The other members of the Turtle clan accused her of sorcery, and to avoid persecution, she fled to nearby Montreal to a Christian native community and began to live as a Christian. Inspired by her Mohawk tribal beliefs, she began to incorporate it into Christian mortification, burning herself and even sleeping on thorns with the intentions of converting the entire Mohawk people to Christianity. Even though she constantly had poor health, she continued with this practice of mortification until her death at the young age of 24 in 1680. Her last words, according to a Jesuit missionary, were, "Jesus and Mary, I love you." Her life was an incredible example of conversion, and even after her death became a popular pilgrimage site for other native Christians. She was canonized by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012 and serves as the patron saint of ecology, the environment, and Native Americans. Saint Pier Giorgio Frassati is one of the most recently canonized saints, being canonized by Pope Leo XIV on September 7th, 2025, alongside Saint Carlo Acutis. Pier was raised in Turin, Italy, the same place where Saint John Bosco is from. Pier would follow Christ from a young age all the way until his young adulthood, being involved in many lay groups such as Catholic Action, the Apostleship of Prayer, the Society of Saint Vincent de Paul, the Young Christian Worker Movement, and even being a professed member of the Third Order of Saint Dominic. His overt kindness to the poor would be a light in the darkness. There was the rising individualism and fascism of Italy at the time. Pier was also a strong athlete and mountaineer, often reflecting on God's creation during his journeys outdoors. He would spend a lot of time in Eucharistic adoration, just as much as he spent time helping the less fortunate members of society. However, his service to the poor would cost him, and he would contract polio from a person that he was helping. Within only a few short days, it would incapacitate him, and he eventually passed away on July 4th, 1925 at the young age of 24 years old. His funeral turnout would shock many people, as it wasn't just the rich elites of Italy that showed up, but almost everyone in the town, and the less fortunate that Pier had helped. Pier shows that holiness doesn't need to be shown to the whole world, but rather it simply needs to be done. Saint Pier Giorgio Frassati is the patron saint of youth groups and young adults, and Pope John Paul II himself declared him as the patron for the celebration of World Youth Day when he was beatified. Saint Damien of Molokai. Saint Damien of Molokai is an extremely powerful story of someone going to the ends of the earth to serve Christ, and it's one of the best examples of this in my opinion. Saint Damien of Molokai has even become somewhat of a folk story in two countries on opposite sides of the world. In Belgium, where he was born in 1840, and also where he was voted to be the greatest Belgian of all time by a nationwide poll in 2005, and in the Kingdom of Hawaii, where he died in 1889, and where a massive statue of him still stands guard outside the State House. Damien was a missionary priest who volunteered to minister to a lepers colony established by the King of Hawaii. Even though he knew fully that he would contract leprosy and likely die, he decided to do it anyway, just as Jesus had served the lepers. He felt like he could do the same thing. And unfortunately, this is actually precisely what ended up happening. Damien helped to build reservoirs to make agriculture in the colony possible, dug graveyards to bury the dead, and received an almost global following from people such as the Hawaiian King to Gandhi himself. Famous author Robert Louis Stevenson, known for his very influential novels such as Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, learned about Damien while visiting Hawaii. Stevenson became fascinated by the tales of Father Damien and traveled to Molokai himself to learn more about it. When a jealous American Presbyterian missionary who was unironically named Mr. Hyde published an article attacking Father Damien after his death, calling him a coarse, dirty man who was preoccupied with the Catholic idea of meriting eternal life. Although a Presbyterian himself, Stevenson wrote a whole 10-page open letter in which he predicted that in a century Damien would be named a saint, and that Hyde would only ever be remembered as a jealous devil's advocate. However, unfortunately, Stevenson was wrong about the debate. It actually took until 2009 for Saint Damien to be canonized by Pope Francis. However, he was spot on about Damien's selfless service and that his kindness to the Hawaiian lepers of Molokai would never be forgotten. Saint Catherine Drexel was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on November 26, 1858. She was born into a very wealthy family, with her father, Francis Anthony Drexel, being a reputable banker and philanthropist. However, despite their wealth, from an early age, the family would instill in Catherine and her sister that wealth was something loaned to them, and that it was ultimately to be shared with others. When her family took a trip to the western United States, Catherine would see a different world, witnessing the maltreatment of the Native Americans in the area. This would inspire her to finance missions, and missionaries throughout the U.S. help the people that she saw as oppressed. She would eventually establish her first school, St. Catherine's Indian School in Santa Fe, New Mexico. One day when she visited Pope Leo XIII, she would request missionaries to support the native missions that she was financially supporting. The Pope would give her a great suggestion though: become a missionary herself. After consulting her spiritual director, she would become a missionary and give herself to God fully, dedicating her life to Native Americans in the Black community. In 1891, she professed her vows as a religious sister, founding the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, which was dedicated to the mission of spreading the Gospels and the Eucharist to Black and Native Americans. Catherine would be a strong advocate for justice of the Black community, seeing the conditions of sharecropping, institutional racism, unpaid labor, and the denial of constitutional rights. As a result, she founded and staffed many schools that prioritized the education of Black Americans, opening nearly 60 schools in the west and southwestern parts of the United States in particular. Her activism influenced her prayer life as well, and her dependence on divine providence. Her work eventually led the Catholic Church in America itself to officially establish an apostolate for Native and Black Americans. She never hesitated to advocate for the marginalized and take a stance on racial discrimination. However, unfortunately, the last 18 years of her life would be spent immobile due to serious degrees. During those years, she would spend it in adoration and contemplation of the Lord. Catherine Drexel passed away at the age of 96 on March 3rd, 1955, and was canonized in 2000 by Pope John Paul II as the patron saint of both racial justice and philanthropy. Saint Peregrine was born Peregrine Lazzoli in 1260 in the town of Forlì, Italy. Born into a very rich family as an only child, he wasn't already raised Catholic, but during his adolescence, a conflict broke out in northern Italy due to a dispute over the papacy and the authority that it had in the politics of Italy. Peregrine's family was part of the anti-papal side, and Peregrine would serve as a participant in the faction as a young adult. His conversion would happen though when Pope Martin IV would enact a verdict which would close churches in an attempt to bring people back into communion with the Pope, which would make the situation only more heated. When the Pope saw that this didn't work, he sent an ambassador, Saint Benizi, to bring the rebels back into obedience. One day, when Benizi was addressing a crowd, Benizi was attacked by a mob, who heckled him, beat him, and stoned him. Peregrine was actually one of the people who killed him, and that's when he knew that he had messed up. Peregrine would beg Benizi for his forgiveness, in which he would forgive Peregrine without a single hesitation. This would result in Peregrine converting to Catholicism and joining the Servite order that Benizi had founded. This would later lead to Peregrine being ordained in the priesthood. From there, he would spend many years devoted to serving the poor and the sick. He would also gain a reputation known as the Angel of Good Counsel, due to the good advice he would provide to those who sought it. As a simple act of penance, he spent his life standing, whenever it wasn't absolutely necessary for him to sit. This sounds simple enough, but it would cause him to develop varicose veins in his legs after years of doing it. This caused his legs to become ulcerated, gangrenous, and even malignant, and he was left with a difficult decision of keeping his malignant legs or having them amputated. Either way, it would lead to death. So he went to God to lay his worries out and asked him for help. He fell asleep and had a dream that Jesus came down and healed his leg, and when he woke up, his leg was miraculously healed. Peregrine would continue to serve the less fortunate, but would eventually pass away from a fever in 1345 at the age of 85 years old. He would be canonized by Pope Benedict XIII in 1726, and he serves as the patron saint of those suffering from cancer, AIDS, and other malignant diseases. If there's one saint who has ever devoted to the Virgin Mary more than anyone else, it's probably Saint Louis de Montfort. The creator of the popular devotion of total consecration to Jesus Christ through Mary, he has helped thousands of people grow closer to Christ through his mother. Born in 1673 in the tiny village of Montfort, France, at the age of 27 years old, he was ordained as a diocesan priest. He traveled throughout France preaching to local churches about the importance of devotion to Mary and the importance of the daily Eucharist, which was not common back then. De Montfort also went on to establish many orders and monasteries, including the Daughters of Wisdom and the Missionaries of the Company of Mary. After spending years preaching and spreading himself somewhat thin, de Montfort unfortunately passed away at the age of only 43 years old in 1716. After his death, an early manuscript of his writings were found, which would later go on to become his famous book, True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. His unique and intense devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary made him a very popular saint, and de Montfort was canonized in 1947 by Pope Pius XII. Ultimately, de Montfort's consecration to Mary has become a very popular devotion. I've done it myself on Hallow, which, this is not sponsored by, but if anyone from Hallow is watching and wants to sponsor me, just saying. Today, de Montfort serves as the patron saint of preachers and devotion to the Virgin Mary, and serves as one of the most powerful examples of devotion to Christ through his mother. Saint Helen is best known for being the mother of Constantine the Great. Yes, that Constantine, the man who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and also for finding the very cross that Jesus Christ was crucified on. She was likely born in the 3rd century in the city of Drianum in Asia Minor, where she would be married to Constantius Chlorus and would give birth to Constantine, although eventually Constantius would divorce her for a woman of higher nobility, and her son was taken from her as well. But fortunately, when her ex-husband passed away and Constantine was made emperor, he would recall her and grant her the honorary title of Augusta, essentially making her the Empress of Rome. The new wealth and power she had gained would be the beginning in her service to Christianity, and she would help build many churches throughout the empire. She was known for her selflessness and generosity, giving to the church, prisoners, and the poor. And in 324 AD, Constantine had a desire to find the true cross. This would cause Helen to embark on a journey at the age of 80 to find the cross that Christ was crucified on. This would lead her to the Holy Land, and that's when she learned about the true cross that was buried under the Temple of Venus. Helen would promptly have it demolished, and that's when the tomb of Christ was uncovered. She would find 3 crosses, and she determined which one belonged to Jesus when they were taken to a woman who had been struck blind with an incurable disease. Whenever the woman touched the cross of Jesus, she was miraculously healed, and that's when it was declared to be the true cross that Christ was crucified on. She would then give the cross to the Patriarch of Jerusalem and would take the wood and the nails to Constantinople. She would continue building over 80 churches after this. However, unfortunately, she died of old age in 327 AD and serves as the patron saint of difficult marriages, divorced people, convents, and archaeologists. Saint Alphonsus Liguori. So you may have heard the expression that if at first you don't succeed, try again, but Saint Alphonsus Liguori took a slightly different approach with it. If at first you don't succeed, sell everything you own and then start a new religious order. Born in Naples in 1696, Saint Alphonsus went to school to become a lawyer. Although initially he did well, the very first time he lost a case, he took it as a sign from God that he had chosen the wrong profession, and he decided to become a priest. In 1732, he founded the Redemptionists, a religious order dedicated to serving the poor and missionary work. He suffered deeply from scrupulosity, which helped him become one of the more sympathetic counselors. He argued that penitence and confession were souls to be saved, not criminals to be punished. And because of this, he is now known as the patron saint of confession and was declared a doctor of the church due to his writings about the sacrament of confession. When not writing theology, Liguori spent his time teaching, painting, writing poetry, composing hymns, and mastering the zamponga, which is basically Italian bagpipes. Overall, he's a very powerful example of how devotion to the sacrament of confession can bring a lot of good in people's lives, and he's a very interesting saint to look into. Saint Felix of Nola was a very important early Christian priest and confessor, best known for suffering during the Roman persecution and serving as a powerful example of courage, humility, and loyalty to the church. Born sometime in the 3rd century in Nola, Italy, Felix was raised in a Christian family, and after his father's death, he gave away much of his inheritance to the poor and dedicated his life to God. He was ordained as a priest and served under Saint Maximus, the bishop of Nola, during a time when Christians were being hunted down by Roman authority. When the persecution broke out, Maximus fled into hiding, and Felix was arrested, imprisoned, and tortured for refusing to abandon the faith. According to tradition, he was miraculously freed from prison by an angel and went to rescue Maximus, who was starving and freezing in the wilderness. Although Felix survived the persecution and was not technically killed as a martyr, he suffered so much for Christ that he was honored like one by the early church. He later refused to become bishop and chose to live in poverty and service until he passed away in around 250 AD. Saint Felix of Nola served as a strong witness that holiness does not always require dying for the faith, but being willing to suffer everything for Christ. We are all called to lay down our lives to Christ, but sometimes that's not a physical death. Sometimes that's living out every day of our lives in service of him. Today, Saint Felix is remembered as the patron saint of Nola, lost animals, and protection against false witnesses. Saint Dympha was born into Irish royalty in the 7th century. From the beginning, her life was filled with tribulation, as her mother had secretly baptized her due to her husband's pagan beliefs. When Dympha was only 14 years old, her mother had died, which led to her father going mad in a state of grief and even proposing to marry Dympha due to her looking like her mother, which, obviously Dympha rejected due to her request to remain a virgin, and also, why on earth would you marry your own father? That is so weird on so many levels. This would cause her father to be outraged, and she would flee Ireland with her priest, Father Ginebron, to a small town in Belgium. Dympha would then spend her time and wealth there, serving the sick and the poor in the area. Eventually, her father would discover where she was and would sail to Belgium in the hope of her returning to him. When he arrived, he attempted once again to convince Dympha to marry him with promises of wealth and esteem, but of course she didn't change her mind, and she held to her vow of virginity, rightfully so. His father in anger would order his soldiers to kill Father Ginebron, and then he himself beheaded Dympha at the age of 15 years old, which is absolutely brutal. The fact that her own father, when she refused to marry him, beheaded his own daughter, that is just insane. Dympho was canonized in 1247 and serves as a patron saint of mental health due to the great anguish that her father caused her. Saint Philomena is one of the most mysterious saints of all time due to basically nothing being known about her life. She is best known for being the only saint in the church to be canonized solely due to her intercession because there isn't much known about her early life, except for the name and the date of her martyrdom. Her corpse was discovered in a tomb on May 25, 1802, in the ancient catacombs of St. Priscilla in Rome. The tomb would be inscribed with a confusing set of words, which essentially translated to "Peace be with you, Philomena" in English. Also inscribed would be indicators of her virginity and martyrdom, which gave evidence to suggest that she was a virgin and a martyr during her lifetime. When the coffin was opened, it was revealed that she was about 14 years old when she died, and a vial of dried blood was found alongside her. Her remains were then donated in 1805 to Don Francesco de Lucia. When people prayed to this saint who they knew nothing about, all sorts of prayers would be answered, and she would earn the title of Philomena, powerful with God. And many great saints and popes would show devotion to Saint Philomena, such as Francis Xavier and Saint John Vianney, who we will get to later, I promise. And in 1837, she would be canonized by Pope Gregory XVI, and today she serves as the patron saint of hopeless and impossible cases. This is a very, very interesting one, because even though nothing is known about her life, the discovery of her tomb was enough for her to be considered a saint, due purely to the power of intercession and of prayer, and it is the perfect place to end layer 9. Saint Lucy, also known to many as Santa Lucia, is a popular yet mysterious early church martyr whose incredible life has been an inspiration for generations, even being included in the prayer of consecration at every Catholic Mass. However, like many other early church martyrs at the time, Lucy's life is almost entirely based on later accounts and legends, so it's difficult to know the true details about her life. However, she was believed to be born in around 283 AD in Syracuse to a Greek mother and a Roman father. However, after her father died, she converted to Christianity at a very young age. About 40 years before her birth, Saint Agatha, who we will talk about later on this iceberg, was martyred in the city of Syracuse. As a teenager, Lucy's mother fell ill, and Lucy persuaded her mother to travel to Saint Agatha's tomb together in hopes of curing her mother's painful hemorrhages. While at the tomb, Lucy had a vision of Saint Agatha, who promised Lucy that her mother would be cured and told her that she would become the glory of Syracuse. After this, Lucy's mother agreed to her wish to remain a virgin dedicated to God and to use their wealth for charity. However, as a child, Lucy's mother had arranged a betrothal to a pagan nobleman, and when he found out that she and her mother had given away her dowry and were breaking off the engagement, she reported her to Roman officials, exposing her as a Christian, which at the time, as you probably realize, was very much against the law. Lucy refused to renounce her faith, which led the Romans to attempt to punish her by sending her to a brothel, but she could not be moved, even with an oxen's yoke. They attempted to burn her as well, but again she was protected. And finally, after many attempts by Roman officials, she was finally martyred by a sword through the neck. And to be completely honest, at this point, the similarities and legendary aspects of her story, especially to the story of Saint Agnes, become clear. Another story says that Lucy gouged her own eyes out before the Emperor Diocletian. However, they miraculously grew back, signaling her patronage as the patron saint of light. There are a variety of stories about how this actually happened, with some tales saying that it was a form of punishment enacted onto her by her guards during her persecution, and others say that she gouged them out herself and offered them to her suitor to discourage him from getting engaged to her. However, it is usually agreed that when she died, she was 21 years old, and the purity of her faith and the radiance of her heart distinguish her among the many martyrs of this time, and lend thoughtful consideration to the fact that, as the old adage goes, maybe the eyes truly are the window to the soul. To this day, she is venerated throughout Europe. Perhaps you've heard the song Santa Lucia, and her legendary life, even if largely mysterious, continues to inspire thousands of people to this day. St. Lucy is a very powerful example of early church martyrdom, and today she serves as the patron saint of the blind. Saint Jose Maria Escrivo is a very popular and powerful modern saint who dedicated his life to teaching that all people are called to holiness and that they can encounter God through their ordinary life and work. Born in 1902 in the small town of Barbastro, Spain, he felt a call to greatness from a young age, which led him to study as a priest. In 1925, he was ordained, and in 1928, he experienced a vision from the the Lord, leading him to found the religious order of Opus Dei. Opus Dei served as an apostolate of Catholics dedicated to serving God as ordinary people, where members would meet monthly, practice simple acts of mortification in their day-to-day lives, and strive to see God in everything. While this organization was somewhat controversial and even accused of being a secret society by many conspiracy theorists, which was largely due to Jose Maria Escriva's anti-communist tendencies, Opus Dei continues to serve as a very popular ministry to this day. Escriva was also very extensive in his writings, known for his practical advice on how to live as a Christian in the day-to-day struggle of the modern world, publishing popular titles such as The Way, The Furrow, and The Forge, which are a series of short affirmations of daily practical advice. In 1946, Escriva moved to Rome, and he spent the rest of his life dedicated to spreading Opus Dei across the world, establishing multiple universities and consulting in Vatican commissions, with his writings even directly contributing to the Second Vatican Council, influencing the doctrine of the Eucharist and how to live as a Christian in the modern world. However, Jose Maria Escriva unfortunately passed away from a diabetic heart attack while staring at a picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe in 1975 at the age of 73 years old, and was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 2002. Today, Saint Jose Maria Escriva serves as the patron saint of Opus Dei and those suffering from diabetes. Saint Cosmas and Damian. So if you're a Catholic and you regularly attend Mass, you've probably heard these names before. During the prayer of consecration, when the priest invokes the names of the saints, after the Eucharist is turned from bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. That is if you pay attention during Mass. Much like many other saints at the time, much of their lives are unknown, but it is believed that Cosmas and Damian were twin brothers born in the 3rd century in Asia Minor. However, they lived most of their lives in what is now modern-day Turkey. Sources vary on whether their father was a Christian or a pagan. However, it is believed that he passed away when the twins were young, and their mother, who was a devout Christian, raised them in the faith. As the two became older, they would study to become doctors, which they were exceptionally talented at, with many viewing their talents as a gift from God himself. Even though they healed hundreds of people, they never charged for their services, and this would result in them being known as anargaroi, which means without silver. They would continue providing these services with a devout love for God and neighbor, healing people with their prayers and God-given talents. There's even a legend that they were the first to successfully transplant a leg to an amputee. However, just like the other saints of the time, the exact details of their death are hard to trace. Some accounts claim that they were martyred, while some claim that they died natural deaths. The martyrdom story goes as follows. Roman Emperor Diocletian, in around the year 287, would sign an edict, leading to an empire-wide series of persecutions to Christians throughout the area. Cosmas and Damian would be included due to their great prominence as doctors and their ability to spread the gospel. They would be captured and forced to renounce their faith, which of course they refused. After many attempts to execute them, including drowning, burning, arrows, and stoning, they would be beheaded. However, the non-martyrdom account goes like this. Cosmas would pass away before Damian, and Cosmas would request Damian not to be buried with him due to an event in which Damian would heal a horribly ill woman. After he healed the woman, he would present 3 eggs to Damian, saying, "Take this gift in the name of the holy life-creating Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." Damian would accept these eggs after hearing the name of the Holy Trinity, and Cosmas would be upset due to thinking that his own brother had broken their strict vow of not accepting anything for their services. Eventually, Damian would die, and the people would be confused on where to bury him due to Cosmas's request. Miraculously, a camel that the saints had treated would appear to the people and spoke in a human voice, telling them that they shouldn't doubt to bury them together. And finally, they would be buried together, as they are today, where they serve as the patron saints of physicians, apothecaries, surgeons, and almost all medical-related professions. St. Thomas Becket, also known as St. Thomas of Canterbury, is a very important medieval saint whose courage in the face of political persecution by the English monarchy serves as a powerful example of Christian martyrdom. Born in 1119 in London to a wealthy textile merchant, he began his education at a young age and eventually gained a reputation as a bright student, allowing him to serve as an assistant to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas was ordained as a priest, and shortly afterwards became well known for his insight and clear judgment, even gaining the respect of King Stephen himself. However, when King Stephen died and King Henry II came to power, Thomas became chancellor and the two became quite close friends. In a very similar way to Henry VIII and Thomas More, who we mentioned earlier on this Iceberg, he served under the king diligently and became an extremely important political figure within the English monarchy. In 1162, Thomas Becket was ordained as the Archbishop of Canterbury, presiding over the entire church in England, but many conflicts began to arise between Henry and Thomas, and the line between the authority of the church and the authority of the state was beginning to blur. Henry II often forced Becket to accept bribes and to condemn prisoners wrongly. In response to this, Becket called for a council of bishops within England, and Henry saw this as an attack to his authority. Thomas fled to France, and the King of France as well as the Pope were then dragged into the conflict. Eventually, an agreement was made that allowed Becket to return to England in 1170, but upon his return to England, he was forced to pledge his allegiance to the king. When he refused, he was dragged away by knights, but with almost supernatural strength, Thomas couldn't be moved. One of the knights struck him in the head with his sword, and Thomas uttered his last words, "Lord, into your hands I commend your spirit," which of course are the same last words that Jesus Christ himself muttered. Thomas Becket was then canonized in 1173 by Pope Alexander III, only 3 years after his death, and today he serves as the patron saint of diocesan priests. Saint Aloysius Gonzaga was a very famous Jesuit missionary. Aloysius was born into a very wealthy Italian family in 1568, and he would be set up for success as the firstborn son of his father, Ferrante, who possessed the title of Marquis at the time, with Aloysius being next in line to inherit it. In 1576, Aloysius's parents would send him to Tuscany to serve in the court of the Grand Duke Francesco I de' Medici. He would then travel to Spain with his parents to join the court of Philip II in Madrid, and the time that he spent in Spain would inspire Aloysius to join the Jesuit order, which had recently been founded. His decision to join the order, however, would be met with friction from his father, who wanted Aloysius to inherit his wealth. However, Aloysius would renounce his right to the title of Marquis and the life of wealth that awaited him, becoming a Jesuit missionary in 1585, entering the convent and professing his vows in 1587. However, tragedy would strike, as in 1591 a plague hit Rome. St. Aloysius Gonzaga would volunteer to serve at the Jesuit hospital, where he and many other Jesuit missionaries would directly administer aid to the infected. Unfortunately, he would contract the plague as well. He would eventually pass away on June 21st, 1591, at the young age of only 23 years old. He was then canonized by Pope Benedict XIII in 1726, and today he serves as the patron saint of youth, students, AIDS patients, and caregivers, as well as a very powerful example of missionary work and how it can greatly affect people's lives. Saint Jean Vianney was born in 1786 in a small town near Lyon, France, growing up during the height of the French Revolution. His childhood was largely filled with uncertainty and chaos, but his family remained firmly rooted in their faith. From a young age, John had a desire to become a priest. However, due to his lack of formal schooling, he struggled greatly in seminary and had to work with a private tutor to complete his studies and gain approval of his bishop. However, after many years of constant struggle with his schoolwork, he was finally ordained as a priest and sent to the small town of Ars, France, to serve as a pastor to the local parish there. He faced intense indifference from the population and often struggled to deliver homilies that the congregation actually cared about. Despite this, however, he fasted intensely and prayed deeply. He spent almost all of his waking hours in the confessional and guided the people of his parish with practical advice and words of affirmation. He was renowned for his ability to read souls, and people would come from all across Europe to go to confession with him. As a priest, he would also establish La Providence, an orphanage for girls, and would become known as the Curé de Ars for his incredible contributions to the community. As his fame grew, however, his health began to decline. He continued to serve diligently despite this. However, on August 4th, 1859, he basically passed away from exhaustion. He was canonized in 1925 by Pope Pius XI, and today he serves as the patron saint of parish priests due to his incredible devotion to the Lord and to his people. Saint André Bessette, also known as Saint André of Montreal, was born in 1845 in a small town outside of Montreal, Canada. As a young child, he struggled greatly with chronic illness. However, at the age of 12, he was left orphaned by his 9 siblings. He was then sent to his relatives, the Nadeau family, and began lessons with the parish priest. During these lessons, he developed an intense devotion to Jesus, but also to Saint Joseph. Having difficulty in school due to his troubled upbringing, André tried many different professions as a teenager, from farming to blacksmithing and even baking, but due to his poor health, he was unable to stay employed for very long. But his devotion to the Lord remained incredibly strong despite this. At the age of 25, his pastor would be impressed by his devotion, and he applied André to the Congregation of the Holy Cross in Montreal. Initially, he had not been accepted by the bishop due to his health, but he was finally allowed into the community, doing menial tasks such as a doorkeeper and a laundry worker. However, his devotion to Saint Joseph and his passion for helping the sick remained strong. When a disease began to spread at a nearby university, André volunteered to serve the sick, anointing their foreheads with oil and praying over them. Despite the severity of the illness, not one person that he tended to died. When asked how he did it, he attributed it to the power of Saint Joseph. He began to build a reputation as a miracle healer, receiving over over 80,000 letters a year. He spent the rest of his life caring for the people who came to him in a small chapel in the monastery until he passed away at the age of 91 in 1937. Over the next 50 years, this small church would be rebuilt into the massive St. Joseph's Oratory, which now serves as a basilica today, as well as the burial site of St. Andre Bessette. Andre was canonized in 2010 by Pope Benedict XVI and serves as the patron saint of the sick, caregivers, and the rejected. St. Anselm of Canterbury is one of the greatest theologians of the second millennium, often referred to as the father of scholasticism, writing many great works about the existence and the nature of God, truth, free will, the origins of evil, reason, and Jesus' incarnation. Born in 1033 in northern Italy, he always wanted to live the monastic life since he was young, but due to his youth, he wouldn't be able to join until he was older. Eventually, after a long process of education, he heard about a famous abbot who was a teacher at a monastery in Normandy, France, which led him to enter the monastic life when he was 27 years old. During his time in the monastery, he would quickly rise up among the ranks, with his fellow monks complaining about his rapid promotions despite his youthful age. Anselm wouldn't allow these complaints to deter him, however, and he would remain steadfast in his patience and gentleness, which would eventually win over the favor of his fellow monks. In 1078, he would be elected as the abbot of the monastery and would later move to Canterbury, England, where he would be elected as the Archbishop of Canterbury, which, nowadays that's a completely different title than what it was back then. He would hold strictly to the church's disciplines and would work hard in bettering the clergy. He wouldn't just be known for his episcopate, though, as he was also known for his charity towards all, but especially the poor. He was known far and wide for his compassion, and he would even speak out against the slave trade at the time. Anselm unfortunately passed away in 1109, and while there is no explicit record of his canonization, he would be declared as a doctor of the church in 720 by Pope Clement XI. Today he serves as the patron saint of theologians and philosophers, as well as one of the most important medieval church fathers. St. Francis Cabrini. While St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who we mentioned earlier on this iceberg, was the first saint to be born in America and to be canonized, St. Francis Cabrini was the first American saint. Francis Cabrini was a very important modern missionary who serves as a powerful example of Christian charity towards immigrants, the poor, and the forgotten. Born in 1850 in San Angelo Laggiano, Italy, Francis was born 2 months premature and because of this struggled with poor health for much of her life. But she was raised in a devout Catholic family and developed a strong desire to become a missionary from a young age. As an adult, she originally wanted to serve in China. However, after meeting with Pope Leo XIII, he famously told her not to go to the east, but to the west, sending her to care for the massive number of Italian immigrants in the United States at the time. When Francis arrived, it was the height of the Industrial Revolution in New York, with immigrants being forced to live in slums, an abundance of child labor, and terrible conditions for the immigrants. At the time, the upper-class Protestant industrialists were extremely anti-Catholic, and many Catholic workers lived within ghettos. However, even among the Catholics, the Irish hated the Italians, viewing them as dirty, which led Cabrini to initially experience extreme prejudice. In 1880, she founded the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and after arriving in New York in 1889, she began building schools, orphanages, and hospitals for the Catholic immigrants in New York, who were often poor, exploited, and neglected. Despite her fragile health and her fear of the ocean, she crossed the Atlantic multiple times and founded multiple institutions across the United States, Latin America, and Europe. However, unfortunately, St. Francis Cabrini died in 1917 in Chicago. It was eventually canonized by Pope Pius XII in 1946 as the first American saint. Mother Francis Cabrini's intense service to the poor, especially in the face of adversity, has made her into a very popular modern saint, and today she serves as the patron saint of immigrants, which is a very important issue even to this day. Saint Roque. Despite what the media wants you to believe, it is not a matter of Catholic doctrine that all dogs go to heaven. The Church is, however, open to the possibility that some dogs could go to heaven, and there's a lot of different opinions about it. However, one dog that we know is in heaven is the dog of Saint Roque, a lay Franciscan who lived in Italy during the 1300s. Saint Roque in French, also known as Rocco in Italian, who is also called the Rock in English sometimes, was born in around 1348 in Montpellier, France, under very miraculous circumstances, with a red cross-shaped birthmark on his chest. Despite growing up in a noble family, he constantly donated to the poor, and joined the Franciscan Third Order in Rome. When the Black Plague spread throughout Italy, Roque served the sick and dying for years, but eventually the plague finally caught up to him, and he was infected by one of the victims that he was helping. When he caught the plague, he made the decision to withdraw to the wilderness, out in the woods where he couldn't spread the highly contagious disease to anyone else. The only companion he brought with him was his loyal dog, and St. Roque worked out a deal with a local nobleman. Every day he would send his dog to the town where it would pick up a loaf of bread from the noble and bring it back in its mouth, because, there's nothing more delicious than bread that has been inside inside of a dog's mouth for an hour. However, the legend says that when St. Roque finally died of the illness, his dog followed his soul up to heaven, and St. Peter made an exception to let his loyal dog into heaven with him. Now, of course, this is a legend. This is not a matter of doctrine, but I personally choose to believe it. So there you go. St. Roque's life demonstrates the Catholic value of caring for the sick and sacrificing one's own desires and needs of others. And today, St. Roque serves as the patron saint of epidemics, pilgrims, and of course, dogs. St. Boniface was born in around 675 in modern-day Exeter, England, to a noble family of aristocrats, originally with the name of Winfrid, which is a lot less cool than Boniface, I have to say. Filled with a strong devotion to Christ from a young age, he was educated by Benedictine monks, and eventually was ordained as a priest at the age of 30 years old. He felt an intense call to spread the gospel to the people of mainland Europe, which was dominated by paganism at the time, and after receiving approval from his bishop, he preached the gospel to the people of Germany, essentially serving as the St. Patrick of Germany. One legend says that he cut down a sacred tree in Germany, challenging the pagan gods to strike him down. But when the people of Germany saw that nothing had happened, they realized that their gods were false and all converted to Christianity. He established many churches and monasteries within Germany, eventually becoming known as Boniface, or doer of good. Later in life, he served as the Archbishop of Mainz, Germany, helping to resolve many conflicts across Europe, reforming the church in France, and eventually traveling as far as the Netherlands to evangelize to its people. Shortly after reaching the Netherlands, however, in around 754 AD, he was preparing a group of recent converts for confirmation when he was attacked and then martyred by pagans. And even while he was dying, he continued to preach the gospel and read scripture. Boniface served as one of the most influential missionaries in all of history, spreading the gospel throughout Europe and likely bringing millions of people to Christ. Boniface was then canonized in 836 by Pope Gregory IV and serves as the patron saint of Germany, tailors, and brewers. Alright guys, starting off layer 11, we have Saint Bridget of Ireland, also known as Bridget of Kildare, who is another early church saint whose legendary status has made it somewhat difficult to distinguish the fiction from reality. However, it is generally believed that Bridget was born in 451 AD in Northern Ireland to a Christian mother and an Irish chieftain father. However, shortly after she was born, her mother was sold into slavery by her father after being coerced by another woman, being sold to a pagan druid. However, despite this, Bridget and her mother stayed firm in their faith. Eventually, when his father realized his mistake after witnessing Bridget's extraordinary faith, he bought back Bridget and her mother. Bridget then worked as a farmhand, even performing miracles and serving the poor despite her relative poverty. As an adult, Bridget was consecrated as a virgin, and in 470, she established her first community, which eventually grew into a monastery, which is now known as the Monastery of Kildare. Throughout the rest of her life, she established multiple religious institutions, schools, and even created the Book of Kildare, an illuminated manuscript that was said to be so detailed that it couldn't have been created by human hands, until it was eventually lost to time. Legend says that St. Bridget also became a close friend of St. Patrick, with Patrick serving as a sort of mentor to the younger Bridget. While much of her life is unknown due to its somewhat legendary nature, with some even claiming that St. Bridget was a Christianized version of the Celtic goddess of the same name, it is generally believed that Bridget passed away in 525 AD at the age of 75 years old. Today she serves as the patron saint of midwives, newborn babies, farm girls, and poetry, as well as a very important cultural figure within Irish Catholicism. Saint Brendan the Navigator is another very famous Irish saint who is surrounded by legendary stories of his travels and voyages, with some people even believing him to be the first European to discover America as early as 512 AD. Brendan was believed to be born in 484 in a small seaside town near modern-day Munster, Ireland, to devout Christian parents. He developed a close relationship to the Lord at a young age and was eventually ordained as a priest when he got older in around 512 AD. Even though St. Patrick and St. Bridget had done much to convert the country of Ireland, Brendan established multiple monastic communities and missions, spreading the gospel even further throughout his local communities in Ireland as a whole. This led to him becoming one of the 12 apostles of Ireland, and of these he is probably the most famous. However, growing up by the sea, he also had a deep love for nature and for the ocean as well, and this led him to embark on his legendary voyage. This voyage became known as the legendary voyage of St. Brendan. In his journal entries recount his visits to England, Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, and even the Land of Promise, which was believed by many to be America. While initially this claim was dismissed by scholars due to a lack of archaeological evidence, as it's generally believed that America was discovered by Leif Erikson, not St. Brendan. In 1976, British historian Tim Severin built a replica of St. Brendan's boat, using only the materials that existed at the time, and successfully sailed from Ireland to Canada on the exact same path, proving that St. Brendan could have been the first European to reach America. Almost 1,000 years years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, who in fact was partially inspired by St. Brendan's journals to help make his journey to America in the first place. Upon Brendan's return to Ireland, he built his now famous monastery in Galway, Ireland, where he was buried in 577. Today, St. Brendan serves as the patron saint of sailors, navigators, and of the United States Navy. St. Brendan's legendary voyage and sainthood have been the subject to historical speculation for centuries, and while it's impossible to know whether or not he landed in Canada in the 6th century, the possibility alone makes for one of the most interesting and mysterious saint stories on this entire iceberg. So we all know that St. Peter was the first pope, taking up the keys to the kingdom and the mantle of Christ after his death and becoming a very early church leader in the book of Acts. But do you know who the second pope is? Well, that's St. Linus, who is mentioned in the Eucharistic prayer every Sunday at Mass alongside St. Peter and many other saints on this iceberg. Even though he served as the second pope in history, and some people even claim that he was the first pope in history, not many details of his life are known, and what we do know comes from a brief mention in 2 Timothy 4:21, as well as the writings of St. Irenaeus, who wrote about his lineage as early as 180 AD, which affirms that St. Peter and Paul passed down the responsibility of leading the church to Linus prior to their martyrdoms. Born in around 10 AD in Tuscany, Italy, it is largely unknown what his early life looked like, other than the fact that he became a follower of Christ and was consecrated as a bishop by St. Paul himself, whom he became very close friends with. Linus likely became pope in around 65 AD during the reign of Emperor Nero, and guided the people of the church through this difficult time of persecution. His papacy is also largely undocumented, although we do know that he introduced the practices of veiling to the church, until he was martyred by a Roman official named Saturnius after exorcising a demon from his daughter. Although it is possible that the story of his martyrdom is a legend, as there's very little evidence from historical sources to suggest this. Even though he was such an important part of early church history, the unknown nature of his life makes him one of the most mysterious saints on this list, and today he serves as the patron saint of hats and veiling. St. Cletus, also known as Anacletus, was the third pope, who, like Linus, is mentioned in the Roman Martyrology during the prayer of consecration. And also, like Linus, not much of his life is known. So, as you can see, there's a bit of a pattern here. However, what we do know about his life is based on the historical writings of St. Irenaeus once again. Cletus was likely born in around 15 AD in Rome, before following St. Peter as an adult, being ordained as a bishop sometime before his papacy began in 80 AD. So, it's kind of interesting to think about how, while the second pope descended from Paul, the third pope descended from Peter, which is very poetic, as both of their legacies were carried on in the papacy after their deaths. As pope, Cletus divided the Diocese of Rome into 25 smaller parishes and ordained a large number of priests, which established the beginning of the diocesan parish system that almost every diocese uses to this day. While the exact details of his martyrdom are unknown, it is believed that he was killed in 92 AD under the Emperor Domitian and was buried underneath St. Peter's Basilica alongside St. Peter and St. Linus. St. Clement of Rome was the fourth pope of the Catholic Church and the first of the Apostolic Fathers, and you're probably starting to see a pattern here in what I'm doing. Clement was likely born in around 35 AD in Rome, and much like the other popes we've talked about, not much is known about his early life besides a brief mention in Philippians 4:3 and the writings of Irenaeus. Clement was also a student of Peter and a close friend of St. Paul, as well as of St. Cletus, serving alongside him during his papacy. Clement wrote many letters during his papacy as well, similar to St. Paul, writing a letter to the Corinthians, which, just proves how terrible the Corinthians must have been, considering the fact that Paul wrote 2 letters to them, traveled to Corinth multiple times, and when that still didn't work, Pope Clement had to write a letter as well. This letter was very important, however, as it established the modern episcopal system of bishops. However, although accounts differ on his death, it is believed that he died of natural causes in around 100 AD, shortly after the Emperor Trajan came to power. Today, Clement serves as the patron saint of mariners and of stonemasons, as well as the first of the Apostolic Fathers. Pope Sixtus II, who was actually not the 6th pope, that was Sixtus I, although that's not actually what the word Sixtus means. It's actually Greek for polished or clean cut, but I digress, is another example of papal martyrdom, and again one of a few saints mentioned within the prayer of consecration at every Catholic Mass. Like many other early church martyrs, not much is known about him, but it is believed that he was born in around 200 AD in Greece, being classically trained in Greek philosophy before moving to Rome to become a bishop, where he was elected pope in 257 AD. During his very short papacy, he spoke out against the heresy of Novatianism and helped to restore relationships between the African and Eastern churches. He also ordained 7 deacons, who served under him directly, one of whom was St. Lawrence, who I mentioned earlier in Layer 8. And much like Lawrence, as Emperor Valerian came to power in Rome, he forced Christian leaders to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods, and when Sixtus refused, he was promptly beheaded on August 6th of 258 AD. Although his papacy was extremely short, his powerful leadership and martyrdom made him one of the most important popes of the early Church, and today he serves as the patron saint of Balagra, Italy, and grape harvests. And finally, Saint Cornelius was another very important early church pope mentioned in the prayer of consecration and mass, who actually served as pope shortly before Sixtus. However, this is the order that they're mentioned in the prayer of consecration. You probably noticed that pattern, I don't know. However, Cornelius served during one of the messiest periods of Christian persecution, as well as a powerful example of Christian martyrdom. Born sometime in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, though the exact date and details of his early life are unknown, he became pope in 251 AD, after the brutal persecution of Emperor Decius, which led many Christians to deny their faith entirely. Cornelius argued that these Christians could be forgiven, provided that they repent and profess their faith once again, which put him at odds with the bishop Novatian, who believed that the church should be far stricter with those who had fallen away. With support from saints such as Cyprian of Carthage, Cornelius helped defend the idea that the church is a place of mercy, not just of punishment. He declared Novatianism to be a heresy and formally excommunicated Novatian as an anti-pope, earning the support of the majority of bishops at the time. However, after Emperor Decius was killed in battle, he was succeeded by Gaius, who shared Decius's anti-Christian sentiments. Cornelius was exiled by Emperor Gaius and was eventually beheaded in 253 AD. Cornelius served as a strong leader in the early church, and his martyrdom serves as an inspiration to millions of Christians even to this day. Today he serves as the patron saint of cattle and domestic animals. And yeah, we are done with all of the popes for now. However, I do find it interesting, and if you guys are interested, one day in the near future, I don't know when because it would take forever, I would like to do like a 4-hour video explaining every single pope in history. I think that would be really fun. So let me know if you guys are interested in that. St. Peter Claver was a very important Jesuit missionary who served during one of the darkest periods of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as a powerful example of Christian charity towards the most abandoned people in society, and going against the cultural norms of what is morally right and serving God in everything. Born in 1580 in Catalonia, Spain, Peter was raised in a devout Catholic family, growing up as a farmer. However, he eventually studied at the University of Barcelona as an adult, before joining the Jesuits and being ordained in 1604. After meeting St. Alphonsus Rodriguez, who encouraged him to become a missionary, Peter left Spain for the New World and was sent to the city of Cartagena, Colombia, which was one of the largest slave ports in the Americas at the time. Upon arrival, he realized the horrible conditions of the town and the brutal ways that the slaves were treated at the time. He realized that God was calling him to serve these people, and he dedicated his entire life to serving the enslaved Africans as they arrived, bringing them food, medicine, water, and basic care, while preaching the gospel and instructing them in the faith. Peter Claver famously called himself the slave of the slaves, and over decades of ministry, he's believed to have baptized hundreds to thousands of enslaved people. During the months when the slaves were not scheduled to arrive, he traveled the country, visiting plantations and preaching the gospel to the slaves, even refusing the regular accommodations that the plantation owners offered and living and working with the slave population, suffering alongside them. However, after almost 40 years of exhausting service, Peter became seriously ill and spent the last years of his life mostly bedridden and neglected. He died in 1654 and was eventually canonized in 1888 by Pope Leo XII. St. Peter Claver served as a strong witness to human dignity in a world that treated human beings like property, and today he serves as the patron saint of the enslaved, African missions, race relations, and ministry to African Americans. St. John Damascene, also known as St. John of Damascus, was a very important early Christian monk, priest, and theologian, best known for defending the use of iconography during the Byzantine iconoclast controversy, as well as a powerful example of defending the faith through writing and theology. Born in around 676 AD in Damascus, which was under Muslim rule at the time, John was raised in a wealthy Christian family and received a strong education in theology, philosophy, and the sciences before entering the religious life. He served as a chief administrator under the Muslim Caliphate, but eventually, after a change of heart, gave up his wealth and position to become a monk in the Marsaba monastery near Jerusalem. As a monk and priest, John wrote extensively in defense of Christianity, especially against those who rejected icons, arguing that since Christ became truly man, sacred images could be used to honor him and the saints without becoming idols. Of course, this is the classic distinction between veneration and worship, which, you know, if you've argued with a Protestant before, you've probably heard this before. But this issue goes all the way back to the very beginning, which is interesting but also kind of ironic and funny to think about. I don't know. He also was very adamant against Islam, viewing it as a Christian heresy that denied core doctrines such as the crucifixion and the divinity of Christ. However, unfortunately, after living a life that was very pleasing to God, St. John Damascene died in around 749 AD, and his writings have become extremely influential in both the Eastern and the Western Church, helping to formally establish the doctrine of icon veneration at the Second Council of Nicaea. Because of this, John Damascene was declared a doctor of the Church in 1890 by Pope Leo XIII. St. John Damascene served as a strong defender of the Christian tradition during a time of theological conflict, and today he serves as the patron saint of icon painters, theology students, and pharmacists, which I think is like the third time pharmacists have been brought up, but maybe I'm just going crazy. St. Gregory of Nyssa was a very important early church bishop and theologian, best known for being one of the Cappadocian fathers alongside St. Basil the Great and St. Gregory Nazianzen, who is entirely different from Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory the Great, and I know it's confusing, but I promise we will get to him later. However, all of them were brothers, which is insane that this family produced so many saints. I just gotta say, one day I hope my family is like that. And Gregory served as a powerful example of defending Christian unity in Orthodox theology. Born in around 335 AD in Cappadocia, mostly due to his family, Gregory became deeply involved in theology and eventually was made Bishop of Nyssa in 372 AD. However, during the Arian controversy, he was accused of embezzling church funds by imperial authorities and was forced into exile in around 376 AD. After the death of the Arian-leaning Emperor Valens, Gregory returned to his position as bishop in 378 AD and continued defending the Nicene faith. He later played an instrumental role at the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, helping to strengthen and clarify the church's teaching on the Trinity and contributing to the final victory of Nicene Christianity over Arianism. Unfortunately, Gregory passed away in 394 AD, leaving behind major theological writings on the soul, the resurrection, the Trinity, and the spiritual life. Once again, St. Gregory served as a strong defender of Christian unity through one of the church's most intense theological battles with Arianism, and today he serves as the patron saint of unity as well as one of the most influential church fathers. Alright guys, starting off layer 12, we have St. Joseph of Cupertino. St. Joseph of Cupertino was best known for his humility, obedience, and holiness, despite being rejected by the world, as well as being the patron saint of mentally handicapped people, which, you know, is extremely relatable for the people who regularly watch my videos. Born in 1603 in Cupertino, Italy, Joseph grew up in extreme poverty and had a very difficult life, with his father dying before he was born, and his family even losing their home because of debt. As a child, Joseph was often considered slow, distracted, and awkward, and he struggled greatly with learning and basic responsibilities, which caused many people in his local community to underestimate him. From a modern psychological lens, Joseph of Cupertino likely suffered from some sort of neurodivergence and learning disorders, perhaps a form of autism. But because of this, Joseph was rejected by multiple religious communities. However, he had intense devotion to the Lord and intense persistence, and eventually he was accepted by the Franciscans, where he lived a simple life of prayer, penance, and obedience. Although he struggled severely academically due to his learning disorders, he was eventually ordained a priest in 1628 and soon became famous for falling into ecstasy and even levitating during mass, prayer, or when hearing the names of Jesus and Mary. Joseph became quite famous over the years, and many even accused him of witchcraft for his pretty extreme miracles of flight, which were witnessed by hundreds of people and are even unexplained to this day. Because of this, Joseph was often moved in between monasteries and kept hidden for much of his life, which he accepted with responsibility, humility, and obedience. St. Joseph of Cupertino serves as a strong reminder that God can even work through the weakest and most underestimated people. That mental disabilities and learning disorders are not the end and do not prevent you from living a holy life. And today, Joseph serves as the patron saint of the mentally handicapped, students, test takers, aviation, and astronauts, which I think is pretty funny. St. Peter Damian was a very important Benedictine monk and cardinal, best known for fighting corruption in the clergy and pushing for reform in one of the messiest periods of the medieval church. Born in around 1007 AD in Ravenna, Italy, Peter had a very difficult early life, being orphaned from a young age and being treated very harshly by one of his older brothers, who forced him to work as a swineherd for years. Eventually, however, another one of his brothers, Damian, took him in and educated him, which led Peter to take the name Damian out of gratitude for his brother, becoming an extremely talented teacher. But after a change in heart, he left this life as a teacher behind to become a monk at Fonte Avellana, where he embraced intense prayer, fasting, and penance. His His holiness and intelligence made him a major voice for church reform, especially against simony, clerical immorality, and corruption among priests and bishops. Although he wanted to live the quiet life of a monk, he was ordained as the Cardinal of Ostia, becoming an important advisor to several popes and helping to strengthen discipline within the church. Unfortunately, Peter Damian passed away on February 22, 1072, and was later declared as a doctor of the church by Pope Leo XII in 1828. St. Peter Damian served as a strong defender of holiness and the priesthood during a time when the church badly needed reform, and today he serves as the patron saint of reformers and those suffering from insomnia. St. Isidore of Seville was born in around 500 AD to a noble Spanish family, and from a young age had a knack for learning, being under the education of his brother, who was also a Saint Leander of Seville. When his brother was ordained as archbishop, Isidore would assist his brother and eventually succeed him as Archbishop of Seville. He would have every seminary in every diocese to have a comprehensive education system. This would be very influential, as this would cause Spain to be the center of attention when it came to learning and culture in the Middle Ages, due to his vision of the unity of religion and learning. Spain became largely ahead of the curve during this time when it came to education, and became a cultural hotspot for its schools, liberal arts, medicine, law, Hebrew, Greek, and even philosophy, studying Aristotle's works. It would take hundreds of years for the rest of Europe to adopt Isidore's teachings. However, he would write his famous encyclopedia, which would be used for thousands of years, and would write many books on topics such as astronomy, geography, world history, biographies, law, and theology. Before St. Isidore passed away at nearly the age of 80, he would give everything that he had to the poor. St. Isidore of Seville would be canonized in 1598 by Pope Clement VIII and was declared a doctor of the church in 1772 by Pope Innocent XIII. His feast day is celebrated on April 4th, and funnily enough, he's actually a patron saint of the internet. Saint Charbel Marclouf is one of the most popular saints that comes from the Marionite rite. Born Youssef Antoun Marclouf in Lebanon in the year 1828, he was raised in a devout Catholic family and would spend much of his time during his childhood studying at the parish's school and working on the family farm. As Charbel got older, he reached a crossroads in his life. His uncle Tanias wanted him to keep working with him, and his mother wanted him to marry. Charbel had other plans, however, as you can probably see where this is going, and he vanished from his home in 1851 without letting anybody know. He would travel on foot to the monastery of Our Lady of Mafok in Lebanon, which would become his new home, and he would eventually take the name Brother Charbel. After the 2nd century martyr Saint Charbel of Edessa, he would eventually be ordained as a priest on July 23, 1859, and he would dedicate his entire life to prayer, silence, and manual labor at the monastery. In 1875, he would be granted permission by his abbot to live as a hermit, where he would continue to live out the remainder of his life in quiet devotion to the Lord. Unfortunately, Saint Charbel Marclouf passed away from a stroke on Christmas Eve, 1898. To this day, over 30,000 miracles have been attributed to his intercession, which would lead to his canonization as a saint in 1977 by Pope Paul VI, and today he is venerated as the patron saint of Lebanon and those who suffer both in body and soul. While most saints on this iceberg largely come from the Roman rite, it's very interesting to hear the lives of the saints and the other rites of Catholicism, who have devoted themselves to God in very unique ways that are a little bit unfamiliar to our Western preconceived notions. But either way, the story of Saint Charbel Marclouf is one of the most powerful examples of Christian asceticism and monasticism, and he continues to serve as a powerful example for thousands of Maronite Catholics to this day. Saint Romuald was a very important Benedictine monk and reformer, best known for founding the Camaldolese order, which served as a powerful example of radical prayer, solitude, and repentance. Born in around 951 AD in Ravenna, Italy, Romuald was raised in a wealthy noble family. However, his early life was marked by the worldliness and the violence of Italian aristocratic society. After witnessing his father kill his own relative in a duel, Romuald was horrified and went to a monastery to do penance for his family and what he had seen. The experience he had at this monastery eventually led him to leave behind his noble life and become a monk himself. However, rather than living a comfortable religious life, Romuald became deeply committed to solitude, fasting, and silence, and reforming the monasteries at the time that had grown spiritually lazy. He traveled throughout Italy, founding and reforming monasteries and hermitages, eventually establishing the Camaldolese community, which combined the communal life of the Benedictine monks with the solitude of the hermits. Even though his strict reforms were not always popular, Romuald continued pushing monks towards deeper prayer and holiness until he unfortunately passed away in 1027 AD. To this day, Saint Romuald serves as a strong reminder that true conversion requires leaving sin behind completely, and today he serves as the patron saint of the Camaldolese order and hermitage. Saint Betty, also known as the Venerable Betty, was an important English monk, historian, and doctor of the church, best known for writing the ecclesiastical history of the English people, which was one of the most important sources for early English Christianity. Born in around 673 AD in Northumbria, England, Betty was sent to a monastery at the age of 7, where he was raised in the religious life and received a strong education in scripture, history, language, and theology. He spent nearly his entire entire life in the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, living a quiet life of prayer, study, teaching, and writing. Although he never traveled far, his writings had a massive impact on the church, especially his works on biblical commentary, chronology, the lives of the saints, and the history of Christianity within the country of England. And interestingly enough, Betty is also one of the reasons why we use the modern dating system of BC and AD, since he helped popularize it through his historical writings. After a long life of devotion to the Lord, Betty passed away in 735 AD, reportedly while finishing a translation of the Gospel of John, and was later declared a doctor of the church by Pope Leo XIII in 1899. Saint Betty serves as a strong reminder that scholarship and holiness can work together in service of God, and today he serves as the patron saint of historians, scholars, and English writers. Saints Felicity and Perpetua. Saints Felicity and Perpetua were two very early Christian martyrs, best known for their powerful witness during the Roman persecution, as well as serving as some of the earliest Christian women, whose writings about Christianity have survived to this day. Saint Perpetua was born in around 182 AD in Carthage, North Africa, into a wealthy noble family, while Felicity was born around the same time as a slave, making their friendship a very powerful example of Christian unity across social class. When Perpetua became a mother, she made the decision to convert to Christianity, becoming a catechumen preparing for her baptism, with Felicity, who was also a catechumen and also happened to be pregnant at the time. The two bonded over this and became very close friends. However, shortly afterward, they were arrested by Emperor Septimus Severus, who was notorious for his persecution of Christians. Despite Perpetua's father begging her to renounce her faith, and Felicity even giving birth to her child in the face of execution, both women refused to abandon Christ, and alongside many companions, they were thrown in the arena in Carthage, attacked by wild animals, and eventually killed with the sword in around 203 AD. Their powerful example of martyrdom was preserved in the Passion of Saints Perpetua and Saint Felicity, one of the most famous early martyrdom accounts in early church history. To this day, Saints Felicity and Perpetua serve as powerful examples of Christian courage, motherhood, and friendship in the face of persecution and even death, and they are mentioned alongside many other saints on this iceberg and the prayer of consecration. Today, they serve as the patron saints of mothers, expectant mothers, ranchers, and butchers, as well as some of the most prominent female martyrs within the early church. Saint Polycarp was a very important early church bishop and martyr, best known for being a disciple of Saint John the Apostle, and one of the clearest links between the apostles and the early church fathers. Born around 69 AD, likely in Asia Minor, Polycarp grew up during the first generation after Christ and was taught directly by the apostles themselves, especially by Saint John, which gave him a unique authority within the early church. He eventually became the bishop of Smyrna, where he defended the faith against heresies such as Gnosticism, which, if you don't remember me mentioning it earlier, is basically the belief that there is a good God and an evil God, and the world is a spiritual battleground between these two forces. And the only way to achieve salvation is to find the hidden meaning of gnosis within spiritual exercises. Saint Polycarp also served as a very important teacher to many very important saints, including Saint Irenaeus, who maybe, if you remember from earlier on, continued Saint Polycarp's fight against Arianism in his famous work against heresies. In fact, Saint Polycarp was so close to Saint John that he is briefly mentioned in Revelation 2:8-11 as an angel of Smyrna, reflecting his position as bishop. However, as an old man, Polycarp was arrested during the Roman persecution of Christians in order to deny Christ, but he famously refused, saying that he had served Christ for 86 years and that Christ had never wronged him. The Romans attempted to burn him alive, but according to tradition, the flames did not consume him, so he was finally killed with a sword, as with many of the other martyrs on this list, and passed away in around 155 AD. Saint Polycarp served as a very powerful example of apostolic faithfulness and Christian martyrdom, as well as a very important early church father who influenced some of the greatest saints in history. Today, Saint Polycarp serves as the patron saints of earaches and dysentery. Saint Agatha was a very important early Christian martyr, best known for her brutal suffering during the Roman persecution, as well as a powerful example of purity, courage, and refusing to abandon Christ even while being tortured. Born in 231 AD in Catania, Sicily, much of Agatha's early life is unknown, but she was likely raised in a noble and wealthy Christian family, devoting herself to God from a young age with a vow of perpetual virginity. Because of her beauty and status, she attracted the attention of a Roman official named Quintinius, who tried to force her into marriage, but of course Agatha refused, staying true to her vow of virginity to the Lord. In response, Quintinius reported her to the Emperor Decius, who ordered her to be subject to horrific punishments, including imprisonment, humiliation, and even torture. According to tradition, her breasts were even cut off by a Roman official. However, Saint Peter miraculously appeared to her and healed her wounds. Still refusing to renounce the faith, Agatha was continually tortured until she eventually passed away in 251 AD, at the young age of only 20 years old. As with many of the other female martyrs on this list, Agatha served as a strong witness to Christian purity and faithfulness in the face of extreme cruelty, and today she serves as the patron saint of those suffering with breast cancer, victims of assault, and nurses. And finally, ending off layer 12, we have Saint Dismas. We've all heard the story of the thief on the cross in Luke chapter 23, who, while hanging on the cross next to Jesus, in one final act of repentance was able to achieve salvation. But you probably didn't know that this man actually has a name, Saint Dismas. Born on the dusty fringes of the Roman Empire, Dismas lived a life defined by violence, theft, and the desperate survival of a highwayman. History doesn't really record his early years, as much of his early life is unknown, only his final hours, bloodied, broken, and nailed to a wooden cross on the hill of Golgotha next to Christ. He was a hardened criminal who was condemned to death by crucifixion, and while we don't know what his crimes were, we can only assume that it must have been horrific. However, he paid the ultimate price for his lifetime of bad choices. Yet, viewing the end was near and hitting the absolute rock bottom of his life, his story shifted from one of tragedy into the ultimate narrative of redemption. The criminal to his right hurled insults at Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us too." However, Dismas, with his final agonizing breaths, defended Jesus and his innocence, and made a simple yet desperate request: "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom," which are now very famous words that I guarantee you've heard before. His gentle plea was then met with the most scandalous display of grace in all of human history. Jesus didn't demand a lifetime of penance or a theological degree. He simply turned to him and promised, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." In a single moment, Dismas bypassed the religious authorities and the religious elites, becoming the very first person in history to enter heaven alongside Christ. And in a sense, Dismas is actually the first saint in all of history. Dismas was venerated by the early church and continues to be venerated to this day. Today he serves as the patron saint of prisoners, thieves, repentance, and serves as an enduring symbol that no one is ever too far gone. Dismas was a thief his entire life, and with his final breath, he managed to steal paradise for himself. And rather than turning him away, God accepted him with open arms. Saint Martin of Tours was a very important early medieval bishop, monk, and former Roman soldier, best known for the famous story of him cutting his cloak in half to give to a freezing beggar, and serves as a powerful example of Christian charity, humility, and conversion. Born in around 316 AD in modern-day Hungary, Martin was raised in a pagan Roman military family and was forced into the army at a young age. Even though he was somewhat interested in Christianity as a child, while serving as a soldier, Martin encountered a beggar freezing from the cold, and after giving him half of his cloak, he later had a vision of Christ wearing it, showing him that his act of charity had been done for the Lord himself, which of course harkens back to what Jesus says, that whatever you do to the least of my people, you do to me. Martin was baptized shortly after this, and eventually he left the army, now a soldier for Christ alone, and could no longer fight for the Roman Empire. He eventually became a disciple of Saint Hilary of Poitiers, embraced the monastic life, and founded one of the first monasteries in Gaul. Later, despite his desire for a quiet life, he was made Bishop of Tours, where he preached, fought paganism, defended the poor with the simplicity of a monk. Martin died in 397 AD and became one of the most popular saints in medieval Europe. Martin of Tours served as a strong witness that true greatness comes from humility and mercy, and today he serves as the patron saint of beggars, soldiers, tailors, and the entire country of France. Saint Edith Stein is another very tragic story about the Holocaust, so there's a bit of a trigger warning here. Saint Edith Stein was born into a Jewish family in Breslau, Germany, on the feast day of Yom Kippur in 1891. As the youngest of 11 children, Stein was very intelligent, passing all of her exams and eventually enrolling at the University of Breslau to study German and history. Her real interests would be in the realms of philosophy and also women's studies. However, her time in university led her to become an atheist. She would eventually be involved in the women's suffrage movement in Germany. However, in 1913, she would be transferred to Göttingen University, in which she would be a pupil and a teaching assistant of Edmund Husserl. Husserl would be an influential figure in Stein's life, as this would lead her and many of her other pupils to Christianity, with his philosophy being viewed as a return to the objects which validated how the human mind directly experiences reality rather than prioritizing scientific materialism. Stein would also meet Max Scheler, a philosopher who would bring her attention specifically to Catholicism. During the First World War, Stein spent her time serving in an Austrian field hospital, which would be very difficult for her as she looked at those who were sick and saw many people die. However, after the war, she would return back to Husserl in Freiburg, Germany, where she would gain her doctorate after writing a thesis on the problem with empathy. Another important experience to her conversion would be when she went to the Frankfurt Cathedral and saw a woman with a shopping basket enter in for a moment of prayer. She said, quote, "This was something totally new to me. In the synagogues and the Protestant churches I had visited, people simply went in for the services. Here, however, I saw someone coming straight from the busy marketplace into this church, as if she was going to have an intimate conversation. It was something I never forgot." After this, Stein would become baptized, and even though she had renounced her Jewish religion in the past, she found a fulfillment in Judaism through Catholicism. Catholicism. After this, Stein desired to become a Carmelite nun and enter into the convent. However, she would be cautioned by her spiritual directors, and this wouldn't end up going through. She spent her time as a teacher, teaching at various schools. However, in 1933, disaster struck Germany, as when the Nazis came to power, they began their infamous persecution of the Jews. However, shortly after this, she did end up entering into the Carmelite order, where she would be known as Teresa, Blessed of the Cross. However, in 1938, the persecutions would grow to be worse, as acts of terrorism against the Jewish people became more apparent. Stein would flee Germany, being smuggled into the Netherlands by the Carmelite convent. However, she would be arrested by the Gestapo in 1942 and sent to Auschwitz concentration camp, where she, along with her sister and many others, would be gassed to death in the chamber on August 9, 1942. Her tragic martyrdom at the hands of the oppressive regime was very inspirational to Catholics during World War II and beyond, and she be canonized as a saint by Pope John Paul II in 1998, where today she serves as the patron saint of converts to Christianity and of Europe. Saint Justin Martyr was a well-known Roman martyr who was influential in showing that the faith can be defended and emphasizing the importance of faith and reason. Born to a family of non-believers in about 90 AD, Justin would be given the best education at the time. Justin would be intelligent in matters of rhetoric, poetry, history, and later on in his life, philosophy. He would also spend many years seeking God and would be disappointed by his many teachers. He would be curious about Christianity when he heard about the martyrdoms going on. However, eventually, he met an elderly man who properly introduced him to Christianity. Justin would become an inquirer to the faith and tried to learn everything that he possibly could. However, when he was 30 years old, he would be baptized as a Christian. There was a slight problem though. Even though Christianity was spreading and many people died as martyrs, most people were very uneducated in what the Bible taught. Justin would then dedicate the rest of his life to having dialogue with these people, due to him thinking that many would accept Christ if they had an explanation that involved faith and reason. He would speak and write about Christianity to other philosophers, and he would explain Christian rituals to those who viewed them to be secretive and those who were concerned that Christianity would undermine the Roman Empire. He would continually have public debates with pagan thinkers, where he would end in victory, exposing their ignorance, basically serving as the first Christian apologist. He would essentially be considered a threat to the Roman Empire's culture and would be arrested and ordered to make a sacrifice to the Roman gods, which of course he would refuse. However, unfortunately, he was executed by beheading in around 165 AD. Justin Martyr essentially served as one of the very first church fathers, and his writings have been very influential to the entirety of church history, and today he serves as the patron saint of philosophers, apologists, and lecturers. Saint Tarcisius is another very powerful early church martyr who died as a child due to his love for the Blessed Sacrament and for the Eucharist. Unfortunately, almost all of the information we have about Tarcisius comes from later writings and legends, but it is believed that he was born in the late 3rd century in Rome, growing up in a devout Christian family. As a young boy, he became an altar server with a real zeal for the Lord that he wasn't afraid to show to others. Tarcisius grew up during the reign of the Emperor Valerian, who, as you probably remember from earlier on in this iceberg, was not very keen on Christianity, killing hundreds to thousands of Christians during his reign as emperor. Some of these Christians who were imprisoned would ask a priest to see if someone could bring the Eucharist with them. When Tarcisius was only 12 years old, he would embark on a fateful journey to the jail to deliver the Eucharist, holding the consecrated piece of bread to his chest out of reverence. On his way, he would be recognized by a group of friends, and they would ask him to play. He refused, and they would ask why. They asked what he was holding, but he gave no response, only whispering a prayer to Jesus quietly to himself to give him strength. However, one of his friends heard this prayer, and upon realizing that Tarcisius was a Christian, he would alert everyone around, leading a mob to gather around him. Tarcisius continued, not letting go of the Eucharist, even as the mob began to beat him and stone him. He did not let go of the Eucharist, almost with a supernatural strength, and kept praying even louder. Tarcisius was beaten to death, but the Eucharist was protected, held in his arms. Eventually, a soldier would come and disperse the angry mob, recognizing Tarcisius, as the soldier was also secretly a Christian. In his final breath, Tarcisius handed the consecrated bread to the soldier, who delivered it to the Christians in prison. You know, this story is really profound in my opinion, and I think it really just shows how powerful the Eucharist truly is. Despite being beaten to death, the body of Christ was protected, and it's honestly one of the most powerful stories of martyrdom in the early church. Tarcisius was venerated as a saint shortly after his death. Tarcisius serves as the patron saint of first communicants and altar servers, and his feast day is celebrated on August 15th. Saint Denis of Paris is a 3rd century Christian martyr, best known for his role as Bishop of Paris in the 3rd century. Not much is known about his early life, life, but it is believed that he was raised devoutly, eventually being ordained as a priest and becoming Bishop of Paris due to his intense holiness. At the time, Paris was a very pagan area, dominated by mythological beliefs and nature spirits and lesser gods. Denis and two of his companions dedicated their lives to evangelizing the people of France, which alarmed the pagan priests and druids in the area, as Saint Denis had baptized a large portion of the population within France. This eventually drew the attention of the Romans, who arrested Denis and his companions. They were then condemned to death by decapitation and was taken to the hill of Montmartre, which was considered to be druidic sacred ground by the pagans. The two priests were decapitated by the Romans, but the legend says that Denis miraculously survived, picking up his severed head and walking several miles to the top of the hill, preaching a sermon as he went along to the shock of everyone there. Eventually, he collapsed on top of the hill, which is now marked by the Basilica of Saint Denis in Paris. However, to this day, Saint Denis serves as an extraordinary example of Christian martyrdom, as well as the patron saint of migraines and headaches, which, I think that's very fitting for him. Saint Hildegard of Bingen was a visionary Benedictine abbess, mystic, writer, composer, and doctor of the church, best known for her visions and massive contributions to theology, music, medicine, and Christian spirituality. Born in around 1098 AD in Bermersheim, Germany, Hildegard was born into a rich noble family and was offered to the church at a young age, eventually being raised under the care of the anchoress Blessed Hutta. From childhood, Hildegard experienced many mystical visions, though she kept them private for years out of humility and fear, eventually becoming the abbess of her community. She began writing down her visions and teachings, producing major works such as the Scrivas while composing sacred music, writing about natural medicine, corresponding with popes and emperors, and preaching reform throughout the church. Even though she lived in a time when women rarely ever held public theological authority, Hildegard became one of the most respected spiritual voices of the Middle Ages. She died on September 17, 1179, and was later declared a doctor of the church by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012. Saint Hildegard of Bingen served as a powerful example of wisdom, creativity, and mystical devotion to God, and today she serves as the patron saint of musicians, writers, linguists, scientists, and those interested in natural medicine. Saint Bernard. So the Saint Bernard is a very famous dog breed known for its large stature, and who wrote this? What the heck is this? Like, come on. Pardon me for the technical difficulties. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is a doctor of the church who was declared by Pope Pius XII to be the last of the church fathers, marking the transition from the patristic age of theologians such as Augustine and Ambrose to the scholastic ones like Aquinas and Albert the Great. Born in what is now France in 1090 AD to a very high noble family, Bernard was educated by priests and as a child dreamed of becoming one. Bernard joined the newly founded Cistercian order, being inspired by his mentor, Saint Robert of Molesme, subtle foreshadowing, and founded an abbey at Clairvaux, hence his name, Bernard of Clairvaux, becoming known for his prolific poetry and sermons, in which he helped to clarify Catholic teaching on the dogmas of Mary. And whenever I talked about Saint Catherine of Siena, a lot of people got mad at me that I didn't bring up the holy prepuce. So as much as I don't want to talk about this, we're going to talk about the lactation of Saint Bernard. Basically, there's a legend that Saint Bernard was so holy and had such a deep devotion to the Virgin Mary that Mary appeared to Saint Bernard himself. And I'm trying to not get demonetized here, giving Bernard her milk. Some people say that it was a statue of Mary that miraculously lactated. Some say that Mary appeared herself, but either way, I really don't want to talk about this because it's kind of gross. And Saint Bernard never once described this in his writings. It's a legend that was attributed to him after his death, being depicted in a lot of Renaissance art. But needless to say, this is really gross and didn't actually happen. And I think it's so weird that people make up these kinds of stories about the Virgin Mary. But anyways, Bernard was also controversial for founding the Knights Templar, as well as being a supporter of the Crusades. Bernard was very influential at the Council of Troyes, establishing the guidelines for the Knights Templar, which was a military organization during the Crusades that essentially served as an independent army outside of the jurisdiction of any government, protecting the Holy Land and carrying out the orders of the Pope. Over the years, many conspiracy theories have developed about the Knights Templar, including my personal favorite that it's connected to the Freemasons who hid a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence to a secret treasure that is hidden underneath a church in New York City. Also, the dog is not actually named after this Saint Bernard, it's named after another Saint Bernard, but either way, Saint Bernard is a super influential church father who changed Catholicism forever, serving as the patron saint of both the Cistercian order and the Knights Templar. And I guess by extension, the 2004 film National Treasure. Saint Robert of Molesme, best known for helping to found the Cistercian order, as well as serving as its patron alongside Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Born in around 1028 AD in Champagne, France, Robert was raised in a noble family and entered into the religious life at a young age, becoming a Benedictine monk while still a teenager. After years in the monastic life, he became frustrated with how many monasteries had grown wealthy, comfortable, and spiritually relaxed. So he began to search for a stricter way to live the rule of Saint Benedict. In 1075, he founded the Abbey of Molesme, which became successful, but eventually eventually grew even too comfortable with this kind of monastic life and desired something more. Because of this, in 1098, Robert and a group of monks left Belesme and founded a new monastery at Cilieu, which would eventually become the beginning of the Cistercian order. It was here that he would grow a close friendship with Saint Bernard, serving as a sort of mentor to him. Although he was later ordered to return to Belesme, he also helped inspire one of the most important monastic movements in medieval Europe. Robert died on April 17, 1111, and was canonized by Pope Honorius III in 1222. Saint Robert Belesme serves as a strong reminder that holiness often requires reforming, and today he serves as the patron saint of the Cistercian order. Francisco and Jacinta Marto were two of the three children who experienced the Fatima apparitions of the Virgin Mary in 1916, one of the most famous and well-documented miracles in history. In 1916, three children, cousins Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, experienced the apparitions in Fatima, Portugal. Mary appeared to the children over the course of a few months, revealing to the children three prophecies, known as the Three Secrets of Fatima, and told them that on October 13th she would perform a miracle for everyone to see. The first vision that they received consisted of hell itself, showing the children a great lake of fire beneath the earth, in which tortured human figures were surrounded by animal-like demons in the fires of hell. The second prophecy was of World War II, with the Virgin Mary telling the children that under the pontificate of Pope Pius XI, World War II would begin, which would be far worse than World War I. After this, Mary claimed that peace would only be granted once Russia was consecrated to the Virgin Mary by the Pope himself, which would eventually come true with Pope John Paul II. The third mystery wasn't revealed to the public until the year 2000, but this is the third video that I've talked about this in, and I kind of don't want to talk about it again, but it's not really relevant here, so I'm not going to talk about it. When October 13th finally came, a crowd of at least 30,000 people gathered to see what Our Lady had promised. According to eyewitness accounts, the sun danced in the sky and people saw visions of Christ and Mary that varied from person to person, making it one of the most well-documented miracles in modern history. After the apparition, however, the lives of Francisco and Jacinta were actually quite tragic. Mary appeared to Jacinta herself, claiming that the children would be brought to heaven very soon, and this would come to pass in 1918 when the siblings were only 9 and 10 years old. The siblings contracted influenza, which would ultimately take their lives. Francisco tragically passed away after a few months, but Jacinta would survive until 1920, until eventually passing away at only 9 years old. Their cousin Lucia would survive all the way until 2005 and served as a religious sister. After a long process of canonization, Francisco and Jacinta were canonized in 2017 as the first child saints who died of natural causes. After Lucia's death in 2005, she has also been submitted to the canonization process, being declared venerable in 2023 by Pope Francis. Ultimately, the story of the children of Fatima and their tragic death is a reminder of the power that the Virgin Mary has, but also the promise of God's salvation that awaits us. Saint Anthony of Egypt is widely regarded as the founder of monasticism and even the first monk by many accounts. Born in the mid-3rd century to wealthy Christian parents, Anthony was brought up in a religious education, but by the time he was 20 years old, he would be moved by Jesus' words in the Gospel of Mark, selling all of his possessions and giving up all of his proceeds to the needy. From this point on, he would become a recluse and adopt asceticism, spending much of his time working, praying, and taking up any manual labor necessary in order to earn a living. During St. Anthony's time, he would be described by one of his other disciples, St. Athanasius, as being physically harassed by Satan, who would tempt him both spiritually and physically. He would then move to an abandoned Roman fort in Mount Pisper, Egypt, and would live there for 20 years without contact from any other human being. Bread would often be thrown over the wall by pilgrims, and many people were drawn into the huts and caves around him, desiring him to be the abbot of a colony of hermits. He would go on a distant retreat to Mount Cosm, where he would remain for the rest of his life, but he would occasionally visit Mount Pisper and Alexandria to visit his followers, preach against heresies such as Arianism, and provide encouragement to the followers faced with martyrdom. Eventually, he passed away at the age of over 100 years old, and his influence in the monastic life of the church is truly unmatched. Although there have been many ascetics, such as the Desert Fathers, that predated St. Anthony, he was the first to have an organized body of monastics who followed him in his way of life. Today, he serves as the patron saint of butchers, gravediggers, and skin diseases, and his feast day is celebrated on January 17th. Saint Oscar Romero was a very important modern archbishop and martyr, best known for defending the poor and speaking out against violence, crime, and injustice in El Salvador. Born on August 15th, 1917, in Ciudad Barrios, El Salvador, Oscar was raised in a poor but devout Catholic family, and from a young age showed a strong interest in the priesthood, eventually entering into the seminary and studying in Rome. After being ordained as a priest in 1942, he served quietly as a parish priest and was later ordained as the auxiliary bishop of El Salvador, being seen as cautious and conservative. However, after witnessing the suffering of the poor and the murder of priests and civilians during El Salvador's widespread political violence, Romero became one of the strongest voices against government oppression, military brutality, and the persecution of the church. As Archbishop of San Salvador, he preached boldly through radio sermons, calling soldiers to stop killing innocent people and reminding the nation that no earthly authority could command them to violate God's law. However, tragically, on March 24th, 1980, Romero had just finished celebrating Mass at a small chapel in a hospital in San Salvador when an armed gunman stepped through the doors of the chapel and fired 2 shots directly into Romero's heart, taking his life. And at Romero's funeral, the situation only became worse. During the ceremony, smoke bombs exploded in the streets and gunfire began raining down on everyone in attendance. The massacre claimed over 30 casualties, and many speculate that it was the El Salvador army themselves, seeking to tarnish the legacy of St. Oscar Romero. Romero was quickly buried after this event and would become a popular figure within El Salvador due to his bravery and martyrdom. In 2018, St. Oscar Romero was canonized by Pope Francis, serving as a strong witness that defending the poor and speaking the truth can sometimes cost your life. But today he serves as the patron saint of El Salvador, persecuted Christians, as well as Christian communicators. Saint Marcellinus served as the 29th pope in history. At the beginning of the Christian persecution of Emperor Diocletian, which was one of the most brutal periods of Christian persecution in all of Roman history. Like many of the other popes on this list, he is mentioned in the prayer of consecration during the Mass, and just like all the other popes we talked about, not much is known about him. However, Marcellinus was born sometime in the 3rd century to a wealthy Roman family and eventually became pope himself in 296 AD at the beginning of the reign of Emperor Diocletian. However, unfortunately, Marcellinus died in about 304 AD at the hand of Emperor Diocletian, and he was venerated as a martyr by the Christians in Rome. Marcellinus was captured by Diocletian's soldiers and forced to give incense to Roman idols or be put to death. Accounts on this story vary, as some claim that he actually did offer incense to the Roman gods before repenting before a council of bishops. However, others, including St. Augustine, denied that this story happened and say that he was simply put to death. However, regardless of which account is true, it is believed that Marcellinus was beheaded in 304 AD and was buried shortly afterwards. His death was then followed by a long vacancy in the papacy because the persecution was so intense that the new pope could not be elected for years. St. Marcellinus served as a reminder of how chaotic and terrifying the early persecutions of Christians were, and today he serves as one of the earliest papal martyrs as well as the patron saint of pestilence and plague victims. Alright guys, starting off layer 14, we have Saint Scholastica. Saint Scholastica was the first Benedictine nun that was born in 480 AD. She was a disciple of her brother Saint Benedict, with whom she strived for perfection of holiness. Her and her brother were both twins. However, when they were born, their mother died of childbirth immediately after, and they were sent to Rome when they were 12 years old. Saint Benedict, as we described earlier on this iceberg, was the first to dedicate himself to the religious life, but Scholastica followed after him, entering a monastery near Nursia and then moving to Subliaco. Basically, the lifestyle displayed in Rome was so disturbing to them that it forced them to detach from earthly goods and grow closer to the religious vocation and silence and solitude. Scholastica was often known for her rule of silence, where she would avoid conversations and would often say, either speak of God or keep silence, for what in this world is so worthy of speech? She and her brother would meet once a year for a spiritual interview, and also to just catch up and talk about these things, as they were very close siblings. Scholastica wanted her brother and teacher to continue the interview until the following morning, but Saint Benedict declined, saying that it would break the rule of meeting once a year. She prayed and implored the Lord not to let her brother depart from her, and then immediately as she said this, a violent storm came over the monastery and made them talk all night long. Saint Scholastica serves as the patron saint of Benedictine nuns, education, and convulsive children. Because of her miracle, her veneration is often invoked against storms and rain, and her feast day is celebrated on February 10th. Saint Chrysogonus and Anastasia. Saint Chrysogonus was another very important early church martyr, best known for being one of the saints mentioned in the Mass, who serves as a powerful example of faithfulness during the brutal persecution of the Emperor Diocletian. Born sometime in the 3rd century, although the exact date and details of his early life are unknown, Chrysogonus was likely a Christian of high standing and became connected with Saint Anastasia, who served as a sort of student to him. Anastasia was born in around 281 AD to an aristocratic pagan father named Praetexius, but her mother was secretly a Christian. Needless to say, the two became very close. However, during Diocletian persecution, Chrysogonus was, I feel like I've repeated the script like 30 times at this point, but continued to strengthen the other Christians there by writing letters, including writing letters to Anastasia herself. Eventually, he was brought before the emperor at Aquileia, condemned for not worshipping the Roman gods, and beheaded in around 304 AD. According to sacred tradition, his body was then thrown into the sea, but it later washed ashore and was buried by a priest named Zolas. Saint Anastasia, however, had a similar fate. Although her death is very much unknown, like a lot of the other saints on this list. It is believed that she was killed under the persecutions of Emperor Diocletian, also in 304, being burned alive at the stake. Either way, St. Chrysogonus and St. Anastasia served as strong witnesses to perseverance in the face of persecution. Although much of their lives are surrounded by later legend, they have continued to be honored for centuries. Today, St. Chrysogonus serves as the patron saint of Croatia, and St. Anastasia serves as the patron saint of martyrs, weavers, and those suffering from poisoning. Pope St. Pius X, born as Joseph Sarto, is arguably one of the greatest popes in modern history and of all time. He was born as the second of 10 children in a very poor Italian family in 1835, and from an early age, he had always been interested in the vocation of the priesthood, and once he was ordained in 1858, his superiors saw great potential in him, giving him many responsibilities due to this. He was eventually ordained as a bishop, and in 1894, he would be promoted to the level of cardinal. Only 9 years after being elected as cardinal, he would be elected pope and would take the name Pope Pius X in 1903. His papacy would be known for one of the biggest changes to the church, which was the reception of the Eucharist for children. Prior to Pope Pius X's papacy, reception of the Eucharist was primarily reserved for children aged 12 to 14, as that was the time when most people had their first communion. However, Pope Pius X would lower it to 7 years old, saying that Holy Communion is the shortest and safest way to heaven. He would also make further contributions to the church, such as encouraging frequent reception of the Eucharist, renewal of the liturgy, and for the first time in history, he gathered the Code of Canon Law into one volume. He would also encourage all faithful Catholics to read the Bible, which revitalized biblical study. He encouraged Italian Catholics to get more involved in politics, and he himself got involved in politics, as he rejected French demands of the government and fought against government control over the church. He would also denounce the mistreatment of indigenous people in Peru, and sheltered refugees after an earthquake in Messina, Italy at his own expense. He would pass away on August 20th, 1914, a few weeks after World War I had begun, and the last words before his death were, "This is the last affliction the Lord will visit onto me. I would gladly give my life to save my poor children from this ghastly scourge." Pope Pius X was canonized in 1954, and he serves as the patron saint of First Communion, pilgrims, and parish priests. Also, I do briefly want to mention, the Society of St. Pius X was not founded by St. Pius X, it was founded by a man named Archbishop Lebevre long after Pius X's death. Pius X was a pretty intense supporter of papal supremacy, claiming multiple times that if you do not submit to the Roman pontiff, you cannot be considered in communion with Rome. So I do think that that's a little bit ironic, but just keep that in mind. St. Bruno of Cologne, born in Cologne, Germany in 1030, was a revered medieval scholar as well as the founder of the Carthusian order. He was renowned for his deep intellectual gifts and gave up a prestigious academic and church career in order to embrace a life of radical solitude, poverty, and contemplative prayer. St. Bruno became a highly celebrated professor and was appointed rector of the Reims Cathedral School. He taught there for over 20 years, shaping the minds of future church leaders, including Pope Urban II. He fought against the worldliness and the corruption of the clergy, eventually helping to depose an unworthy, greedy archbishop. Like I've mentioned earlier, he started the Carthusian order, and their way of life uniquely blended the solitary prayer of the hermits with the continual structure of the monks. They spent the majority of their time in individual silence, manual labor, and studying, coming together only once a day for specific liturgical prayers and fellowship. Today he serves as the patron saint of exorcists, people suffering from demonic possession, the Carthusian order, Calabria, Italy, and Germany, as well as one of the most important medieval scholars in the church's history. Saint Ephrem the Syrian was a very important early church deacon, theologian, poet, and doctor of the church, best known for defending Orthodox Christianity through hymns and poetry rather than long philosophical arguments. Born in around 306 AD in Nisbis, modern-day Turkey, near the Syrian border, Ephrem was raised in a Christian environment and received a strong religious education under the local bishop. Although some traditions describe him as having a fiery and impatient personality in his youth, he eventually became committed to repentance, prayer, and service of the church. Ephrem became a deacon and teacher, using poetry and sacred music to explain Christian doctrine during a time when heresies were spreading through popular song. He sought to counter this with his own Orthodox theology songs, which is pretty cool. After Persian forces invaded the city of Nisbis, he moved to Edessa, where he continued writing hymns, biblical commentaries, and theological works that defended Christianity, the divinity of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the beauty of Catholic theology. He died in around 373 AD, likely while serving the sick during a plague, and was later declared a doctor of the church by Pope Benedict XV in 1920. Saint Ephrem the Syrian served as a strong reminder that theology does not always have to be dry and academic, but it can be beautiful, poetic, and deeply prayerful. And today he serves as the patron saint of spiritual directors and Syriac Christians. Saint Drogo was a very mysterious medieval hermit and pilgrim, best known for his intense life of penance and for somehow being the patron saint of coffee, shepherds, and unattractive people, which is very relatable to the people who are watching this video. I'm talking about coffee coffee. You're beautiful, by the way. Born in 1105 in modern-day France, Drogo's early life began in tragedy when his father died before he was born and his mother died during childbirth. When Drogo discovered that he was an orphan, he was deeply affected by this and dedicated his life to prayer, penance, and charity. Inspired by Jesus' call to give away all of your belongings, he gave away his inheritance and became a shepherd, later making multiple pilgrimages to Rome and living a life of extreme poverty and devotion. Eventually, Drogo developed a severe bodily affliction that made him physically deformed, causing him to withdraw from public life and live as a recluse attached to a small church in Sabor. According to sacred tradition, he was sometimes seen in two places at once, both attending mass and remaining in his cell, which gave him a strange reputation for his holiness. Drogo eventually passed away in 1186 after a life of suffering, prayer, and isolation, serving as a strong reminder that holiness is not based in beauty, comfort, or worldly success, and today he serves as the patron saints of shepherds, coffee, unattractive people, and those suffering from bodily afflictions and deformities. Saint Cassian of Imola was a very important early Christian martyr, best known for one of the most brutal and ironic martyrdoms in the church's history, serving as a powerful example of faithfulness even when he was betrayed by those who were closest to him. Born sometime in the 3rd century, although the exact date and details of his life are unknown, I feel like I'm repeating myself so much here, but let's just keep going. Cassian eventually became a Christian school teacher in Imola, Italy, where he taught grammar, reading, and writing to young students. During the persecution of Christians under the Roman Empire, Cassian was arrested in order to make sacrifice to the pagan gods, but just like almost everyone else on this list, he refused. However, his punishment was extremely brutal. The Roman authorities handed him over to his own students, who stabbed him to death with their own writing tools, making his execution especially slow and cruel. Cassian passed away in 304 AD, becoming one of the many martyrs under the Diocletian persecution. Saint Cassian of Imola served as a strong witness to Christian endurance in the face of humiliation, betrayal, and torture, and today he serves as the patron saint of teachers, students, and stenographers. Saint Devasahayam Pillai was one of the first Indian saints to ever be canonized. He is well known for being the first Indian layman to be canonized as a saint, and he serves as a great example of the Christian faith in the face of religious persecution as well as political persecution. Born in 1712 in Natalam in modern-day India, he was originally given the name Nilakanta Pillai and was raised in a wealthy but devout Hindu family, eventually serving as an official in the royal court. His life changed, however, after he encountered a Catholic military officer named Eustachius de Lannoy, who helped introduce him to Christianity. Nilakanta converted to Catholicism and was baptized with the name Lazarus, or Devasahayam in India, which means God is my help, and began openly living and preaching the Christian faith. His conversion angered the local authorities in India because he spoke out against caste divisions and taught the equality of all people before God, which was very contrary to the Hindu society at the time. Because of this, he was arrested, tortured, humiliated, and even pressured to abandon his Christianity, but he refused to deny Christ. Devasahayam was eventually shot on January 14, 1752, becoming a martyr for the faith. He was officially canonized by Pope Francis in 2022, serving as a strong witness that faith in Christ can demand everything, even social status, comfort, and life itself. And today, he serves as the patron saint of India and persecuted Christians. Saint Olaf is one of the most interesting saints on this list because he was actually a Viking king before his conversion to Christianity, serving as a catalyst for the conversion of Norway into Christianity, as well as being one of the most important historical figures in Scandinavian history. Born Olafur Haraldsson the Stout in Ringerike, Norway, likely in around 995 AD into a lesser royal family, Olaf served as next in line to the throne. Haraldsson was raised during the Viking Age and spent much of his early life as a warrior and trader traveling throughout Europe before converting to Christianity. Olaf was then known for his ruthlessness and conquering nature, but upon coming in contact with Norman Christians during his travels, he made the decision to be baptized, converting to Christianity. Olaf returned to Norway with the intention of unifying the divided kingdoms into one united country of Norway. He gained the support of the other kings in the north and declared himself king in 1015. However, the unification of Norway was a very difficult process, and he fought valiantly against the southern kings who viewed Christianity as a threat to their old power and tradition. Eventually, Olaf was forced into exile, but he returned to Norway in 1030 to reclaim his throne. He was killed at the Battle of Stilkslad on July 29, 1030, and soon after his death, story of miracles at his tomb began to spread throughout the country. He was venerated by the people of Norway and was eventually canonized in 1164 by Pope Alexander III. Today, Saint Olaf serves as the patron saint of Norway and is celebrated throughout Norway as one of the most important historical and religious figures in the country's history. Saint Leander of Seville was a very important early church medieval bishop and doctor of the church, best known for helping to convert the Visigoths of Spain from Arianism to Catholicism. Born around 534 AD in Cartagena, Spain, Leander was raised in a noble Hispano-Roman family, with several of his siblings also becoming saints, including Saint Isidore of Seville, who we talked about earlier. After entering the religious life, Leander became a monk and eventually became Archbishop of Seville himself, where he worked to strengthen the Catholic faith in a kingdom that was largely ruled by the Arian Visigoths. Arianism, as you probably remember, is the belief that God created Jesus and that the Son was not the same level as the Father. This heresy gained massive traction throughout the early church and led to a lot of conflicts between traditional Christianity and Arianism. However, Leander's most important role came when he helped to convert Prince Hermenegild to Catholicism, which created major conflicts with his father, King Leovigild, who professed the faith of Arianism. Although Hermenegild was eventually killed due to this, the Catholic cause continued, and Leander helped to guide King Recared, who eventually rejected Arianism and converted to Catholicism at the Third Council of Toledo in 589 AD. Leander passed away in around 600 AD, leaving behind a massive legacy as he helped to convert Spain and defeat Arianism among the Visigoth controversy. Saint Leander of Seville served as a strong defender of Catholic unity during one of the most important turning points in Spanish church history, and today he serves as the patron saint of Seville. You know, some saints are priests, others are missionaries, and others are martyrs, but in Saint Jose Gabriel Brochero's case, well, he was a cowboy. Saint Jose Gabriel de Rosario Brochero was born in 1840 in Argentina to a very devout Catholic family. He studied at the Seminary of Our Lady of Loreto at the age of 16 years old and was eventually ordained at only 26 years old in the Third Order of St. Dominic in 1866. As a priest, Brochero established multiple schools, helped the sick and dying, and administered the sacraments to his community. He famously wore a sombrero and poncho, riding long distances across Argentina on his horse, leading to his reputation as the cowboy priest. However, in 1837, a cholera outbreak hit Argentina, and on his journeys to minister to the sick, he contracted leprosy from one of his patients. Despite his illness, he continued to serve the people of Cordoba, Argentina, administering the sacraments to the parish and serving his community, but slowly and surely, he succumbed to the illness. By the end of his life, Jose had become both blind and deaf, stepping down from his position as a priest in 1908 and passing away shortly afterwards on January 26, 1914. After his death, he became venerated by his local community due to his intense service and was eventually canonized in 2016 by Pope Francis. Today, Saint Jose Gabriel Brochero serves as the patron saint of Argentina and the community of Cordoba that he once served during his life. Alright guys, starting off the final layer of this iceberg, we have the enigmatic Hippolytus of Rome, who is the only saint in history to formally schism from the Catholic Church. If you've watched this iceberg all the way since the beginning, you might be familiar with the term anti-pope, when someone besides the pope claims to be the supreme pontiff of Rome, but is formally excommunicated by the church because of this. Well, Hippolytus was not only the first anti-pope in history, but also the first anti-pope to be canonized as a saint. Born sometime in the 2nd century, details of his early life are very much unknown. However, as an adult, he served as a brilliant theologian and church father, fighting against early church heresies, especially the heresy of modalism, which believed that the Trinity was just 3 aspects of a single divine person. A man of action, Hippolytus went to Pope Zephyrius himself and pleaded that modalism would be formally rebuked. When Zephyrius took a softer stance, he was greatly angered by this. After Zephyrius died, he was then succeeded by Callistus I, who Hippolytus had beef with, to put it lightly. Hippolytus formally schismed from Rome and would be formally excommunicated, as Hippolytus refused to accept that serious sinners and heretics such as the modalists could be reintegrated into the church. However, when Emperor Maximus Thrax came to power in 235 AD, the persecution of Christians intensified, leading to the arrest of both Saint Hippolytus and Saint Pontian, who was the pope at the time. Even though the two hated each other passionately at first, they eventually reconciled, and Hippolytus even had a change of heart, formally renouncing his schism and submitting to Pontian in the harsh conditions of the mines. However, they would both eventually pass away shortly afterwards, and their bodies would be sent to Rome, where they were both recognized as martyrs of the faith, despite their disagreements. Saint Hippolytus is a powerful example of Christian conversion even after so many years of schism, showing that it's never too late to reconcile yourself with Rome. And honestly, as I'm recording this video with the recent controversy with the Society of Pope Pius X, as I said, it's never too late to reconcile yourself with the Pope, and do with that what you will. Today, Saint Hippolytus serves as the patron saint of horses, prison guards, and laborers, as well as one of the most powerful conversion stories in the early church. Saint Norbert was a very important medieval bishop, reformer, and the founder of the Premonstratinian order, best known for his dramatic conversion from a worldly nobleman into one of the great reforming saints of the medieval ages. Born in around 1080 AD in Xanten, Germany, Norbert was raised in a wealthy family and spent his life enjoying comfort, status, and a position in the imperial court, living more like a prince than a serious churchman. However, his life changed after he was nearly struck by lightning during a storm, causing him to repent and dedicate himself truly to God. Norbert was ordained as a priest and began traveling as a preacher, calling people to to repentance and pushing for reform among clergymen. In 1120, he founded the Premonstratinian order, try saying that 10 times fast, also known as the Norbertines, which combined monastic discipline with active preaching and service. Later on in his life, he became the Archbishop of Magdeburg, where he continued fighting corruption and defending the church, especially against heresies and abuses surrounding the Eucharist. Norbert died on June 6, 1134, and was canonized by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. Saint Norbert served as a powerful example of conversion and total dedication to the church, and today he serves as the patron saint of Bohemia, peace, and expectant mothers. Saint Lucifer of Cagliari was another very powerful saint in the early church who is best known for serving as the Bishop of Cagliari in modern-day Italy during the 4th century, as well as his role in the Council of Nicaea and strongly defending the church against the heresy of Arianism. And honestly, like most of the other early church saints on this list, we don't know much about him. Born sometime in the early 4th century, he grew up as a scholar in Greek and Hebrew, serving as a sort of apprentice to Saint Eusebius of Rome, before being appointed as Bishop of Cagliari. As bishop, he continued to fight against Arianism, eventually being exiled for his beliefs. After his eventual return and the resolution of the Arian heresy, Lucifer opposed the reintegration of Arian bishops, forming the somewhat controversial sect known as the Luciferians after the Council of Nicaea. However, let's be real here, you're mostly interested in the fact that he's named Lucifer. You're probably asking yourself, why is this saint named after the devil? Lucifer is the name that is given to Satan prior to his fall into hell. In Revelation chapter 12, the name Lucifer really just means light bearer or morning star, and the name Lucifer has nothing to do with a connection to Satan. In fact, Saint Lucifer of Cagliari actually predates the tradition of calling Satan Lucifer, as the earliest text that refers to the devil as Lucifer was Saint Jerome's Vulgate translation. And of course, for anyone wondering, Saint Lucifer's religious order, the Luciferians, is not the same thing as the Luciferians who exist today. That would be crazy if he started a religious order that worshipped Satan. Either way, however, Saint Lucifer of Cagliari served as a very important figure in the fight against Arianism, and today he serves as the patron saint of Cagliari, Italy, as well as those who are in exile. Saint Gemma Galgani is a powerful modern mystic best known for her intense visions of Christ, as well as receiving the stigmata, or the wounds of Christ, on her hands and feet. Born in 1878 in Camigliano, Italy, Gemma was raised in a wealthy but devout Catholic family as the 5th of 8 children. Unfortunately, however, Gemma's mother would pass away from tuberculosis when she was only 2 years old, and she was placed in a nursery school by her family due to the financial hardship. Many other members of her family passed away from tuberculosis as well, which pushed Gemma close to Christ. She became ill as a teenager and eventually began meeting with her spiritual director, Germano Ruppolo, where she recounted her intense experiences she had with prayer. In 1899, Gemma manifested the stigmata, the physical wounds of Jesus Christ on her hands, feet, and side, and claimed to have spoken to her guardian angel, Jesus, the angel Gabriel, and Mary herself. These claims were later verified by Ruppolo, as she often predicted future events before they even happened. However, as Gemma's health began to decline, Ruppolo advised Gemma to pray that the stigmata be taken from her. When she did this, the wounds miraculously disappeared. However, in 1903, she too was diagnosed with tuberculosis and suffered intensely from it. Her decline was also accompanied by intense mystical experience recorded by multiple religious sisters, who claimed it was unlike anything they had ever seen before. Eventually, Gemma began to suffer intensely on Good Friday, and by the time that Holy Saturday had come around, she peacefully passed away at the young age of only 25 years old. Gemma's mystical experiences and powerful life eventually led to her canonization in 1940 by Pope Pius XII, and today Gemma serves as the patron saint of students, spinal illnesses, and pharmacists, which is the 4th time I've mentioned that if you're counting. Saints Barlaam and Jehoshaphat. Now, I actually covered these saints in my first Iceberg series that I made a super long time ago, but basically Saints Barlaam and Jehoshaphat are very interesting because we don't actually know whether or not they existed. The legendary and mysterious aspects of their story, such as their similarities to other religious figures from other religions, makes many scholars question their existence in the first place. And they remain controversial figures within Catholicism to this day, with their feast day being officially removed from the Roman calendar in 1960. However, the legend goes something like this. In 3rd century India, a young prince named Budaseth, or Jehoshaphat in English, was born to his father, King Avenir. After receiving a vision from an astrologer who told King Avenir that Jehoshaphat would become a Christian, Avenir locked his son in a castle, sheltering him from the outside world as much as possible. As he got older, he met the Christian sage Barlaam, who taught him about Christianity and the outside world through cryptic parables, eventually leading Jehoshaphat to convert to Christianity. After the death of his father, Jehoshaphat followed Barlaam into the wilderness, and through quiet meditation and prayer, Jehoshaphat learns to find peace and meaning through Christian mortification and offering his sufferings up to Christ. The two lived together in silence for years, eventually passing away peacefully in the wilderness. Now, if you're all familiar with the religion of Buddhism, it's pretty clear that this is a Christianized retelling of the story of Siddhartha Gautama, who served as the first Buddha in the religion. Perhaps this was meant as a method to get the Indian Buddhists at the time to convert to Christianity. In fact, the first text to feature this legend was actually a Buddhist collection of stories, but the story eventually made its way to the Middle East, where Saint John Damascene popularized it in the 8th century. Even though Saints Barlaam and Jehoshaphat likely never existed, or if they did exist, their stories were changed throughout the years, the legend was incredibly influential to India and the rest of Europe, proving that certain ideas from other religions, such as Buddhism, can fit neatly into the Christian worldview and even hold moral truths that we can try to imitate. Now, that's not to say that Buddhism is true. There's a lot wrong with Buddhism and all the other religions. It's just that certain aspects of Buddhism can fit within Christianity. Saint Gregory Nazianzen was a very important early church bishop, theologian, and doctor of the church, best known for being one of the Cappadocian Fathers, and one of the greatest defenders of the Trinity in Christian history. Born in 329 AD in Cappadocia, Gregory was raised in a wealthy and deeply Christian family, and even though he wasn't actually part of the Cappadocian family directly, he was very close to them. Gregory received an excellent education in Caesarea, Alexandria, and Athens, and eventually became close friends with none other than Saint Basil the Great, who we talked about earlier on this iceberg. Although he desired a quiet life of prayer and study, Gregory was eventually drawn into the major theological battles of the time, especially with the fight against Arianism, which denied the full divinity of Christ. He became Bishop of Sassima and later the Archbishop of Constantinople, where his powerful preaching helped restore Nicene Christianity in a city that had been heavily influenced by Arianism. At the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD, Gregory played a major role in defending the doctrine of the Trinity, though he eventually resigned from his position to avoid further conflict and returned to a quieter life of writing and prayer. He passed away peacefully in 390 AD, leaving behind some of the most important theological writings and sermons in early Christianity. Saint Gregory Nazianzen served as a strong defender of the Trinity during one of the church's most intense doctrinal battles, and today he serves as the patron saint of poets, orators, and theologians. Saint Odo of Cluny was yet another very important medieval abbot and monastic reformer, best known for helping to establish the monastery of Cluny as one of the most influential monasteries in all of Europe. Born in around 878 AD near Le Mans, France, Odo was raised in a noble family and was originally trained for a military career, but from a young age he had been more drawn towards prayer, study, and religious life. After receiving a strong education in theology and music, he became a canon lawyer and eventually entered into the Benedictine monastery, where he became known for his discipline, learning, and holiness. In 927 AD, Odo became the second bishop of Cluny and helped turn the monastery into a major center of reform at a time when many monasteries had grown wealthy, political, and spiritually lazy. He traveled throughout France and Italy, reforming monasteries, defending the independence of monastic life, and calling the monks back to prayer, poverty, and obedience with the rule of Saint Benedict. Odo unfortunately passed away in 942, leaving behind a legacy that helped shape the entire reform movement. Saint Odo of Cluny served as a strong reminder that reform often begins with restoring discipline and holiness in hidden places, and today he serves as the patron saint of rain and the protection against drought. Saint Christina the Astonishing is one of the most mysterious medieval saints in history, known for her intense suffering and bizarre miracles. Born in around 1150 to a poor family in Belgium, she was raised deeply religious by her Christian family, but after her parents passed away when she was only 15 years old, she began working in a pasture as a shepherd. After a few years, she suffered a massive seizure that led many to believe that she had died. She was given a funeral and displayed in an open casket during the funeral mass. However, during the mass, as the Agnus Dei was sung, she suddenly sat up in her coffin. She claimed that during her seizure, she had witnessed heaven, hell, and purgatory, and was offered the chance to remain in heaven or to return to earth in service of the souls in purgatory, doing penance and mortification on their behalf. She chose the latter, claiming that she had been sent for the sole purpose of converting the sinners of the earth and offering it up for the souls in purgatory. Legend says that she even levitated into the air as she claimed this, shocking the entire city. From this moment forward, she radically changed her lifestyle, dressing in rags and publicly doing penance and mortification, which led to her eventual arrest as people accused her of witchcraft. However, upon her release, she just became more extreme. Christina lit herself on fire and jumped into freezing lakes for hours at a time, but did not suffer any physical harm from these things. When asked about it, she claimed that she did these things for the souls in purgatory, and that if others had seen purgatory like she had, they would be doing the same thing that she was. Her life of devotion and mortification would continue until her suspiciously natural death at the age of 74. Her mortification did not take a physical toll on her, and while she was never formally canonized, she has been venerated for centuries as a saint, serving as the patron saint of mental health and mental illness. Saint Columbanus was another very important Irish missionary monk, best known for spreading monasticism throughout Europe and helping to revive the Christian life during the early Middle Ages. Born in around 343 AD in Leinster, Ireland, Columbanus was raised in a devout Christian environment and received a strong education, eventually leaving behind the world to become a monk at Bangor Abbey, which became one of the great centers of Irish monasticism. After years of prayer, study, and discipline, he left Ireland with several companions to become a missionary on the European continent, where he founded monasteries in Lexul and Bobbio. Columbanus became known for his intense asceticism, strict monastic rule, and fearless preaching, even confronting kings and corrupt nobles himself. However, his boldness eventually got him exiled from Burgundy after he criticized the royal court, but instead of stopping, he continued traveling, preaching, and founding monasteries. He died in 615 AD in Bobbio in southern Ireland, where his final monastery became a major center of learning and Christian culture. St. Columbanus served as a strong witness to missionary zeal, discipline, and reform during a chaotic period of European history, and today he serves as the patron saint of motorcyclists, which I'm not really sure the backstory behind, but I think that is awesome. St. Junipero Serra was a Spanish Franciscan friar born on November 24, 1713, to a family of farmers. At the age of 16, he would enter the Franciscan order under the name of Brother Juniper, which was the name of St. Francis's companion, who would spend most of his time teaching theology until 1749, when he heard about the missionary work in South America by the Spanish, which would spark his desire to convert the native people of the New World. He would then arrive at Veracruz, Mexico, and he and another companion would traverse 250 miles to Mexico City by foot. On the way there, Junipero's left leg would be bitten by an insect and cause an infection that would be his cross for the rest of his life. Nearly 6 months after he arrived, there would be an urgent call for volunteers for the Sierra Gorda mission. Serra would be amongst the volunteers, and from 1750 to 1758, he would serve the Pame natives in Central America. He would not only spiritually benefit from the Pame people, but even economically benefit them by introducing domestic animals, agriculture, and commerce to the community. He would defend their rights against non-native settlers, and in 1758, he would be assigned to the College of San Fernando, where he would serve as the choir director, college counselor, and confessor. He would then be sent out to Laredo, where he would assign missionaries across various missions as far south as San Jose del Cabo and as far north as Santa Maria. He would also participate in expeditions to Upper California, and eventually arrived at San Diego, where he would reside until his death at the San Carlos mission. St. Junipero Serra would pass away at the mission in 1784 at the age of 70 years old, and would be canonized by Pope Francis in 2015. Today he serves as the patron saint of all the California missions, and he's a powerful example of Christian missionary work as well as charity towards those who have not heard the gospel. And for the final saint in this iceberg, we have the mysterious St. Paul the Hermit, known for his intense asceticism, mortification, and focus on death. Also known as St. Paul of Thebes, Paul was born in 227 AD, growing up in a deeply faithful family and growing close to Christ. When he was about 16 years old, his parents would eventually pass away, which left him and his older sister to inherit their wealth. However, Paul's brother-in-law, discovering Paul's wealth, reported Paul's Christianity to the Roman authorities in Egypt. Rather than face martyrdom, Paul made the decision to flee into the desert and seek refuge until the persecutions were over. And while he didn't know it at the time, this is where he would spend the rest of his life. Paul settled in a cave in the mountains near Thebes, Egypt, living off of a stream and a palm tree that contained dates. The legend says that God would also send a raven with a half loaf of bread every day. He spent the next 90 years of his life in quiet silence and contemplation, in complete isolation, until he was eventually visited by none other than St. Anthony of Egypt in his old age. St. Anthony was convinced that he was the greatest hermit of all time, but God said, "No, you're not," and would eventually reveal to Anthony in a dream that there was someone greater than him, which would inspire Anthony to journey to Egypt and eventually find Paul in his cave. Paul would reveal to Anthony that he knew Anthony had come moments before his death, and he would request Anthony to bury him in a cloak given to him by St. Athanasius. As Anthony left to get it, he would come back to the cave to see Paul's soul being lifted into heaven. Suddenly, 2 lions approached and dug a grave for Paul. Then Anthony would wrap Paul in his cloak and bury him. However, St. Paul the Hermit's true legacy lies almost 1,000 years after his death, when a Hungarian monk, Brother Eusebius, founded the order of St. Paul the Hermit in honor of Paul's life. The brothers were sometimes called the Brothers of Death because of their deep focus on mortality, penance, and preparation for eternal life, coining the now famous phrase memento mori, which means to remember death. Like St. Paul the Hermit, the brothers lived an extremely solitary lifestyle, ministering to the dying, burying the dead, and even keeping a real human skull in each room. Eventually disbanded in 1633 by Pope Urban IX due to their extreme asceticism, mortification, and remembrance of death, St. Paul the Hermit served as a powerful patron saint to the order, and his quiet, solitary life of prayer somehow made a difference for thousands of years to come, unknown to all until the very ending of his life. And in my opinion, he is the perfect saint to end off this iceberg. Okay guys, we have made it to the end of the Catholic Saints Iceberg Explained. You've made it all the way to the end, through almost 4 hours of this stuff. That's pretty impressive, I gotta say. This has been a very massive project that I've put a lot of time and effort into over the past few months. However, it is really cool to see this project come to fruition through this. If you enjoy this video and you want to see more like it, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really does help out. Hype the video, apparently that's good for the algorithm. Just share this with 1 or 2 of your friends. That will really help out, honestly. And thank you even more for staying all the way till the end. If you would like to support this channel, please check out my Patreon, where for only $2 a month, you can get early access to all of my videos, get, merch drops, get your name listed in the credits of each video. You know the drill, but it's just a really good way to support me if you want to see more videos like this in the future. If you like these kinds of deep dives into Catholic theology and history, I am planning a series coming up where I go into the different heresies of Catholicism, discussing 1, why they're wrong, and 2, the really interesting beliefs and history behind all of them. Additionally, please check out my merch. I have some really cool designs. I recently recently came out with this design of Mary stepping on the head of Satan. They're very high quality. They're ethically sourced. It's not going to cost you like $70 for a t-shirt. I'm not going to do that to you. Like, I could make more profit off of this if I wanted to, but I just think it's best to give you guys good quality merch at an affordable price. Yeah, this was a super long video to make. I don't know if I'm ever going to make a video like this again, but at 10,000 subscribers, I've made this promise. At 10,000 subscribers, I will make a video where I explain every pope in history, and that'll probably be like 4 to 5 hours long. Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm so glad you stayed till the end. I want you guys to know I'm praying for each and every single one of you. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and God bless.